Hello everyone. This is What If Luffy Was Raised by Whitebeard. Please like and subscribe and enjoy the video. Luffy was lost, it was as simple as that. Marco was beginning to become the biggest pain in his rubbery butt and there was no way he was holding his big brother's hand while going on an adventure. As soon as the Moby Dick had anchored at the island, Luffy was gone and he didn't look back. "Brad, get back here, we don't know what troubles are on this island, Yoi." Marco yelled at the kid who was running as fast as he could away from his siblings. "Marco, he's not a child anymore, why not give him some freedom?" Pop said, leaving the ship as well to explore the town with his family. "He'll always be a child, Yoi." Pops shook his head. B smiled fondly at his eldest son. "Just as you will be to me," he said before laughing loudly at Marco's look. "Aren't you guys going to follow him, Yoi?" Marco turned to Ace and Sabo, who only gave Marco a look. "Please, and let him get in the way of our fun." Ace scoffed, looking at the island, a glint in his eyes. "And what kind of fun are you talking about?" Thatch said, coming up and placing his arm around the kid's shoulders. "Well, who knows?" he said, smirking, and Thatch couldn't help but laugh before scruffing his hair up. "I'm teaching you boys well." Marco scowled at them as they left the ship. "Looks like it's up to me to bring the brat back home, Yoi." Marco scowled before leaving the ship himself and following the trail that Luffy ran down. Luffy was looking around confused. He was sure he was running in a straight line, and yet here he was looking over a cliff. Where did that come from? Maybe I should turn around," he said, tilting himself up onto one foot and hopped along the edge before doing a turn and stepping away from it. "Amen, but not go home, just explore. That way," he shouted before running off in another direction, laughing as he went. Unlike Luffy, who believed he was going straight and left the path, Marco was following it and getting more and more annoyed the further he went into the forest. How fast can that kid be? He couldn't have gotten that far, Yoi. He was tempted to turn into his phoenix form to find him, though he wondered just how mad the kid would be if he did that. "Damn it, Luffy," he said before continuing down the path. "Whoa. So cool," he said, looking at a bunch of ruins that stood before him. Luffy had never been to ruins before. It looks like an old castle that had fallen apart. There was writing on the walls, but Luffy didn't care too much for that stuff. He wanted to explore, and this was the best thing he could have found. Luffy reached his hand out to touch the castle's mossy wall when a hand grabbed his wrist, throwing him away from the ruin. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" a tall man said, glaring down at him. The man wore a yellow and black sweater and a spotty hat on his head. The dark bags under his eyes led Luffy to believe that he might not be sleeping. "Exploring," he said, simply placing his straw hat back on his head and looking up at the man before smiling. "You live here?" "Sorry for intruding," he said before standing up and bowing like Ace had taught him. A brow twitched on the man's face in annoyance at the antics of this kid. "No, I don't live here, I too am exploring this island," he said, and only got the widest and brightest grin ever from Luffy. "That's so cool. Then let's explore together." "Ah. I don't know your name," he said, suddenly looking back at the man who sighed. "Trafalgar Law," he said simply, and frowned as Luffy's face scrunched up in confusion. "Trot Rafel Traffy," Luffy said excitedly. The man just shouted his name back at the kid who laughed at him. "I'm Luffy. Monkey D. Luffy." Luffy introduced himself, and Law's eyes widened a fracture before he truly looked the kid over. "B?" he whispered quietly to himself. "Let's explore some more." Luffy grabbed Law by the hand and pulled him into the castle, excitedly ignoring Law's protests. "What does this do?" Luffy asked before touching something on the wall, making the floor give out and the men fall down with it. As they fell, Law let out a yell in surprise, while Luffy just laughed before sucking in air and bouncing on the floor as Law landed onto his stomach and bounced off. "Shishishi, that was fun." Luffy laughed while Law just sat there in shock. "You ate a devil fruit," he said, and Luffy laughed louder. "Yup, I'm a rubber man," he said proudly while Law shook his head. "Don't touch anything else." He was considering removing Luffy's hands until they were both safe from this place. That's no fun," he said, and Law shook his head. "Geez, my crew's going to be looking for me soon," Law said, looking back up at the hole they fell into. The walls were all smooth, making them unable to be climbed. He considered asking the kid to stretch up there, but thought against it. He knew he wouldn't make it out of this without a concussion either way. "Look, there's a hallway, let's go," he said to Law as he started to head in that direction. Law could only sigh as he followed behind the kid. "You said your crew will be looking for you, are you a pirate?" Luffy asked suddenly after a short amount of silence. Man, I'm a captain from the North Blue," Law confirmed and looked at the kid once more. "What about you? Why are you on this island?" he asked, taking into account that this was a child, probably not making him a captain of anything. "My family's visiting here, we're pirates as well," he said, grinning up at the man who raised his brow. "What crew?" he asked, that way he could keep an eye on them. A crew with any sort of D on it could be trouble. Luffy smirked before pointing his thumbs towards a mark on his back, making Law's eyes widen even more. Whitebeard, he whispered out softly, nervously. Man, he's my pops. Luffy said fondly. What's Whitebeard doing in the Grand Line? Law asked seriously. Normally big names like his didn't leave what Law knew to be called the New World. Visiting friends. Was all Luffy had to say, shrugging his shoulders. How long have you been on his crew? Law had to ask once again, seeing how young the kid was. My whole life, I was raised by them. Pops, Marco, Thatch, I've never had any other family but them. He said, and Law couldn't miss the lonely glint in Luffy's eyes. But I do now, I have two special brothers and they're the best. He said, throwing his arms up happily, thinking about Ace and Sabo. Are you going to become one of his commanders? Law was interested in this boy more and more. Nope, I'm going to become a captain and be the king of the pirates. He said, looking straight into Law's eyes as they both smiled at one another. What if I'm after that title as well? He asked the kid, grinning. Then we'll have to fight one day now, won't we? Luffy said, accepting the man's silent challenge. But we shall. He agreed. They came to another room that had some sunlight coming through the roof and a small pond that may have just happened over time and years. Whoa, fishes. Luffy said, running up the pond to check them out before slipping on some mud and diving into it. Idiot. Law said, grabbing the kid's wrists and pulling him out of the water just as he fell in. You saved my life. Luffy said in awe, but the man rolled his eyes. It's not that deep and I can't swim either. Law said at the now wet kid. Luffy pulled his shirt off, wringed it out, and shook it as dry as he could. Law sighed before pulling his own hoodie off and passing it to the kid. For now, it's chilly down here. He said indifferently, passing it to Luffy, who smiled and thanked him. Law was wearing a t-shirt underneath, so it didn't bother him either way, and as much as he would never admit it, he was fond of the kid. Thanks. Luffy said, pulling the sweater over his head. You've got a lot of tattoos. Luffy pointed out, and Law just smiled. And you're lacking, doesn't Whitebeard give tattoos for his crew's mark? Law said with a smirk as Luffy looked away. I hate needles, they hurt a lot and they're freaky. Luffy said, shivering from the thought of them. Law couldn't help but chuckle softly at the kid. They walked for a while longer, Law carefully looking around for something, while Luffy hummed a small song, his arms swinging back and forth, the sweater too long on him. They came to a wall that had been blocked by rubble that had crumbled from the castle above. That we're stuck now? This sucks. Luffy scowled at the mess in front of him. Law sighed before lifting his hand up, a small film filling the area. Room, he said, and Luffy looked at him curiously before Law grabbed him by the shoulder and they teleported beyond the wall. Cool. Luffy practically shouted, stars in his eyes, and Law grinned at him. I ate a fruit as well. He said, leaving it at that. He looked around once more before a bigger smile came to his face. Found you? He said before walking to a sunny patch with a bunch of flowers growing in it. What's that? Luffy asked, looking over Law's shoulder as he picked the flowers carefully. Medical herbs. Law pulled a plastic bag from his pant pocket and put the flowers into it. They are the reason I came to this island. He said, excitement in his voice. What's that? Luffy asked again, walking towards a giant stone that had weird writing all over it. Law looked up from his herbs to see what the kid was talking about and couldn't help but stop and stare at the rock. That's a special stone. He said, placing his hands on it, carefully feeling it. What's it say? Luffy asked, getting bored with it. I don't know, no one can read the writing anymore. Law said, and Luffy started to kick the dirt. So it's a mystery stone. Hey, I think I see a way out. Luffy said, looking up at the ceiling where vines crawled up the walls. Man, that might work. Law said, touching the vines to test their strength. Luffy was never patient and began to climb the vines quickly like a little monkey. Law sighed at the kid's impatientness and climbed right after him. We're out. Luffy said, loudly, smiling widely. He began to pull the sweater off of himself to give back to Law. Thanks for letting me borrow this. Law took the sweater and put it back on himself. No problem. Law said, feeling better that he was now in his favorite sweater once more, even if it was a little damp. Wanna come meet my family? Luffy asked him, but Law shook his head. There's no reason to. There wasn't really one in his eyes, but the look Luffy gave him clearly said otherwise. We're friends now. He said simply, and Law felt his jaw slacken and mouth open up. Who said we're friends? Law asked, annoyed, but Luffy was now running past him. Ah, I want to meet your friends as well. He said happily, and Law felt his brow twitch once again. Whatever, follow me, I'll introduce you to my crew. He said, and Luffy cheered happily, following behind his new friend. Captain. Where did you go? We were worried about you. A man came running out wearing a jumpsuit and a hat that covered his eyes. I found what we were looking for. Law said, pulling the bag with the flowers out of his pocket. Lucky. Now we can make that new medicine. He said, taking the bag and bringing it into the tent that was set up for them. Captain. A bear wearing a jumpsuit came running out of the tent and Luffy's eyes widened before sparkling. So cool. He said, and Law just sighed once again as Luffy ran up and threw his arms around the bear's middle, hugging him tightly. "Ah, Captain," the bear freaked as the kid grabbed him. "Boy, Luffy ya," he said, but Luffy wasn't listening as he rubbed his face into the bear's white fur. "So soft," he cried out happily. "Let go of me." "Ah, I'm sorry," the bear said as a dark cloud fell over top of him, accepting his fate of being cuddled. "You're softer than Stefan," Luffy said, thinking of the dog that was on the Moby Dick. "Steven." A guy came out who was wearing a penguin hat. "Man, he's your ship dog," Luffy said, letting the bear go. "Ship dog? Are you on a pirate crew?" Penguin said, placing his hand on his hip and looking down at the kid. "He's Whitebeard pirate," Law said, closing his eyes with a smirk as the crew paled and looked down at the laughing child. "Man, Pops is super strong," Luffy said without a care in the world. "So that's why there was a blue bird circling the skies," one of the crewmates said, and Luffy froze. "Ma's probably mad at me," he said, beginning to sweat. "Ma? Your mother is a pirate as well?" Law asked him curiously. "Nope, I don't have a mother, or I don't think I do. Maybe I should ask Ma about that," Luffy said, getting off topic. "Then who's your ma?" one guy asked, and Luffy smiled brightly. "Marco?" Law felt his mouth twitch into another grin. "Then you should probably get back before something happens," Law said, standing up, but Luffy laughed sheepishly. "I got lost, so I don't know how to get back." "Shushy." Law frowned at the kid and shook his head. "I think your ship's close to ours. I'll walk you back." The hard pirate smiled at their captain and the kid before packing their things up. Now that they had what they were looking for, there wasn't any real reason to stay on the island. "How old are you, Traffy?" Luffy asked, making the hard pirate snicker before getting a look for Law. "I'm 17. He said simply. "Man, I'm only 12. What made you want to be a pirate?" Luffy was always interested in why people sailed the seas. "Who knows, I have my own reasons," he said, and left it at that. Luffy just met interested. "I've decided. When I turn 17 I'll set sail just like you," Luffy said, smiling, and Law just gave him a funny look. "Why just like me, kid?" He was confused. He had only known the boy for a few hours. "Because I've always had plenty of brothers and a lot of family, but you're my first friend." He gave Law the brightest smile, and Law couldn't help but return it. "I won't wait for you, kid, we have the same goal in mind. If you take too long I'll snatch it away from you," he challenged, leading Luffy through the forest towards the trail that brought him to the shore. "I don't expect anyone to wait for me. I'll become the Pirate King all on my own." Luffy scowled up at Law as they walked the crew, happy to see a different side of their captain. "There's your ship, so get going," Law said, stopping suddenly once out of the forest. Luffy looked and could see the large ship ahead of him, so he smiled. "Sure you don't want to meet my family?" he asked, turning around to look at Law once more, and sighed when Law shook his head no. "I'll see you around, Luffy, yeah?" Law said, pushing the kid forwards, making him laugh. Luffy walked slowly back to the ship, hearing his siblings call out to him from the deck and Pops laughing from his chair. Stopping suddenly, Luffy turned around and yelled out. "Traffy. I'll see you at the top," before waving and laughing and running to his family. "What an interesting kid," Penguin said from beside his smiling captain. "We'll meet again, at the top." He laughed before walking with his crew towards his submarine. "Where the heck were you, Luffy yoy?" Marco scolded the kid, who laughed loudly. "Having an adventure with a friend and a bear." He laughed again as Marco just stared at him. "What happened to you guys?" Luffy asked, looking at the red-faced Ace and Thatch. "They got into some trouble and are paying for it." Ace appeared to have a handprint on his cheek and Thatch seemed to have double. "What a fun island." Luffy grinned, sitting down on the railing as the sails were drawn and the ship turned towards the open sea. "What did you do on the island, Luffy?" Sabo asked, sitting beside his brother. "Making a friend and a rival." He grinned at the challenge made. "Oh really?" Thatch said to the kid, who nodded his head. "Pops." The old man looked at Luffy just as everyone else did. "In 5 years' time, when I'm 17, I'm going to set out on my own." Marco froze and stared at Luffy while the old man smiled softly. "What brought on this decision, yoy?" Marco asked, watching the kid, his heart racing. "I'm not a kid anymore, ma, it's time I start to get myself ready to go." Sabo and Ace silently watched their little brother. They had been preparing themselves for this dream to come. "Where will you start?" Aizu said to the kid, who turned to Ace and Sabo. "You guys were from the East Blue, right? I want to start there." Sabo and Ace smiled and pulled the kid into a side hug. "We have 5 years with you still, so don't think about this too hard, K," they said, and Luffy nodded his head, smiling. "He's planning on leaving that soon, yoy." Marco knew the day would come when Luffy decided to leave, but that didn't mean he had to like it. Every child must grow. Luffy is no exception. Pop said, and Marco just remained silent. He's growing up so fast all of a sudden, Thatch said from beside Marco, taking notice of the kid's changes. No, he's always been growing, we just have been refusing to see it. Haruta said, walking away. Don't stress on tomorrow, Marco, why not enjoy today? Thatch said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. Marco just stood there watching his brother race to the galley to get the lunches he missed because of his adventure. Haruta was right, Luffy had been growing right before their eyes, but all he saw was that tiny baby who needed his constant protection. He didn't know the change was that drastic until this moment though. Luffy, who had always had trouble making friends with those outside of the crew, had made a friend. If that didn't say he was growing up, then nothing else did. Silently following the boy to the kitchen, he vowed to ensure Luffy was as strong as he could be before letting him leave the ship. After all, he was Marco's precious little brother, and he would make sure all people who dared to threaten him knew it and the consequences that came with touching the kid. It was the middle of the night, but Luffy couldn't sleep, so he went where he was the most comfortable during these times, the figurehead. Sitting on the whale's head, he stared out at the sea, watching the deep dark night crash with the black waves against the ship's side. Why was Luffy out in the night? Well, something had been really bothering him. It was something Traffy had said to him that made him think, which was something he didn't really like to do. Where did he come from? Traffy asked if his mother was a part of the crew, and he knew that she wasn't, unless one of the nurses was his mother, but they all looked young. He had always seen Pops as his father, so he never once questioned anything, but now he wasn't sure. Hey kid, what's up? Thatch said, coming up to sit beside him, throwing a light blanket over Luffy's lap to keep him warm. Nothing really, he said, simply looking out onto the waves. Thatch had been on watch that night when he saw Luffy wander out of his room and onto the ship's deck. He was worried when the kid hopped the railing onto the figurehead, so he chose to check on him. Marco would have his head if he let the kid drown during the night. Nothing really, eh? Well, you're up, so it might actually be something really. Thatch countered, watching Luffy from the corner of his eye. Just thinking too much, I guess, Luffy replied, but didn't smile when Thatch did a mock surprised face. Then it must definitely be something really big. What's wrong, kid? Thatch asked in concern, knowing that Luffy was not known for his thinking skills. Thatch, where was I born? Luffy asked suddenly, and Thatch felt himself freezing up. How did I end up here? Who are my parents? Why did they give me up? He continued and just stared at the sea. Who is my real father? Luffy asked, and that struck nerve with Thatch. Pops is your father, he said stiffly. Yeah, I know, but who is my my real father, he repeated, and Thatch stood up. I think it's time for bed, Luffy. He said, turning away from the kid. But you didn't answer my questions at all. Luffy huffed out. He wanted answers to these questions that had been bothering him for a while. They don't need answers, Luffy. You're here, that's all that matters. Thatch said forcefully. Fine, whatever, I'll just ask Marco tomorrow. Luffy stood up with the blanket and brushed his pajamas off. No, don't do that. Thatch said to the kid, who tilted his head annoyed and confused. Why? He whined out, and Thatch frowned. Because Marco doesn't want to answer them either. Good night, kid. He said, pushing Luffy back towards the railing and watching him head off to bed. This won't end well, Thatch sighed out while frowning out towards the sea. This won't end well at all. Line break. When morning came, the galley was silent for the first time in what felt like forever. Hey Lou, what's wrong? Sabo asked Luffy, who just continued to eat his breakfast in silence, ignoring his brother. Luffy? Ace came up beside him and stole a piece of bacon from his plate, only to get no reaction from the kid. The lack of reaction made Ace freak out inside, which only caused him to give Sabo a worried and panicked look. Marco's sharp eyes were on the boy, worry clear all over his posture. What on earth was going on? Luffy just continued his breakfast as if no one was in the room, and that made everyone feel even more edgy. Luffy, what's wrong, Yoi? Marco finally asked, only for Luffy to look up at his with cold brown eyes before standing up. Nothing, it's not like you'll care anyways. He said finally before leaving the galley, leaving everyone stunned in silence. What the A said, confused as to why Luffy was so angry all of a sudden. Thatch paled, knowing where this anger was coming from and why it had been caused. He regretted the talk he had with Luffy more and more, especially by the lack of color on Marco's face and the sad hurt look in his eyes. This is my fault, let me deal with it. Thatch said, standing up from the table, getting confused glances towards the chef. How is this your fault? Pops asked from the end of the table. This attitude was a rare thing for Luffy, so when it happened he took it seriously. He asked me a bunch of questions I wasn't prepared for, and I kind of snapped at him. Thatch said, sadly, sighing deeply. So what does this all have to do with me not caring, Yoi? Marco said, looking up at Thatch, blue eyes shining with a tinge of anger. He wanted to ask you the questions, and that's when I got snappy. Thatch said apologetically to his best friend. So what? A said, leaning back a bit on the bench. I agree, it's just like when Marco and Luffy fought years ago, just go and make up already. Sabo said, leaning on his elbow, looking at Thatch with annoyance all over his face. What kind of questions was he asking? Aizu said, joining the conversation. He wanted to know where he came from, who his parents were, and why they had left him with us. Thatch said, and Marco sighed, knowing this might happen someday. So why didn't you answer him as truthfully as possible, Yoi? He knew the questions were better left unanswered, but at least giving the kid something small would have avoided this mess altogether. It wasn't those questions that bothered me, he said, looking away from Marco, frowning. He asked who his real father is. Marco didn't quite understand and gave Thatch a look, clearly saying that. Ops is our father. Thatch pointed to the old man. Ops is all the father I need. He said with some heat, and Marco smiled softly at his friend and brother. I know that, and so does Luffy, he's a teenager, he's questioning everything right now. Haruta said, eating her bacon and watching the conversation carefully. She had seen Luffy growing for a while now and had recognized the signs that he wanted to be his own person. The family loved the kid, all three of them really, but they struggled with the idea that Luffy was not a child anymore and that he was becoming a man. If you had trouble with him asking those questions, how the heck are you going to deal when he begins asking about girls? Haruta asked and smirked when Marco's mouth just hung open, his eyes wide and fearful. Like he'll ever ask about girls. Sabo said with a snicker as Ace snorted and nodded his head, agreeing with his brother. Well, whatever, Thatch, you said this is your problem, so deal with it. She stood up with her empty plate and headed to the kitchen to drop it off in the sink. Thatch sighed, accepting that this was his mess to clean, but the old man shook his head before standing up. Let me talk with him instead. Thatch turned to look at his father, questioning. As his father, it is my duty to talk with him about this. Marco stood up as well, nodding. Let me join in, I need to make sure he knows that I will always care no matter what, Yoi. Marco followed the old man out of the galley to find Luffy back where he felt the safest. Marco was the first to hop over the railing to talk to the kid and wasn't surprised to see the cold brown eyes instead of the warm ones he knew. He didn't like the look in those eyes, but would dwell on that later when he had more time. We want to talk with you, Yoi. Marco said, reaching a hand out to Luffy to help him stand up, but the kid got up on his own. Whatever. He said and walked towards Pops and Thatch, who flinched a bit. Luffy, why don't we find a place to talk? Thatch said hesitantly, but only got silence in return. Luffy, I heard from your brother what happened. Pops started and Luffy just looked away as they walked towards Pop's chair. The nurses were starting to surround him, checking that he was okay. I just wanted to know some answers, but no one ever gives me that. Luffy said, sitting down, frustrated with his family once again. We want to give you answers, my son, we just feel some answers could cause more harm than good. Pop started, but Luffy wasn't having any of it. I'm not a kid anymore. I'm turning 13 soon, I can take care of myself. No one ever treated Ace and Sabo like this. He said, looking at Marco and Thatch, who were silenced by the outburst. Whatever, it's not a big deal anymore, I don't care. Luffy said, standing up and adjusting his hat on his head before taking off. It appears there is more to this than his questions not being answered. Pop said, watching the kid take off. They had anchored at an island just before breakfast, so they knew he would be heading towards it to cool his head. Should we follow him, Yoi? Marco was usually the first one to chase after Luffy, but with his new attitude happening, he was unsure if he should. No, let him be for now, I have a feeling your youngest brothers won't take this for much longer. Pop said, watching the blonde and brunette watch the island carefully before taking off onto it as well. Marco frowned, not quite understanding what was going through his littlest brother's head, but hoped the kids there could help him out. Line break. Luffy knew he was being irrational with his anger, but that didn't stop him from being angry any less. He was sick of being treated like a kid, like a brat. When Ace and Sabo turned 13, Marco and Thatch partied with everyone else and congratulated them on becoming teenagers. Luffy was excited for the same treatment but started to think that might not come. Luffy was walking along the beach in such annoyance that he didn't see the man right in front of him until he was crashing into the person. You might want to be more careful. The man drawled out, looking down at the kid with his yellow sharp eyes. Would you get in my way? Luffy snarled out at the man, who raised a brow at his tone. It was you that was spaced out. The man said, letting the kid get up on his own. Luffy just frowned and looked away from him. Where did you get that hat? He said, looking at Luffy with a curious but almost bored expression. Shanks gave it to me. It's our promise. Ah. I shouldn't tell people that. Luffy said, finally realizing he didn't know this man. What's your name, child? He asked Luffy, who pouted. I'm not a child and my name's Monkey D. Luffy. It's polite for someone to say their name before asking another's, you know. Luffy crossed his arms and puffed his cheeks at the man, who smiled, his eyes locked onto the child's hat. You remind me of that red-haired man. He said, and Luffy looked up at him excitedly. You know Shanks, mister, he said excitedly, but trailed off when he realized he didn't know the man's name. The heck? Yes, I know that drunk, you remind me of him quite a lot. he said, and Luffy laughed loudly at him. That's so cool. He pulled the edges of his hat tighter around his head and smiled at the compliment. Why are you here, Haki? Mihawk felt a tinge of annoyance at his nickname, but let it go. This child was really more like Shanks than he gave him credit for. I feel like it, he said, and Luffy laughed again. What about you? He was curious about the child before him. My family's here, but I don't want to see them right now, he said, looking away. Mihawk saw the mark on the kid's back and smirked. Shanks had competition on the kid's heart. Why are you fighting with them? Mihawk signaled the kid to follow him, and Luffy did. They treat me like I'm a kid. They never give me a straight answer about anything serious and act like I'm going to break at the next dangerous moment. I'm tired of being the weak link. I want to be stronger and stronger so no one has to protect me. I want to be the one to protect them, he said, glaring at the sand, the straw hat covering his eyes, shadowing them over, making him look older than he probably was. Mihawk really hated children, hated them when they whined and cried about everything and anything. He hated spoiled brats who expected the world to come to them, and he hated children that were weak. So he in fact liked this child who wanted to become stronger. Wanting to pull the kid out of his darkness, he flicked him in the side of the head, making the boy put his hand to his face. Ouch. That hurt. He whined. That I've heard about you from that damned red hair. He said you ate a devil fruit, so what I used to bypass it was Haki, he said, turning to stand in front of the child. You want to show your family you're no longer a child, right? He said, and Luffy smiled widely, nodding his head. Then you will spend the next week with me. I shall train you to do what I just did, but I won't be easy on you. If you so much as cry during this time, I will send you back to your family in pieces. Do I make myself clear? Luffy's eyes hardened as seriousness took over and his will strong. I understand. Luffy reached his hand out and Mihawk shook it in agreement. Line break. Ace and Sabo had been wandering for what felt like forever, not finding Luffy anywhere at all, and it was bothering them a lot more than they liked. Ace, what's that? Sabo pointed to a note that was attached to a tree by a small dagger. Probably nothing, we need to find Luffy, Ace said, ignoring the note, but Sabo was always smarter, so he walked over to the tree and pulled the note off of the small dagger. Reading the note out loud, Ace's brow twitched in annoyance, and Sabo felt panic rise in his chest. We need to tell everyone, he said as they turned on their heels back to the ship, where everyone was expecting to find three brothers returning, not just two. Where's Luffy, Yoi? Marco asked, looking around for him, but Sabo held up the note and everyone gathered around the boys. Hey guys, I'm running away for a week. Sabo started and Marco sighed in anger as Sabo continued. I've made a friend named Mima Haki. He says he'll make me a bit stronger so I'll be with him. Haki? Does he mean Hawkeye Mihawk? Thatch asked, startled about this information. I'll be back in 1 exact week, so don't look for me. When I get back I'll be a lot stronger so you guys can stop treating me like a kid. Love, Luffy. Sabo finished, and many were face-palming, others were annoyed, and some were just sighing, knowing this might happen sooner or later. So what should we do? Go after him, take him back? Ace asked, smirking, loving the idea of a fight. No, let him go for now. If the letter is true, he will be back in a week, and I am rather interested in what Hawkeye has planned for your brother. Pop said, smiling at his sons, but Marco was reading the letter to himself one more time. What brought this on all of a sudden, Yoi? He asked. Luffy had always been the normal him for such a long time, it wasn't that unusual for the kid to change his mood once in a while, but never something like this. As Haruta said once before, this isn't all of a sudden, this has probably been happening for a while. He's 12 turning 13 soon, he's caught in the murky middle between adulthood and childhood. He's probably trying to find who he is right now and where he stands in this world. When he gets home we'll talk with him better and listen properly this time. Aizu said, playing with his long hair and watching his family. Aizu's right, it's time we learn to listen to him. Thatch agreed, but Marco wasn't sure. He just hoped in a week's time his little brother would be back to his normal self and home safely. Mihawk was a strict man who didn't take to childishness unless he was stuck babysitting his ever-drunk friend, Shanks. He found the kid to be entertaining and annoying all at once, but his patience, learned from being friends with red hair, really pulled through when dealing with him. Nahaki, Luffy asked, sitting close to the fire and warming his hands off of it. Mihawk looked towards the kid, his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. What's that you're drinking? Luffy had been curious about the red liquid he had never seen before. He had been told scary stories about men that drank blood, and that stuff looked like blood, and Mihawk looked like the men that drank it. It is called wine. He drawled out, looking at the kid who tilted his head curiously. What's wine? Mihawk smiled and offered his cup to the child, a smirk on his face. Try some. He knew the kid wouldn't like it, but still thought he'd give it a try. It's not blood or anything like that, right? Luffy asked hesitantly, taking the cup as a tick mark appeared over Mihawk's face. No, it most definitely is not, take a sip. He said, annoyed at the child once more. Alright, I guess. Luffy lifted the cup to his lips and took a mouthful of the drink, only to feel it burn his tongue and throat as he swallowed. Pulling the cup away from his mouth, he swallowed hard and took a deep breath, letting his tongue fall out of his mouth as he panted. That tasted weirder than it looked. He said, and Mihik couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't bad though, Luffy finally said, pulling himself together, and smiled at his now teacher. Then you really are growing up. This is an adult's drink. Luffy couldn't help the wide smile from forming on his face, his eyes sparkled at the man whose sweat dropped at the looks he was receiving. Thanks, Luffy said, passing back the cup to the man, who realized the drink was gone and that the boy had sucked it all back in one gulp. For what, may I ask? He hadn't done anything really. For not treating me like a kid. He turned his head away from Mihik, but the man smiled softly. The kid was interesting, he would give him that. You won't be thanking me tomorrow, get some sleep, we have a busy day in the morning. Luffy nodded as he yawned before flopping onto his back, covering his face with his straw hat and falling promptly asleep. Strange boy, Mihik said before walking to the tent he had set up for himself, but not without a smile on his own face and fondness. Meanwhile, back on the Moby Dick. It was way too quiet for everyone's liking. When dinner rolled around and Luffy didn't come running, it just felt weird and not right. Wow, who died? Sabo asked, entering the room looking at all the gloomy faces around him. Luffy not being here has this effect on everyone. Thatch sighed out, looking just as gloomy, making the boy's sweat drop. You do realize he will be leaving the crew in a few years' time, Ace reminded the man, which only caused a deeper gloom to fall over everyone in the room. Don't remind us, Yoi. Marco said, entering behind the boys and heading to the table to grab food. I hope he's eating well tonight and he's warm. The wind off of the ocean can be cold, Yoi. Sabo shook his head at the mother hen who had lost his chick. He'll be fine, honestly, you guys are a bunch of mother hens. He's a growing boy, let him do what he wants. Even so, the gloominess didn't let up. The ship doesn't feel right without our little ball of sunshine. One of the crewmates said sadly, and Ace smirked in that person's direction. I can be a big ball of sunshine if you want. He said, and Marco snorted in his direction. And set the ship on fire while you're at it, Yoi. No thanks, eat your dinner before Luffy steals. He froze from that sentence and the gloom was back. This is going to be a long week, isn't it? Sabo frowned to his brother, who just nodded. Honestly, you'd think these were pirates, but even he couldn't say he wouldn't miss the boy. Ace was very protective of Luffy, so for him to be out of his sight felt weird and wrong on many levels. He'll be fine, he's a smart kid, sometimes maybe, well, we'll have to trust him, right? Sabo said, smiling softly. Man, we'll trust him just as he's always trusted in us, Ace replied, starting on his dinner. Back with Luffy. When morning arrived, Luffy had to dodge a sword coming for his head. Their reflexes are good, but they need to be better. Get up, we have a lot of work to do today. Mihik commanded, and Luffy jumped up ready to go. I will not coddle you. If you wish to become stronger, then you need to forget that type of treatment. The world will not bow to you because you ask it to, and I will not wait for you should you fall behind. He said to the boy, who nodded his head, accepting the words being said to him. Today I will begin to see how strong your will is. Do you know what haki is, child? Mihik asked while Luffy shook his head in a no way. Haki is your willpower. There are 3 types of haki. The first is observation, which gives the user the ability to see an action before it is done, almost like a third eye. He said, and Luffy tilted his head, not understanding. Stand up, let me show you. Luffy got up from the forest floor he was sitting on quickly and watched his teacher. Throw a punch at me. He commanded, and Luffy did so, only for the man to dodge the hit. Again. Luffy did it again, and for Mihik to step around him, avoiding the hits until Luffy was bent over panting. I could see each and every one of your moves before you threw them. That is the power of observation. Luffy looked up and smiled. I can really learn that? Luffy asked in awe, and Mihik nodded. You, a bearer of D, are destined to learn, even if your slow mind rejects such a fate. He said, turning away while Luffy looked blankly at the man. B. Mihik said nothing more on the subject, getting into the second haki. The second form of haki is called armament haki, which is almost like wearing an invisible armor. He said, walking towards the boy. It also allows the user to bypass the effects of a person's devil fruit like this. He pinched his fingers and flicked Luffy in the head, making the kid grab the spot in pain. That's what you did yesterday. Luffy said, rubbing his forehead in soothing motions. You have probably seen that before in your family. The commanders on that crew must know those forms of haki to be as strong as they are. He said, simply turning back towards the boy. I will be teaching you the basics of those 2 forms of haki, and we will be doing this training my way. Are there any complaints? He smirked at the kid, who puffed his cheeks and put his hat firmly on his head. None, haki, Luffy said, firmly, showing that he was ready for this, but then a thought entered his mind. You said there were 3 forms, but you only said 2 of them. He wanted to get a lot stronger, so all 3 would be better to learn, but Mihik just shook his head. I don't know if you hold the key to the third one or not. Very few are born with the ability to use it and even fewer ever unlock it. If you are a holder of that power then it will come out as your will grows stronger. He said staring into the kid's brown eyes. My will needs to be stronger? He asked softly getting a nod in response. Then I'll make it the strongest in the world. Luffy declared and Mihawk smiled. I don't doubt it, he whispered, making Luffy just stare at him funny. You could almost see the question mark above his head. For today we will be working on your observation training, put this on. Mihawk threw some cloth towards Luffy who caught it in his hands. Where do I put it? He asked and Mihawk had to refrain from rolling his eyes. Over your eyes, child. Luffy made a sound of acknowledgement before putting it over his eyes excitedly. Now what? He was excited to being his training only to get hit on the back of the head with a large stick, knocking the kid off of his feet. What the hell? Luffy exclaimed, lifting the cloth away from his eyes for a moment. Avoid the hits, see them coming and avoid them, it will take time, so use this opportunity to sharpen your reflexes. He said, motioning for the kid to sit down on the forest floor so he could begin. So you're just going to keep hitting me? Luffy was getting annoyed and Mihawk raised a brow at him. If you don't like my training then go back home and remain the child you are. He said coldly to Luffy who flinched at the tone before sitting down. I'll get stronger fast. He said crossing his arms and pouting, but Mihawk shook his head. No you won't, no one gets stronger fast and remains strong. Luffy was confused but chose not to question it as Mihawk pulled a stick back, whacking him over the head again and getting an annoyed growl from Luffy. Again. Mihawk commanded, beginning the process over and over again for the remainder of the day. By nightfall Luffy was sore and hungry and tired. He had managed to avoid many of Mihawk's hits to the man's pleasant surprise but was hit more than allowed in the man's sharp eyes. Here, eat and then got to sleep. Mihawk said to the kid who gladly took the meat, eating it quickly. Tomorrow you will be hunting and catching your own dinner. He said simply and Luffy made a noise of annoyance. I told you I will not coddle you, if you wish to grow stronger then you must be able to hunt and protect yourself on your own. Your observation training will continue throughout the day and night every day for this week. He said, eating his own dinner and drinking more wine. How would you train me in the night? Luffy didn't want to be hit while he slept. I will attack you day and night, always have your senses ready and always sleep with one eye open. As a pirate the boy will be attacked as he grows. As a boy who had the attention of 2 emperors, many would want to kill the kid to show strength over those emperors. Luffy would need to become stronger than he is now, stronger than he will be if he wants to survive this world. Mihawk pulled himself out of his musings to find the child sleeping soundly and he couldn't help but sigh. Tonight he would let the boy be, but come morning his training will begin once again. Mihawk kept his promise and when morning arrived Luffy was being attacked once again. Pulling his sword out, he aimed for Luffy's head as the kid's eyes snapped open and he dodged the blade rolling out of the way. Mihawk pivoted on his foot, bringing his sword up and slashing down the kid's chest, creating an X-like mark. You should have seen that motion coming, get better at this. He said sternly as Luffy grabbed his chest. I won't get hit next time. He winced out, blood covering his fingers as he touched the wound and taking his shirt off to check out the injury. It won't scar, but it will sting. If you don't want any more injuries don't get hit. Understood. He said as the sword slashed by his neck, making the child bend backwards away from it and running into the forest. Time for breakfast. He said excitedly, drool forming at the corner of his mouth and his stomach growling angrily. Luffy had been hunting before with Ace and Sabo, so he knew how to hunt well. He didn't have his pipe with him so he would have to use his fists to beat down whatever animal came his way, but that didn't really matter to him. After he caught his breakfast, skinned it and cooked it over a small fire, he went back to the campsite to find his teacher sitting on a stump drinking a glass of wine, his eyes closed. It took you too long to catch your meal. He said and Luffy frowned. You need to become faster in every way, but we can work on that later. He said, opening his sharp eyes and looking at the kid. Now we start on armament hockey, let us begin. Luffy nodded and waited for his teacher to make a move, but he didn't have to wait long. The remainder of those days passed in a similar fashion, with Mihawk training the kid in both observation and armament hockey. Luffy could now coat one of his hands into black steel-like substance which made the man proud. Luffy could also now feel when Mihawk was going to attack him, he could especially feel it during the night when the man would attack the most seriously. Mihawk calculated that the boy would become a master of those forms of hockey if he continued his training throughout his life. He figured the boy would one day be able to use Conqueror's hockey, but where he stood right now it was a distant dream. He sighed knowing the child would be leaving to return home soon, and as much as he hated to admit it, he had become fond of the brat. Uncle Hockey. Luffy called out, making the man's brow twitch. Well, maybe not that fond of him really, he couldn't help but think. Why in the world do you call me that? He asked the child who looked at him like he was stupid. Because you're part of my family now, deal with it. Luffy said in the most Luffy way possible. The man shook his head and sighed. "Uncle, someday we'll meet again on the seas," Luffy said, placing his hand on his hips. Luffy had lost his shirt completely during the week, he was covered in dirt, cuts and smelled terrible, but the grin he had on his face outshined all of the dirtiness on his body. And why is that? He had seen quite quickly that the boy was all thumbs with a sword, so he knew he wouldn't come to him for that. "Someday I'll find a swordsman that will be stronger than even you," he challenged, and Mihik felt a smile form on his face. "I can't wait," he said, making Luffy laugh. Waving goodbye to his teacher, Luffy raced back to the large ship where his family had been starting to look worried. "Luffy?" Ace and Sabo cried out, jumping the boy the moment he got back on the ship. "Shishishi, I'm home." He laughed out. "Don't ever leave us again. Marco looks like he's going to die and Thatch has been sulking this whole week." Said men walked up to Luffy looking like crap, making Luffy sigh. "Did you know that you stink, little brother?" Thatch said with a half smile, and Luffy laughed. "Not as bad as you," he joked, making everyone laugh. "I'm glad you're home, Luffy yoy," Marco said, trying to pull Ace off of Luffy, but he had latched himself onto the boy and refused to let go. "Ace, I can't move with you like this," Luffy whined, but Ace shook his head no. Ace had really missed Luffy, and seeing the cuts and bruises over his body made his protective nature stronger than it already was. Luffy closed his eyes, pinched his fingers and flicked Ace in the forehead, making the brother let go and grab his head. "How did you?" he asked, but fell silent at the look Luffy had given him. "What do you think I was doing all week? It's not like I was just sitting on my ass, you know," he said. "Language, Luffy yoy," Marco said, but even he recognized hockey. Ace and Sabo had been working on hockey for a while now from him, so he was quite surprised to see Luffy being able to use it so easily. "Luffy," Thatch said, looking down at the kid who had just got Ace to let go of him. "About a week ago, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have," he started, but Luffy held a hand up. "We're both at fault, I shouldn't have gotten mad at you like that, but I want you guys to be honest with me, stop treating me like a baby. I'm growing up, and if the world sees you guys treating me like this, then everyone else will treat me like that," he said to Thatch, who nodded his head. "I'm talking to you as well, ma, I'm not a baby anymore," he said, and Marco sighed softly before smiling and ruffling Luffy's black hair. "You'll always be my little baby yoy," making Luffy pout. "Welcome home, my son." Luffy looked up to see his father standing above him, and he couldn't remember feeling as happy as he did right now as he jumped up into the old man's arms for a hug. "I'm back, Pops," he said as the old man laughed, happy to see his bright son back to normal. "Luffy, let's go take a bath," Ace said, and Sabo nodded. "We want to hear all about your adventures and training." Man, I learned a lot. I learned especially never to truly fall asleep." Luffy laughed out, making the crew question Mihik's training once again. "Why would you not want to fall asleep?" Ace asked, confused, and Luffy began his tale as the brothers headed to the bath area. "It's good to see him back to normal yoy." Marco smiled, knowing he can finally sleep now that his little brother was back. "He looks older," Thatch said from beside his friend, and Pop smiled. "That's because he is, and he will continue to get stronger as he grows," the old man said, smiling, happy his family was back to the way it should be. Line break. Mihik had been sailing on his small ship for a while now when he came to an island he had been searching for. Stepping onto the island, he turned to the men that were panicking at his presence and sharp eyes. "Where can I find your captain?" he asked, and the men stood up before running into the forest. "Captain? It's Hawkeye," the man said as Mihik entered the clearing to find Shanks drinking himself stupid as usual. "And what do I owe this pleasure to, Hawkeye?" he asked, the man looking up at him, his face shadowed, his red hair falling into his eyes. "A young boy with a bright straw hat that looked a lot like your old one," he said, smirking at the man whose eyes widened. "Luffy? You met Luffy?" Shanks asked seriously. "Met him? I had the opportunity to train him," he said, and Shanks froze completely. "You, the great Hawkeye?" Mihik took on a student. "And my little Luffy was that lucky person?" he asked stiffly, not processing the information all that well. "Yes, he is a lot like you, so he wasn't that hard to deal with," he drawled out, taking one of Shanks' drinks. "And you didn't cut any of his limbs off?" Shanks asked seriously, never knowing Mihik's personality and attitude. "I considered it once he began to call me uncle," he said, annoyed once again at the child who was miles away. "Wait, he called you uncle?" Shanks laughed out loud, tears flying from his eyes in laughter. "Don't make me kill your red hair," Mihik said seriously. "Sure thing, uncle." "Dahahaha." He laughed, and Mihik pulled his sword and swung it at the man, who ducked, laughing still. "What did you train him in?" Ben asked seriously as Shanks continued to laugh. "He is capable of using both observation and armament hockey now," Mihik said, and Ben smiled, proud of the kid. "This calls for a party," Shanks called out, getting a cheer, but Mihik rolled his eyes. "It looks as though you have already had one," he said, but Shanks wrapped his arm over the man's shoulder and pushed a new drink into his hands. There are never enough parties in the world. He laughed and Mihik smiled as the party could be heard from all across the island, celebrating an achievement for a young boy who wanted to grow up just a little bit faster, and Mihik couldn't wait until he did. It was midday when the first shots were fired at the Moby Dick, and Luffy ran to the side of the ship with excitement in his eyes and a wide grin on his face. Ace and Sabo were both in battle formation ready to defend their home and family at any given second. "Luffy, didn't you hear the noises? Get back." Ace all but screamed at his little brother, who closed his eyes and stepped gracefully to the side as a bullet went past his ear. "Way too slow," he whispered in an almost bored tone, making Sabo laugh and Ace groan. Luffy's training with Mihik had left him with sharp senses and a better control of himself and his wandering mind. Luffy was reaching a time in his life where his limbs felt too long and his feet too big, but he wanted to be as normal as possible, which for Luffy was almost impossible. Next to Luffy, Sabo was the best at hockey. He had been training every day with Marco and refused to let up until he could properly punch Ace in the gut and Luffy over the head. Sabo was very proud of himself when he was finally able to take Ace down in one of their spars. He wanted to boast about the win over his brother, but Ace's pout told the story of what happened for the blonde. Back to the battle where Ace and Sabo had started to fight the pirates off while ignoring their banter and taunting as they fought. Marco was flying up above, attacking those who tried to jump to the large ship by swinging on a rope. Ops wasn't moving too much yet since there wasn't really a reason for him to. His children had everything under control, but he would step in if things began to get out of hand. "Nah, Ace," Luffy said, punching a man in the head, sending him flying backwards. Ace turned his head towards the boy, his brow raised up showing his interest. "Wanna have a bet?" Ace had become interested in gambling since he stated spending more time with Thatch. "Whatcha thinkin'?" Ace smirked and Luffy laughed. "Shishishi, I bet I can get onto the other ship faster than you can," Luffy said in a sing-song voice. "Why would we want to get on their ship?" Ace was confused. "Well," he dragged out, looking around in case Marco's powerful ears were close by. "I heard pirates like treasure," he started, and Ace nodded his head. "I also heard these guys bragging about all the gold they got," and it was like a light switched on in Ace's mind as a smile slowly formed over his handsome face. "We steal their gold and I burn the ship to the ocean floor," Ace whispered, looking at Luffy in a new light. "I guess something like that. Just think of all the meat I could buy with that gold." Luffy stopped his fighting so he could daydream and drool. Luffy suddenly ducked as Sabo swung his pipe across the boy's head, hitting an attacking pirate in the nose, sending him back. "What are guys talking about?" He had been busy actually fighting to protect the ship. "We're going to rob their ship," Luffy said with a grin while Sabo turned to Ace looking for a better explanation. "We're starting it off with a bet. How much, Lou?" he asked, looking around Sabo towards Luffy, who held up 10 fingers. "Then Belly says I get to the ship first before Luffy does." Ace smirked and jumped around a few pirates, aiming for the plank that connected the two ships. "Gee, I'll get there faster than you," Luffy said, grabbing the railing of the Moby Dick and pulling himself as far back as he could go. "Gomu Gomu no rocket," he shouted and launched himself across the ship. Many eyes widened as a young teenager flew past their heads over the ocean and onto the rival ship. "Shishishi. I made it first, Ace." Luffy cheered but felt something tapping his shoulder. Luffy turned around to see a smiling Ace behind him, so he did the best thing possible at this moment. He pouted. "No fair," he moaned while Ace laughed. "Gotta be faster, little brother." Luffy reached into his pocket and pulled out the belly, handing it over to his proud laughing older brother. "I think the treasure's down below," Luffy said as Sabo landed on the ship's railing, looking down at his brothers just listening to their plan. "I'll help, Luffy, you hold off the men that come to fight us," Ace said to Sabo, who grinned. His blue eyes almost had a slivery blue shine in the light. "Make sure to get it all," he teased, and Ace laughed, following Luffy below deck. Once Ace and Luffy were out of sight, a man came running towards him, looking slightly alarmed that someone was on the ship. "Who the hell are you, kid?" he shouted, ready to alert the others of the intruder. "I'm an angle here to bring destruction to this crew," he joked, rolling his eyes, and the man looked extremely confused. "I didn't ask what you were, I asked who you were, you bastard," the man said, but Sabo lifted his pipe up and brought it down across the man's head. "I'm Sabo, but I guess that doesn't really matter anymore either way," he said, twirling his pipe and bringing it behind him to rest. Marco was flaring blue, white and gold from above, his anger soaring knowing his youngest brats were on an enemy ship doing goodness knows what. He sensed the old man's eyes on the ship, knowing that if anything funny happens, he would ensure the kids were off of it. Marco could also sense the old man's anger at his youngest sons for doing something so reckless and unnecessary. Luffy and Ace wandered the ship for a while, as Luffy refused to allow his older brother to take charge of his mission. Eventually they did find the treasury, and the pirates were right about the gold. There was a ton. Ace's eyes widened in excitement and ideas of all the things he could buy with this much gold, while Luffy started to stuff his never-ending pockets. Ace. He called to his frozen shocked brother who started to slowly move towards the pile of treasure. Damn it, we should have brought bags. Ace said after a moment of staring. Are you stupid? That's why we got pockets. Luffy said, still stuffing coins into his pants now. Don't call me stupid, stupid. Ace shouted at Luffy, who chuckled before looking up at the ceiling, hearing a lot of banging up above. Damn, it looks like we might need to leave some treasure here, Ace said, frowning, deeply worrying about Sabo. Oh well, it's not like we need all of it anyways. Luffy said, simply shrugging his shoulders and standing up, causing coins fell out of his shorts to his feet. Ah. My pants are leaking. He exclaimed in surprise while Ace had to fight not to face palm at his brother's antics. Doesn't that feel weird and all, Lou? Ace asked, looking at his brother funny. Why would it feel weird? Luffy didn't quite understand and just figured his older brother must be really stupid. Well, whatever, let's go. Ace said, pushing the kid out the doorway and towards the stairs. Sabo was getting annoyed by the amount of pirates returning to the ship. Guys, all I wanted was for you to stay and fight a little longer, he complained as he brought his pipe down onto another man's neck, ignoring the scream of agony. He knew there was a chance that his family would beat this weak crew long before his brothers were finished, but he had hoped they would last just a bit longer. Stupid brat, now you've done it. One man said, and Sabo rolled his eyes. Sure, that's what the last guy said. And he brought his pipe back in for another attack. We're going to kill you, runt. Sabo sighed. This wasn't as fun as he had hoped it would be. These guys, I don't care if you grab it all, just get the heck up here so we can go. Sabo muttered under his breath, stomping on the deck, hoping to alert his brothers of the danger. Sabo breathed a sigh of relief when the door banged open and his brothers came running out through it. You're late. He said, glaring at the two, who smiled. Yeah, but we're rich. And Sabo couldn't help but laugh with them. Now shall we burn this place down? Ace asked, smirking, tapping his hat forward, shadowing his eyes. Man, I'd love to fight, but my underwear's full of gold. Luffy said, nonchalantly, making Sabo look at Ace, who just smiled. Get going. Luffy grinned and chuckled as he ran towards the ship's side to at least watch the battle if he wasn't going to join in. I wouldn't touch him if I were you. Ace said to one of the pirates who was walking towards Luffy but stopped to look at Ace. You see that boy there is very precious to us, he's our treasure, and pirates usually protect their treasure. Ace continued, turning his arm into flames. Ace punched a few of the members with his new move he liked to call his fire fist, which caused spots of the ship to catch flame. Ace was having the time of his life with Sabo covering his back and Luffy laughing from the ship's railing. He couldn't have felt more alive than he did at this very moment. Marco had enough watching from the sidelines and dropped down beside Luffy, who smiled at him happily. Hey ma, having fun? Luffy was way too cheerful for this type of fight, and that worried Marco slightly. Not really, it's not like I enjoy seeing my family fight like this, yoi. Marco scolded Luffy, who pouted. Luffy scowled under his breath. I'm having fun. We robbed this ship. He cheered happily and Marco shook his head but smiled. Where'd you put it, yoi? He asked, not seeing any treasure around him. Shishishi, down here. Luffy pointed to his crotch, making Marco blank and look away. Weird little brothers, yoi. He whispered to himself as Luffy laughed more. Can you take it back to the ship, it's really heavy. He whined, standing up and shaking himself out, allowing the gold to fall to the deck with clattering sounds. Marco sighed watching the gold fall and had Luffy help him scoop as much of it up as possible. Let's go back to the ship together, yoi. He said, hoping Luffy would follow him somewhere safer than here. Nah, I want to watch the battle. I'm safe here, ma, I've got my big brothers here to protect me. He pointed to Ace and Sabo, who were laughing as they fought. Alright, but Pops is watching, kid, yoi. Marco said with his gathered coins and treasure. He jumped over to the Moby Dick to let the old man know what was going on. Marco didn't miss the frown on the old man's face, but let it go. He knew that Pops would be having a talk with the boys later about this. Luffy smiled while watching his brothers fight. He loved the way they moved gracefully around one another, as if they were one soul separated into two bodies. When Ace shot up, Sabo bent down and took out another's footing, leaving him easy prey for Ace to step on and burn through his boots. Their eyes were bright, Ace's flames of orange and red reflecting off of Sabo's blue created a beautiful color that Luffy found himself loving more and more. Luffy loved watching his brothers fight because it was the prettiest and most dangerous thing in the world. The battle was coming to an end, and Luffy knew that by the way Sabo and Ace were no longer doing their dance of fluent movements. He jumped off the railing ready to go with his brothers home when one of the last standing men pointed his gun at him. Luffy rolled his eyes knowing that bullets couldn't hurt him and continued to walk forward, only for the man to smirk and change directions, shooting Sabo in the side. Ace had been distracted by another fighter and didn't see the man standing until Luffy screamed and Sabo fell. Sabo! Ace screamed, turning towards his fallen brother as Luffy was trying to help him up. Ace's bleeding badly. Luffy freaked, but Sabo was still trying to move. I'm alright, it didn't go through. He said, giving a weak smile, but the temperature dropped in quickly. Marco, hearing Luffy scream, came running towards the boys with Thatch on his heels. What going on, Yoi? He asked, kicking himself for not bringing the boys with him while he was there earlier. Sabo was shot. Ace said, shoving a man aside. Stupid bastard. You were able to dodge it even slightly, but that's a bad injury, you won't be moving for a while. The man and his small group of leftovers laughed but stopped very suddenly. Luffy looked up at them from Sabo's side. He had never been this angry before, and hearing that man's laugh only fueled his anger to become stronger. That was my brother, Luffy said, his eyes cold, hard and angry with a glare that Marco, Ace and Thatch had ever seen before. Marco would never admit it, but that look on Luffy's face scared him greatly, making him never want to see it again. Luffy stood up slowly, placing his hat beside Sabo. He took a step forward. That is my older brother you just shot. He whispered coldly and softly, shaking the air with his words. And what ya gonna do about it, brat? The man laughed, pointing his gun at Luffy, but Luffy just looked up at him, a wave of anger leaving his body, and the men around fell to the deck, eyes rolled back and mouths hung open. Don't ever touch my family again. He screamed before his knees gave out and everything went black around him. Gotcha, kid. Thatch said, catching Luffy in his arms, cradling the now 13-year-old boy, protecting him. At Sabo to the infirmary now, this fight is over, Yoi. Marco called to his family who was on the ship in a moment. Sorry Ace, I turned my back. Sabo groaned, but Ace patted him on his shoulder. You're alive, just don't do that again. He smiled at his brother, clapping his hand in a promise form as he was taken away on a stretcher. What was that Luffy did? Ace asked, turning to Marco, who was frowning. Conqueror's Haki, Yoi. Marco said, leading Ace off of the dead ship as it burned and sunk from Ace's many fire attacks. Isn't it the third type of Haki that you won't train us in? Ace asked, confused. Yes it is. Pop said, coming up in front of his children, only 1 in a million have it and even fewer ever unlock it. Pops continued, looking at the sleeping child in Thatch's arms. Why did he pass out? Ace was more confused than before. Luffy was so angry that he used his own will to protect Sabo and yourself. He's really young to have Haki, especially the third one, using that much of his will tired him out. Thatch said, looking down at the boy. Marco had Luffy's hat in his hand and he stared at it, remembering the look Luffy gave in his anger. He'll be a force to be reckoned with someday, Yoi. He could see a small glimpse in that look of a powerful captain to be in that small moment of time. We'll have to make sure we keep him on our side, then now won't we? Thatch joked while carrying Luffy to the infirmary with his brother Ace following behind him, a proud smile on his face for his treasures, both of them. I was just on the phone with your grandfather. Ace visibly paled and Luffy cheered happily. What does that old geezer want? Ace coughed out, worried and annoyed. He has requested you and your brothers to spend 2 months with him in the East Blue. Pops continued on. Luffy's eyes brightened. But you told him no, right Pops? Ace said carefully. He is your grandfather and it will only be a few months. Pops said, and Ace just stared at the old man. Luffy was excited to see his grandpa. You can't be serious, he had spent enough time with the old geezer, thank you very much. I am, in 2 weeks' time you will be going with him for 2 months, then returning here. He knew Ace wouldn't like this decision, but it was good for Luffy and in the long run may be good for Marco. As well. I get to see where you grew up. Luffy said to Ace, grabbing his hand and giving him the puppy look that Ace so hated. Why yeah, he said numbly. Go tell your brothers, they will want to know what is going on. He said, and Luffy was off to tell Marco the news while Ace dragged himself down to Sabo to deliver their death sentence. Ma, guess what? Luffy called as he entered into the galley, making said man look up from his meal with a small smile. What, Yoi? He said, following the game. Ace, Sabo and I are leaving for 2 months. He said, and the room fell silent. What? Thatch said, entering the conversation. Man, Pop said that in 2 weeks we'll be going with Grandpa for 2 whole months. He cheered, but the pirates present froze. And Pop said this, Yoi. Marco was able to get out, hoping this was a prank. Yup, Ace is talking with Sabo right now. He said, smiling, but Marco was not. Marco stood up ready to leave and get to the bottom of this. I'll be right back, Yoi. Marco said stiffly, and he and Thatch went straight to the old man who was expecting this. Marco, Thatch. He said as they entered, looking annoyed, borderline angry. You can't give them to that man. Thatch said, but Pops shook his head. He is their grandfather, he has every right to them. He argued. Then why has he made no attempt to see them before, Yoi? Marco wasn't going to hand Luffy off so easily. He has his reason, I assume. Marco, you need to see this as a learning opportunity. He said seriously to his eldest son. Luffy will be leaving when he turns 17, if you cannot handle him gone for a few months, you will not survive him gone when the time comes. Marco looked down knowing this. He is a growing man now, still a child yes, but it is time we put our faith in him. They will only be going to the East Blue, there will probably be no danger, but we will keep our eyes and ears on them just in case. Pop said, and Marco felt his heart hurting at all of this. I'll miss them Yoi. He whispered and Pops chuckled softly. We all will, but they won't be gone long. Thatch said, accepting that this needed to happen. This is going to be the longest 2 months of my life Yoi. He said, and Thatch laughed. We'll survive it together as a family. Pop said to his sons, and they would, because that's what a family does. Luffy was wide awake and that was driving him crazy. His week with Mihawk had left his senses sharper than they ever were before, especially at night. Mihawk made it his job to attack Luffy when he was dead tired. He showed no mercy to the kid through the day and went even harder during the night. Because Luffy had learned to always be alert during the night, his mind was racing and his ears were listening. Luffy rolled over on his bed, glared at the wall, and decided to get up and go have some fun. His first stop, Ace's room. Ace had moved over to the 2nd Division, though it was at this moment without a commander, he felt more comfortable there right now. On the first day of lessons, Mihawk had taught him that not everything needed to be noisy. Luffy loved to make noise, but Mihawk told him that quiet killed his dinner faster than him yelling at it did. Luffy had practiced sneaking quietly up behind animals for a week, so sneaking into Ace's room was pretty simple. Creeping up to his older brother, he pulled out a marker and drew a few pictures on his face. Giggling quietly, he crept out of the room and towards his other sleeping brother Sabo, who was sleeping in the 3rd Division right now. Doing the exact same thing, Luffy felt very proud of himself but not quite satisfied. Deciding that if he was going to make this night the best night ever, he would need to prank the pranking king himself. Sneaking now towards the 4th Division, Luffy grinned wickedly at the plans he had for his older brother. He opened Thatch's door and crept in slowly, but was grabbed around the waist and tickled in the stomach, making him laugh loudly. Saint, stop, haha, I'm so haha sorry. Luffy laughed out, falling down to the floor and smiling up at his brother, who looked down at Luffy with his arms crossed. Who gave you permission to pull pranks? He started, making Luffy frown slightly before Thatch continued, without me of course. Luffy's smile returned. I drew all over Ace and Sabo's faces. He said happily, but Thatch shook his head. That's it. Let an old pro show you how it's done boy. Thatch said, helping the kid up. I was going to draw on your face. Luffy admitted to his brother, who smirked at him. I know. Thatch replied, making Luffy tilt his head in confusion. I wouldn't prank the commanders just yet kid, we all sensed you the moment you left your room. He said, and Luffy's eyes widened. How? Luffy asked in awe and Thatch rolled his eyes. Our observation hockey told us, I can guarantee Marco has one eye open this very moment wondering what is going on. Thatch laughed, knowing how protective the man could be. Then we need a plan to get them all to stay asleep even when we're awake, Luffy said, placing his finger and thumb under his chin trying to think. Oh? Thatch was interested. Let's prank every division commander. Luffy said, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight, and Thatch couldn't help but smile back. Now how do you plan to do that one kid? He sat down on the deck and listened to Luffy talk about his plan, while Thatch nodded his head and added the more important details into it. This just might be the greatest idea I have heard in a long time, Thatch said proudly while ruffling up Luffy's hair affectionately. I know right. Should we ask Ace and Sabo to help? Luffy wasn't sure if his brothers would be interested or not. Nah, it'll be more entertaining if we get them as well. Thatch said with a smile that rivaled Luffy's. If we're going to get them, let's get them good. Luffy agreed, ready to put some of his training to the test in a more fun way than Mihawk's. That morning, after Ace and Sabo considered the pros and cons of killing their little brother, they made their way to the galley to confront the little brat, only to find him missing. Where is he? Ace snarled out, his black-brown eyes shining dangerously. No clue, he didn't come up for breakfast Yoi. Marco said, knowing now why the brat had been up last night. He knows. Sabo hissed, believing that Luffy knew he was going to get it from his brothers for the wonderful drawings on their faces. He won't be able to stay away forever. Ace said matter-of-factly, knowing the black hole the kid called his stomach. Then we will wait. Sabo agreed, sitting down at the table while Marco chuckled softly at his youngest siblings. Meanwhile, Luffy was sitting at a baking table in the kitchen while Thatch wrote down a list of supplies that would be needed to pull this off. We need to make this strong but tasteless. Thatch said, putting the pencil behind his ear, thinking things through. Strong enough to keep them all asleep, Luffy said, his eyes glazed over. But weak enough for them to wake up from and probably have no lasting side effects. Thatch finished with a grin. Is pranking the commanders that hard? Luffy asked, grabbing another piece of bacon from a plate near him. Yes, it took me almost 4 years to successfully prank Marco, and even now it's a wonderful challenge. He said, smiling at the memory of a very angry Marco who had his hair dyed a dark black once upon a time. We have been training our hockey for almost ever really, it's up to us to defend and protect our divisions, so we can't let our guards down. So that's why we need to drug them all into sleeping? Luffy asked curiously. Exactly, but it's not like we're giving them anything too crazy and we will make sure to let Pops know what we're doing before we do it. Thatch reminded the kid. Thatch always told Pops his plans before he did them just in case anything major did happen. Nothing ever usually did, but Thatch felt more comfortable knowing that his father knew the plan. I'll tell Pops. Luffy said and Thatch nodded his head knowing Luffy couldn't lie to save his life, so it would be better that way. This is going to be good. Thatch couldn't help but smile which caused a shiver to go up Marco's spine and his eyes to dart to the kitchen's doors. They're up to something Yoi. Marco whispered to Vista who chuckled under his breath. You're losing your touch old friend if you just noticed this now. He said knowing something was going to happen tonight. Do the other commanders know Yoi? Marco began to eye the others and noticed them carefully watching the door just like him. Of course, we're prepared for almost anything they throw at us. Vista had been pranked by Thatch one too many times not to know when another was coming their way. Which division do you think they're aiming at Yoi? Marco asked. Aizu took a sip of his tea, turning his sharp eyes towards the door as well. All of us? Marco's brows rose higher at that information. But that's crazy for even him Yoi. Thatch usually only aimed for one division not all of them. Don't forget he has Luffy with him this time. Vista said and Marco nodded his head. Do you think Brad 1 and 2 will be joining in Yoi? He pointed his thumb to an annoyed-looking Ace and Sabo, but Aizu shook his head with a smile. If they were they'd be in there with Lu. He said and Marco nodded his head in agreement. So it's us versus them Yoi. Marco said a bit of excitement in his voice as a thought came to his head. Boy brats, how would you like to get your revenge Yoi? Marco asked the two brothers who looked up and over at Marco grinning like cats. And how do you plan to do that? Sabo asked his eyes sparkling brilliantly. Well I was thinking. Line break. Luffy and Thatch had everything prepared and ready to go. They had the sleeping drug made and able to be put into the commander's dinners, now they just needed to decide which divisions they would get since there was too many to prank together. Thatch had written the information down and had shown Luffy the plan who had nodded his head, but Thatch knew from the blank glazed look in the kid's eyes that he didn't really get it all. Don't worry too much kid we got this. He ruffled Luffy's hair knocking his hat off his head to dangle down his back. And we'll have lots of fun too right Thatch? Luffy asked smiling. Of course shall we get to work now little brother? Thatch asked and Luffy nodded. Let's go. At the dinner table Marco, Ace and Sabo had their heads together whispering frantically. Don't eat the food Yoi. Marco whispered to them and they nodded since Marco had explained the reasoning why earlier. They've drugged it, right? Sabo asked for clarification. Yes, they plan to put us out for the night, but I don't plan on sleeping Yoi. Marco said with a grin. Neither do we. Ace agreed watching as Luffy came to sit down beside them. Hey guys what ya doing? He asked and Ace smiled at him. Waiting for dinner, haven't seen you all day what have you been up to? He asked smirking wider. Busy Luffy replied looking away as Thatch sat down at the end of the table watching Luffy. Doing what may I ask? Sabo pointed his fork at Luffy who was beginning to sweat. Who knows? Thatch shouted from his end of the table giving the boys a mischievous look. We're talking to Luffy, Thatch. Ace returned the look to his friend. And now you're talking to me. All could feel the lightning strike between the two men. Well, eat up. Luffy cheered rather loudly to everyone, his voice rising considerably with nerves. Marco smiled at his little brother. You first Yoi. Luffy grinned before taking his fork and digging it into the meat, taking a big bite and chewing slowly watching Marco as he did. Sabo said watching the kid, but Marco was smarter than that, he knew Thatch wouldn't put anything in the kid's food or his own, so it was only in the target's food. Thatch and Luffy were too busy making sure everyone was eating the food that they missed how Ace, Sabo and Marco were discarding theirs. Marco and the boys had set up their traps earlier during the day, while Luffy and Thatch were busy making their sleeping powder. Marco was actually quite proud by the way the boys had worked with him giving him no complaints as he made them get all of the items needed. Of course each commander helped out not wanting to miss a chance to prank the pranker. Marco felt excited to get this started and it would all begin soon. Each commander knew not to eat the food since Marco had warned them about what was going on. They ended up switching the meals with another from their division but would play along with Thatch's plans until Marco needed them. When dinner was finished Marco gave the signal for the plans to begin of course, Thatch also gave his own signal to Luffy and each of them excused themselves from the table. The other commanders couldn't help but smile knowing what was about to happen. Marco had set up buckets above doorways, Aizu had left to his own room to set up his trap and Harita had left to set up hers. Each of the commanders helped in one way or another to trick the tricksters. Thatch was ready to begin as soon as everyone fell asleep, so he thought he had plenty of time on his hands when really he should have known something was different. The moment he had left his room Marco had begun his plan. A large bucket of yellow paint fell from above the doorway, but Thatch sensed it quickly, dodging it, laughing. "You'll have to do better than that if you want to get me, guys." He laughed out only to get paint thrown at him from behind. Turning around quickly to see who had done it, he could only blink as Ace threw another bucket in his face. "Why, you brats!" Thatch yelled, surprised, and now a lovely color of white and yellow. Chasing after the now running boys, he didn't see the bright pink feathers dropped from above him, sticking to his wet paint look. "Now who's the chicken, yoy?" Marco asked from the railing where he was leaning with Ace and Sabo. Luffy had been running around looking for Thatch when his feet began to slip out from under him and he slipped down the deck on some oil into a room waiting for him. The room was dark and scary, but Luffy was in too much shock to move. Just when the shock had begun to wear off, a bunch of hands grabbed him from behind, while another began to strip him of his clothes. Freaking out and squirming as new clothing was pushed onto him and his face held still. A bunch of brushes and wet stuff was attacking his face, while a hand covered his mouth from screaming. Finally finished with him, the hands let him go and pushed him out of the room. Luffy was now sporting a pink princess dress and bright crazy makeup. Ace and Sabo took one look at him and fell to their knees, laughing so hard their stomachs hurt. "You look so cute." Ace got out between laughter as Luffy looked down at himself, his mouth falling open in shock and fear. "I could have done much better had the lights been on." Aizu pouted from the doorway. Thatch came up to Luffy looking rather silly himself and laughed at his brother's misfortune. "How the heck did you know?" he asked out loud to anyone. "You always give this look when you're up to something, yoy," Marco said, not touching his brother in fear of becoming painted and feathery as well. "Yeah, you guys have been secretive all day, did you really expect us not to know what was going on?" Vista said, smiling at them. "But you guys ate the food," Luffy pointed out, and everyone laughed. "We switched them out, did you really expect us to eat when we knew something was going to happen, yoy?" Luffy just pouted, turning around to get out of the pink monstrosity and wash his face. "Good job, boys," Thatch said to Ace and Sabo, who smiled and looked at Marco. It was his entire plan, not ours. Though seeing Luffy in a dress was worth it. Ace smirked, glad that Haruta had gotten pictures of them. "You boys have officially become pranking royalty, congrats," Thatch said, heading towards the showers. Sure, he hadn't got to prank his family in the way he wanted to, but there was always a next time, and next time he'd get them good. Luffy was listening to everything. His brothers talking to one another, his father laughing from across the ship as Ace and Sabo got into another scuffle about goodness knows whatever. Luffy was listening to the ocean and how it crashed against the ship's side and even felt a little sentimental about that. Luffy loved the way the tides kissed his home, no matter how many times it was sent back away. He loved how the ship would welcome them even though they could not stay together. Luffy was listening to the gulls in the sky, how they called to one another. Maybe they were calling for more meat. Meat. He loved how the birds could touch the skies and go anywhere they chose to, but chose not to as well. He wondered what held them back. Why didn't they fly away when they knew they could? If he were a bird, would he fly away? But what if he got lost? Luffy was listening to the ship burn once again as Ace lost control of his flames and burned another part of the deck. He heard the call of panic from Sabo, the anger from Marco, as this was what? The 157th time Ace had burned that particular spot. He could hear Thatch laughing, so maybe he had something to do with that spot always getting burned. Maybe Ace was in on that plan. Luffy loved to listen to his family, not just because they were there, but because it reminded him they were alive. It reminded him that each and every one of his siblings had a story to tell, a life they lived before him, before here. That their hearts carried scars, pain, laughter, tears and joy just as much as his did. He loved that though, he loved to listen to his family talk just to hear their voices and remind them they are not alone. Just as they remind him. Luffy loved to listen, he just didn't like to show it. Luffy was very excited. His grandpa was coming in a day to take him and his brothers on a trip. He had been told many different stories about his grandpa and most of them weren't that good. Ace and Sabo had told him of the many attempts on their lives from the old man. Ops told him of the times his grandpa and he had fought across the seas, and Marco told him of the battles he had with the old man as well. It seemed that with each passing person no one would say something good about the man, and that made Luffy sad and even a little bit angry. Luffy remembers meeting his grandpa for the first time and how he said he loved his drawings. No one liked his drawings. Even Marco would make a face at them, so when his grandpa liked them Luffy felt very happy. "Luffy, you've got it all wrong. That old geezer doesn't care about anyone but himself," Ace exclaimed once again to the boy who just continued to pack his clothes into a bag Aizu had made for him. The bag was very nice with bright yellow lion on it and it was bright red. Luffy loved that the bag was his favorite color. "Yeah, Lou, he hits you no matter what you say." Sabo agreed to the boy who was growing more and more annoyed with each passing second. "Well, he's my grandpa," he shouted at his brothers who looked surprised. "But we've known him longer," Ace shouted back at him. That doesn't mean anything. I will judge him once I've truly met him. Luffy pulled a string around his bag, closing it before standing up and leaving the room annoyed with his brothers. Who's pissed you off this time, little brother? Thatch said, walking up beside Luffy, who was laterally stomping away from the bedroom. Who do you think? He snarled at the man, who flinched back a bit before recovering. There seems to be a long list lately, he said, eyeing the moody teenager. Screw off, Thatch. Luffy said, making his way to the galley. Thatch was now very concerned, so he turned directions towards the cabin where the brothers were still grumbling and packing. I can't believe he's excited. I mean, it's just the East Blue, nothing special. A said to Sabo, who looked up to see Thatch leaning on the doorframe. Well, now I know why he's so mad again, he said, and the boys sighed. How bad this time? Sabo asked, putting his hat on his head, blue eyes sad and distant. He told me to screw off. He repeated Luffy's words, making brows rise on the brothers. That's a new one. Ace whispered as Sabo pulled a list of curse words used in the past 2 weeks by their little brother. Be glad it was me he said it to and not Marco. Thatch warned them seriously. Thatch knew that if Luffy said that to Marco, the Phoenix would hunt down the brothers for a lecture that could possibly last hours. It's not our fault he's getting moody. We weren't even that moody at 13. Ace said, trying to remember being 13. Yes, you were. Thatch pointed out to Ace, who stared blankly at Thatch. Last I recall, you burned down the entire table at dinner time because Luffy called you a name. Thatch remembered that day and how hard he had laughed and how angry Pops and Marco had been at the kid. And you were no better, Sabo. If I remember correctly, you threw a dictionary at my head. He pointed to the blue-coated boy, who stopped laughing as Thatch looked at him. Cut your brother some slack. He said softly to the boys, who were looking rather ashamed in the way they've been treating Luffy lately. We just don't understand why he's so excited, Sabo said, finally looking up. Maybe it's because this is a new adventure for him. Why don't you boys, instead of seeing time with your grandfather, try and see it through Luffy's eyes? He didn't want the boys to leave really, but Garp promised it only to be for a few months, so it's not like they'd be gone forever. We just know the old man, we know how this really going to go. A said, fear in his voice, and Thatch instinctively wanted to protect these boys from what they feared. Give him a chance, he might change for Luffy. He hoped, but Sabo laughed. Be sure it didn't change for me. Sabo said through his laughter. Give him a chance. Thatch repeated before leaving to find his angry little brother. Luffy wandered the ship since lunch wasn't ready, and Thatch had vanished before Luffy got the chance to yell at him for it. He walked around until he ended up at Pop's chair, where the old man was drinking from a large bottle. What is bothering you this time, my son? He said, and Luffy pouted before climbing the chair to sit on the old man's lap. No one's excited about me going to see Grandpa for a while. He said, anger dripping from his voice. We will miss you. He said, and Luffy looked into his father's golden eyes. I know that, and I'll miss everyone too. It's just, no one says anything good about Grandpa. Luffy said softly, anger spent and just frustration left over. Would you like to hear some tales of the man? Pops asked him kindly. Good ones? Luffy questioned hesitantly. That's up to you, my son. He said before beginning his story about his first meeting with Garp the Marine. Luffy wasn't sure how long he sat on his father's lap, but he had both laughed softly, loudly and long at some of the stories about his grandfather. Did he really do that? Luffy said between laughter. As far as I know, he did. He gave the entire treasury on his ship away for the most amazing donuts available. The old man smiled as Luffy slapped his knee, laughing once again. I could understand if it was meat, but for donuts, what an idiot. Pops chuckled, glad to see his son so happy again. Luffy, what are you doing, Yoi? Marco asked, hearing Luffy's laughter from across the ship. Pops was telling me some stories about Grandpa. He smiled brightly and Marco smiled back. I was telling him good stories about his grandfather. Pops clarified to Marco, who was about to ask what kind of stories they were. Not everything that man has done is bad. Pop said, patting Luffy's hair, making the kid smile more. The world needs the Marines, no matter how much of a pain in the ass they are for us, Gurara. He laughed and Marco chuckled as well. That is true, Yoi. This time Luffy looked at Marco curiously. But you swear a lot at the Marines. He had heard Marco call them a lot of bad words in the past. Mostly because they don't like me and I don't like them, Yoi. Marco said, crossing his arms. But then why do we need them? Luffy had heard that the Marines were all about following orders. He didn't want to follow orders, he wanted to be a captain. Because, my son, not every pirate you meet will want to be your friend. Pops clarified this, and Luffy tilted his head. Many pirates like to cause more trouble than good, and I'm not saying we're innocent because we're not, Yoi. Marco said to the boy, who nodded, but his eyes were glazed over. Luffy, pirates in this world cause many problems for others. They will also cause you many problems as well in the future, Yoi. Marco said, sitting down and crossing his legs. Why's that? He questioned, and Pops sighed. Because of your affiliation with us, many pirates will want to fight you to prove their strength. Pop said to the boy who just made a face. Then I'll beat them all up. He said, simply making them laugh. Of course you will, Yoi. Marco chuckled before turning his attention back to the kid. Luffy, people like your grandpa are needed in this world to make sure that pirates don't destroy all that is beautiful on these seas, Yoi. I don't understand. He was really confused. You will someday, kid Yoi. Marco said, standing back up. Why don't we go check on lunch, brat Yoi? He said, and Luffy jumped down after thanking his father for the stories. When they got the galley, Thatch was bringing platters out to the tables with Ace's help, of course. Look who's smiling again. Thatch cheered, happy to see the moody brat back to somewhat normal. Yup. He said, simply sitting down in his spot. He really did carve his name into the seat to mark it after a scuffle over it with Ace. And who should I be thanking for this? Thatch said, sarcastically looking over to Marco, who shook his head. You'll have to thank Pops for that, Yoi. He shrugged his shoulders, and Thatch laughed. I guess I shall then now, won't I? He said, placing some food onto another table. Thatch saved Luffy's table for last because he knew Luffy wouldn't wait for others to have food if he got his first. Man, Pops told me stories about Grandpa. He said, cheerfully picking up his fork and knife, banging them on the table while smiling. What kind of stories? Ace said, helping to place more food around the galley. Good ones and funny ones. He said, and Ace nodded, curious on what stories were told to the boy. Do you have some good stories to tell me, Ace? Luffy asked, giving his brother the big brown-eyed look. Maybe, I dunno, I'll think about it, okay Lou? He said, and Luffy cheered. Marco was happy that Luffy was starting to feel happy again. Right after he had found out that Garp was coming for the brats, he had almost lost his mind. He pouted for about 2 days and even felt like crying at the idea that Luffy could be going away from his side in safety. He knew that Luffy was getting old enough to do things on his own, but that didn't stop him from being protective. He also knew that Luffy was becoming very independent. The kid loved being with his family still, but would search for things to call his own. Luffy wanted his own room. He stopped sharing a lot of his things with Ace and Sabo, and he didn't want to cuddle anymore with Marco. As much as the man wouldn't admit it, he missed the cuddles that Luffy used to give. Now Marco, can we start eating yet? Luffy said, bringing the man back into reality. Food was placed right in front of Luffy, but he was concerned because his ma had gone silent. Sure kid, let's eat Yoi. He said, and Luffy began to dig in. More families started to enter the hall, knowing that there were 2 with the initial of D at the tables, so they needed to grab quick. Many observers had noticed that Sabo ate as much as the boys did, so it made them question if he was a secret D or not. So do you boys have everything packed yet? Harita asked, sitting down in front of Marco, causing a black cloud to fall over the man. Almost. Luffy said, food in his mouth. Don't talk while you're eating. Aizu scolded from across the table. Almost, I just need to pack a few more things. He finished, and Harita nodded her head. How about you boys? She turned to Ace and Sabo, who shrugged. They'll probably stuff us into marine uniforms and burn our clothes for all we know, so we're stuck on what to pack, Ace said, and Marco's eyes narrowed. Luffy will not be wearing a marine uniform, Yoi. He whispered dangerously. But think of how cute he'll look in one. Harita giggled and Marco frowned at her. I don't care, our brother is a pirate, Yoi. He said, and Luffy cheered from his seat, agreeing with Marco. I'm going to be the king of the pirates, ma, not just a pirate. Luffy said, but was smiling as he took another bite of his meat. Only if you grow big enough, brat. Thatch said, pointing out the untouched veggies that Luffy had turned his nose up at. Ugh. He whined, looking down at them, his brow twitching and beads of sweat covering his forehead. If you don't eat them, you'll never grow big and strong. Harita said, and Luffy whined more. Come on Luffy, eat your veggies like a man. Ace said, scooping up a forkful and eating them in one bite before giving Luffy a look, challenge clear in Ace's black eyes. Bring it. Luffy replied, scooping more onto his own fork and stuffing them down before grabbing his water to drink quickly. You veggies. Everyone laughed, but it was a small reminder of what they will miss come tomorrow when the boys will be officially gone. It's going to be quiet, Harita said to Marco, who nodded sadly. I'm going to miss them all, Yoi. He replied, and he meant it. He was going to miss them with every bit of his soul. Nama, cheer up. Luffy said after finishing his veggies, making Marco look up at the kid but didn't smile back. Just because I'm not here doesn't mean we stop being brothers. We'll still be sailing under the same sun and stars, so don't be sad, K. He said, giving the man a grin, and Marco returned it slightly. Right. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. Why don't we go get you boys full finished packing, Yoi? He said, turning his back to the boys, taking another deep breath, and smiled. After all, tomorrow's going to be a crazy day, Yoi. He finished and they got up to follow him. They would all miss the brats, but it was as Luffy said, no matter how far or wide they were, brothers will always be brothers, and brothers were family. Thatch said to see it through Luffy's eyes, but all I see is death descending upon us. Ace mumbled through his depression. There go all our dreams out the window, will we ever return to this place alive? Sabo whispered, his eyes all glazed over as he looked off into the distance. I'm so excited, how about you guys, Luffy started to say as he looked at his brothers. And it won't be that bad. He said, and Ace looked up at him, his black eyes shadowed by his orange hat. I have to wear shirts, he said slowly to Luffy as if that clarified everything. And so do I, what's the big deal? Luffy said, throwing his bag over his shoulder and leaving the cabin to watch the ship sail ever closer. Everyone wears shirts, Ace, you're just different. Sabo laughed quietly to his brother, who dropped his head mumbling about not having to wearing those things in years. Sabo sighed, knowing that Ace's ramblings about shirts were just an excuse to let out his uneasiness. Ace, as far as Sabo knew, had been dropped off with the bandits at an early age and neglected by the old man constantly. Sabo still remembered the dark look that Ace wore like a mask over his heart. He still saw that mask whenever Ace felt unsure of himself or uneasy around people. Sabo also knew that Luffy had never seen that mask, or at least the full amount of it. He only hoped that with the three of them being so close to their grandfather, that Ace didn't feel pressured to put it back up. Boy Sabo, the old man's going to be here soon, so wake up already. Ace said, standing up, pulling Sabo from his musings. Sure, sorry. He replied, getting up, pulling his own bag closed. What's got you so distant anyways? Ace hadn't seen Sabo so quiet in a long time, but lately his brother had been growing more and more silent. Just thinking too much. He said, and Ace nodded. I think we both are, we should try and make this as fun as possible for Luffy's sake at least. Ace pushed his hat back further on his head and looked at the door, knowing that their time here was going to be gone for a while. Just when we finally find a place to call home, that old geezer comes back to remind us we don't belong anywhere. Ace said, barely a whisper. We do belong here. Sabo argued, annoyed at Ace for saying that. Then why are they giving us to that old man? Ak questioned, and Sabo shook his head. Because Luffy needs this and I think the crew needs this. Sabo said, giving Ace a stern look. We can't be selfish, Ace. Though he couldn't stop the wanting to be just that selfish. The old man will be here soon, let's go see everyone. Ace grumbled out, making Sabo laugh quietly. Sure. He said, leaving the cabin behind, but found himself stopping one last time to look in it. He was really going to miss it here. How are you boys doing? Thatch asked, but Sabo could see that he himself wasn't doing that well. As fine as we can be, I guess. He replied and got a nod in return. Thatch's face was pale and his eyes almost red-rimmed, he must have been crying. We won't be gone long. Ace said to the man softly. Thatch was his best friend next to Sabo and Luffy. I know, I'm just going to miss you guys. He whispered out before turning away. Luffy's saying goodbye to Marco, let's let them be for now. Thatch said, walking away, probably to get more control over his emotions. If Thatch looks that crappy, I can only assume Marco's a mess. Sabo whispered to Ace quietly, who nodded back, frowning. We should have had a party last night, is it too late for one now? Ace asked and smiled a little. That's all we need, the old man showing up and we're all drunk. Sabo laughed at the mental image. Like Marco would let us drink. Ace rolled his eyes. I know, right? Remember when Luffy told him he had some wine with Mihawk? Sabo recalled. Yeah, the man turned a lovely shade of red and swore to have the man's head. Sabo laughed at the memory and the blank look on Luffy's face as Marco grew angrier. I can't believe Luffy's had alcohol and we haven't, Ace finally said, really thinking about it. We'll have to change that. Sabo agreed. They walked out onto the deck to find Luffy talking freely with Marco, who was hanging on to his every word, knowing he wouldn't hear the kid talk for a while. My sons. Pops greeted the boys, who smiled up at their father before waving to him. Hey Pops, how much longer? Sabo asked. Marco looked away from Luffy at that point and waved to the boys. Finally out of your depressions, Yoi? He asked, meaning Luffy must have told him about the cabin. For now, I guess, how about you? Ace asked, smirking at the man who sighed. Same, Yoi. He said simply. Ma, you promised to finish the story. Luffy whined to the man, who turned his full attention back to Luffy in an instant. Some things never change. Sabo laughed, as well as Pops and Ace. I will be giving you both a transponder snail. Pop said to them as they listened to him seriously. Should we let Gramps know we have them? Ace asked to Pops, who only shook his head. No, keep these a secret between you boys. Should anything happen, this way we can keep in contact with you boys at all times. He said, and Sabo smiled. Is this also a way for Marco to talk with Luffy? He felt his smile growing wider. Yes, it just might be. He laughed, confirming where the idea had come from in the first place. It seems a mother phoenix isn't quite ready to let his baby go. Ace smirked, looking over at the two talking. I don't think he'll ever be ready to let him go. Sabo finished for Ace, laughing and shaking his head. How Sabo loved his family and all of their quirks. That seems worse for wear as well. Pops nodded knowing that his children were having a hard time letting their youngest go. Pops. It's Garp. One of his children called to him and he sighed knowing this was going to be coming soon. Go greet your grandfather brats. Pop said, and Ace and Sabo nodded turning to Luffy who was all smiles in contrary to their gloom. Thanks for the snails Pops, we'll keep them safe. Sabo said turning back to his father giving a tip of his top hat. You gave them the snails already Yoi? Marco asked his father who nodded. Something tells me they will come in handy. Pop said, an unusual sense of uneasiness falling over him. Permission to board, pirates. Garp called from his ship. Permission. Pops called back and Garp jumped over. Grandpa. Luffy called out running to his grandfather jumping into his arms for a hug. A sting of annoyance went through Marco's chest at the contact. Luffy. Look at you, you're all grown up. He said ruffling the kid's messy black hair. Man. He said letting his grandpa go. Ace, Sabo, it's good to see you both. The boys stood in front of their grandpa but didn't rush to him like Luffy did. Yeah, same to you, Ace said looking away pulling at the open shirt he was forcing himself to wear. What happened to your face kid? Garp asked looking at Sabo who touched the burn on his eye. We were kidnapped. Luffy shouted and Garp's eyes narrowed. By whom? He asked and Marco's brow twitched on his face. That happened many years ago Garp Yoi. He spoke up for the first time. I'll tell you all about it, Gramps. Luffy said smiling again. You appear well Marco the Phoenix. Garp said coldly to the man who had walked up placing his hand on Luffy's shoulder, his blue eyes flaring up as cold as his flames would be. I would be doing better if you weren't taking my little brother away from me Yoi. He said to Garp. Everyone present could feel the coldness in the air. I don't remember him being your brother. Garp replied. They're all our brothers. Thatch said leaning on a wall his dark brown eyes glaring at the marines on the battleship. We're not here to fight, Garp. Pop said from his throne and giving Marco a look. You boys will be spending time with me. Garp said turning to Luffy, Ace and Sabo. I promise to turn you boys into fine marines. Garp was ready for Ace and Sabo to fight back but found himself surprised when it was Luffy who closed his eyes and began to shout at him. Marine, no. I'm going to be the Pirate King. He shouted and all jaws dropped on the marine ship while the pirates smirked and some even laughed at the looks given. You've tainted his mind, Whitebeard. Garp shouted at the old man who laughed loudly. You'll have to thank red-haired Shanks for that dream, Garp. And Garp's jaw dropped. That damned punk. Let's go boys. Garp called turning around away from the pirate crew walking towards his own ship. Luffy was once excited to go, but now that it was here he couldn't stop the pain from filling his heart. Go on kid, we'll be here when you get back. Thatch said. Ace's eyes darkened and Sabo looked away taking a deep breath. Luffy looked towards Marco who was frowning his eyes sad and lonely. Luffy finally choked out before dropping his bag and running to Marco for a hug. I'm going to miss you he cried softly through a choked voice. Marco's open arms were waiting for the kid and he pulled him tighter. We'll be here but I'm going to miss you more kid Yoi. Marco really was going to miss the kid but it was time to let go. When you get back I want to hear all about your adventures Yoi. Luffy nodded before wiping a few tears away. Promise. He said nodding his head. Your brothers have a surprise for you for tonight so don't cry Lu Yoi. He said putting the straw hat on Luffy's head reassuringly. Go on my sons. Go and come home safely. Pops called to the boys who waved one last time before jumping onto the marine's ship. Garp had his back turned away from the pirates. You remember your promise right, Garp? Pops asked once last time golden eyes burning onto the marine hero's back. 2 months then they will be back. Garp replied walking away from the edge of the ship as the boys waved goodbye to them. Luffy and his brothers stayed there for what felt like forever until the Moby Dick was out of sight. Boys Garp said getting the kids' attention. I'll give you tonight off but starting tomorrow the real training begins. Garp said cracking his knuckles as a shadow fell upon Ace and Sabo's faces while Luffy tilted his head in confusion. Training? He asked and his brothers just stared there. This was going to be the longest 2 months of their lives they could just feel it. When Garp said training began in the morning he wasn't kidding. He chose to wake his grandsons up with a fist of love which only caused the boys to panic. Luffy having had Mihawk attack him in the night could sense evil intentions a ship away so his brown eyes darted open and his body moved into action. You're pretty fast. Garp smiled as the hammock Luffy had been sleeping on was now broken on the floor. Uncle Hawkeye attacked me often at night. Luffy grinned to his grandfather, his brown eyes sparkling in the morning light. Shitty geezer. You coulda killed us. Ace snarled at his grandfather. But I didn't. Garp replied sticking his index finger in his ear clearing out the wax. But you could have. Ace screamed back at the man as Luffy laughed at the exchange. You kid, you used observation Hawkeye. Garp said looking at Luffy who smirked, his hat covering one of his eyes. Of course. He said in a flat tone of voice before pointing to his brothers. We all earned observation hockey a while ago. Luffy complimented his brothers who smiled back at him. Then it looks like I'll have to test you on that now, won't I? Garp said, a shadow beginning to cover his eyes while he raided his fists into the air. The trio didn't wait for the fists to fly before they got the heck out of that cabin. When they exited the room they froze instantly even though danger was clear behind them. What? Ace began. The Sabo said afterwards. And as Luffy finished quietly, his eyes wide at the Sea King staring at them from all around. Looks like we have some company. Garp said from behind them, sending shivers up their spines. Why are there so many Sea Kings? Luffy exclaimed. Living in the Grand Line he had eaten many Sea King dishes but never had he seen this many in one shot. We're in the calm belt. Garp said, and Sabo turned quickly on his feet to face the older man. Why are we here? This is called the Sea King's Nest and there's no breeze for the ships to sail through. Sabo had been studying hard on everything. We have the propellers so we can get through without the wind. As for the Sea Kings, I figured that group of pirate scum would have trained you a little. Gaining some experience fighting Sea Kings will sharpen your senses. Garp said, bopping Sabo on the head with one of his fists. So all we need to do is kick their asses? Luffy asked his grandfather, who nodded his head, and Luffy smiled before getting into his horse stance, placing his hands on his legs. Nah, why don't we make this a competition? Luffy said to his brothers who were smiling at the idea. Sea King meat is the best around, Ace agreed, thinking with his stomach. And we could test out our skills, Sabo thought, pulling his pipe off of his back, accepting the challenge. We'll be in the East Blue by morning, so try not to get yourselves killed before then. Garp said, letting the kids jump from the ship's deck into battle against the Sea Kings. Luffy had used his haki to dodge the Sea King's teeth and his armament haki to break them when they did catch him in their mouths. Sabo used his pipe to smash skulls and his kicks to push them back when they got too close. Ace used his flames to roast any and all that got too close to him. Ace. Sabo screeched at his brother as he patted the hems of his blue coat from the flames that were beginning to burn it. Sorry. Don't get too close right now, Baka. Ace scolded his brother, earning a glare in his direction and a laugh from Luffy. Hurry up. I've already taken down 5. He cheered, sitting on a knocked out Sea King's head. Why are you telling us to hurry up? We've already taken down 10. Ace said cockily, causing Luffy's brow to twitch in annoyance. Then I'll take down 15. He said, jumping from his co-ed Sea King and onto another one that was just asking him to fight it. Then I'll take out 20. Ace snapped back, jumping onto another one, his fire fist blazing as Sabo rubbed his temples. These are my brothers, I am not allowed to drown them, he mumbled to himself before smiling and jumping to another one. Garp was laughing from the sidelines, his grandsons were stronger than he gave them credit for. Turning his eyes away from the laughter and the battle, he walked into their room looking at their bags of clothing. We'll have to get them a new wardrobe, there's no way I'm letting my grandchildren walk around in pirate attire. He scoffed, gathering everything up in one go and locking it in a closet before replacing it with the typical marine outfit. There, much better. He smiled, returning to the deck to find the boys laughing and fighting one another. Grandpa, are we done yet? Luffy asked, and Garp chuckled. How many each? He asked, and Ace and Luffy smiled. 20. Luffy said proudly, and Ace looked at him before his grin grew wider. 25. Ace said, earning a quick glare from Luffy. 32. Sabo said, causing both boys to turn to look at their brother. Well, you idiots are fighting over numbers, I've been doing the work. Sabo shrugged but didn't suppress the smile on his face as both boys dropped their heads in shame. Next time I'll beat you both. Luffy muttered, and Ace shook his head. Keep dreaming, little brother. Ahahaha, you boys did well. Garp said, making Luffy cheer and the 2 others to watch him suspiciously. Go rest up until lunch. He said, dismissing them as another marine came out to talk with Garp. He let us off that easy, Sabo said to Ace, who nodded. Something's up. There was no way the old man was going to just let them rest. It wasn't until they went to change cloths that Sabo froze stiff. What is it? What's wrong? Ace asked his brother, who was pale as he turned around. Our cloths are gone. He said softly, and Ace jumped to his own closet to see if it was true. What the heck are these pieces of crap? Ace snarled, holding up a marine's white and blue shirt. All of my clothes, does he know how much I spent on those? He had his coats tailor-made on Hand Island. I'm not wearing this. I'll go naked before they put me in a marine outfit. Ace said, dropping the shirt on the floor. I agree, we're pirates. Luffy said, crossing his arms and legs on the new hammock that was replaced for them. What are we going to do about this? Ace asked his brothers, whose eyes almost glowed in their anger. This means war. Luffy and Sabo said at the exact same time. Agreed, let's show this old man what white-beard pirates in training really act like. His black eyes matched his Cheshire cat smile. For the rest of the day, Ace, Sabo and Luffy fought against the old man one-on-one. Garp had shown Luffy a few new ways to use his armament haki, such as to break down walls and scare the living crap out of them. Using this form of haki is good to fight against lojas, but to use it also as a shield against all else works well. He said, coating his fist with a black substance. Luffy had decided to listen this once, forgetting his earlier anger momentarily. "Coat your hands, Luffy," Garp said, and Luffy did just that, watching his grandfather gently hit the side of the ship, causing it to smash under the pressure. Luffy got the hint and hit the wall, causing a large dent to be created in its wake. "That's pretty good," Garp complimented, looking at the impressive mark left by the kid's hand. "I can really do that?" Luffy asked, looking down at his hands. "That and so much more, it's in our blood," Garp said, and Luffy looked up at his grandfather, many questions going through his mind but not knowing where to start. That evening the boys gathered in their cabin to discuss their day. "He owned me," Sabo said, rubbing his sore back. "I think I lost some brain cells." "No comments from the lot of you," Ace said, looking at his brothers. "Gramps taught me to punch a wall with haki," Luffy said, smiling before he too grabbed his sore head. "He also taught me how much haki hurt my head." Garp had hit him with the fist of love over 20 times in one afternoon. "Well, we'll try again tomorrow," Ace said, standing up to head for dinner, Sabo following behind him. "Humming, Lou?" Sabo asked, and Luffy shook his head. "You go on, I want to talk to Grandpa quickly," Luffy said, getting worried glances from his brothers, but the boy's bright smile convinced them he'd be okay. Leaving the cabin, Luffy couldn't help but take in to notice how small this ship was compared to his home. "You miss them?" Garp said, leaning against the railing beside Luffy, both of them watching the horizon. I've never been this far away from them," he said to his grandpa, who nodded his head. "What was it like?" Garp was curious about his grandson's life. "Fun, crazy, scary, I've had good times and bad times," Luffy said to the man, who laughed. "Sounds like life in general, kid." Luffy smiled at his grandpa. "That's why I know I'll be okay," Luffy said, closing his eyes. "I wish I had known you more," Garp confessed, and Luffy looked at him from the corner of his eyes. "You know me now, isn't that good enough?" he asked, and Garp couldn't help but smile. "I wish I had known you more," he repeated, and Luffy sighed. "The Gramps, what's my father like?" Luffy had always feared that question. He didn't want to ask Pops because he considered him his father. He didn't ask Marco because Marco might get mad, and Thatch sure got mad that one time. "Your father is a complicated man," Garp started, and Luffy looked at him seriously. "He's causing trouble all across the world." Luffy nodded his head, figuring as much from the way people didn't talk about him. "So he's like a pirate?" Luffy figured, but Garp shook his head no. "Worse, he a revolutionary?" Luffy had never heard of the revolutionaries. "What do they do?" But Garp had started to walk away. "You look like your father, but definitely don't have his personality, or maybe it just hasn't had the chance to show in you yet. Either way, Luffy, I'll keep you safe, I promise." Garp waved as he headed to the galley to start dinner. Luffy looked towards the man leaving. "Thanks, Grandpa," he said, happy to have even a little better of an image of this man who was supposed to be his father. When morning arrived, Luffy got his first glance at the east blue. "So this was your home?" he asked Ace and Sabo, who smiled and nodded their heads. Man, we're from the Goa Kingdom on Dawn Island," Sabo said, but his voice felt a little strained at the mention of his home. "We'll be making a stop at Dawn Island first. We need to restock the ship if we're to continue traveling around," Garp said, causing the two boys to turn to face him in case he decided to attack. "How long till we get there?" Luffy asked, happy to get to an island finally. "Shortly, I let you boys sleep in this morning," Garp said, causing the boys to watch him closely. "And why did you let us do that?" Sabo asked curiously. "Because I'm a good guy, you know," he said, but smiled softly in Luffy's direction. "Right, and the ocean's purple," Ace said under his breath. "Gramps, why do we only have that icky clothing?" Luffy asked, still wearing his clothes from the day before. "Because I'm going to make you three boys into fine marines," Garp cheered before walking away, leaving three angry miniature pirates. "Never," all three shouted at the laughing man. 2 hours later they were pulling up port at a small windmill village. A crowd began to pile around the docks to greet the marine hero. "Welcome back, Garp," the mayor called to the man as he jumped from the ship. "Good to be home, Mayor." Garp greeted a petite woman with green hair held back by a bandana that had came to greet the man as well. "I'm glad to see you're well, Garp," she said, smiling softly at him, and he returned it to her. "Lucino, I have some children here to meet you," Garp said, causing her to tilt her head in confusion. "Children?" she questioned, only to hear a loud shout. "I'm not a child, you old geezer. I'm 16 years old already," Ace shouted, jumping from the ship as well, throwing his shirt off his back as he did it. "I'm free," he laughed, happy to be rid of the yellow button shirt he had been trying to keep wearing. "Ace, you can't just strip wherever you feel like it," Sabo said, grabbing the piece of clothing that had been discarded, knowing that Ace would be wearing it again soon. Why not? I'm a pirate, I can do as I please. Ace said, putting his hands behind his head and walking backwards before bumping into Makino. Ace turned around quickly to see who he had bumped into. His eyes widened at the sight of the young woman who was staring back at him kindly. "Hi there," she said happily, and Ace helped her back up, grabbing her hand, pulling her forward. Makino stumbled momentarily due to Ace pulling her a little hard but caught her balance quickly. "What do you mean you're a pirate brat?" An old man wearing glasses and a hat came forward, glaring at the topless teenager. "Ace, no fair. You didn't wait for me," Luffy said, jumping off after his brothers, running up to the woman Ace was near. "Who are you?" Luffy asked bluntly, staring blankly at her. "My name is Makino, what's yours?" she asked him, bending down to his level. "I'm Luffy. And the idiot here is Ace," Luffy said, smiling, waking Ace from his daze. "Boy, Luffy," he said, a faint blush of red tinted on his freckled face. "He's not wrong, Ace. My name's Sabo," Sabo said, bending low and kissing Makino's hand before turning his head towards Ace and smirking. Ace's brow twitched in annoyance at his brothers. "Oh my, what charming brothers you are," she said, guessing they were related as Garp laughed. "Aren't they? I'm here to stock up, then we're heading out again. Would you mind watching over them for me, Makino?" Garp asked, and Makino shook her head, smiling. "I own a tavern close by, why don't you boys follow me and I'll get you something to eat," she said as the boys cheered before following her. Sabo fell into step with Ace and nudged his brother in the ribs. "She's kinda cute, isn't she?" Sabo asked, a smile on his face and his blue eyes dancing. "Shut up," Ace said, but the blush was back. This was only their first stop, but it already promised to be one of entertainment for the trio. Ace was stuck, it was as simple as that. A huge, and I mean huge, part of him wanted to run to the forest that was so calling his name, but another part of him wanted to stay here. Ace saw the trees edging the village, they were the trees he had grown in, had fought in, and had hated himself in. He wanted to show Luffy his life, even if it wasn't as bright and cheerful as what Luffy probably thought it was. As much as the nagging feeling was there, another had started to form, one that might have been much stronger, he just didn't know what it was or how to make it stop. "Nay, Ace, you're making a funny face again," Luffy said, observing his older brother worriedly. "It's nothing," Ace muttered to himself, turning his face away from Luffy as Makino brought plates of food from behind the bar. "Here you boys go," she said kindly, placing a large plate each in front of them. "Wow," Luffy said, looking at all the food, happy to eat something he didn't have to kill. Their grandfather had made them fish for their own meals and cook it themselves, he called it training or something like that. "We don't have any money, Miss Makino," Sabo said, sadly, looking at the food only to get a laugh from the lady. "Of course you don't. Don't worry about it, I'll make sure Garp pays up before leaving, so eat as much as you like," she said kindly to them, making Luffy cheer happily and Ace grin, but Sabo shook his head. "You have no idea what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into saying that." He laughed only to get a small chuckle from her. "Who knows," she said, leaning on the counter, looking at the straw hat that was sitting proudly on Luffy's head. "But the look she's giving Luffy, I'd say he might beat you on winning her heart," Sabo whispered to Ace, who blushed furiously at his words. "Like Luffy has any chance," he scoffed, causing Sabo to laugh louder. "So you finally admit your feelings." He smirked as the blush spread from Ace's face to his ears. "Shut up," he said, grabbing a fork full of food and stuffing his face. "What are you guys laughing about?" Makino asked them, giving them a small smile. Ace turned his face away embarrassed and Sabo gave a smile at her. "Just an inside joke between brothers," Sabo said, finally causing Luffy to groan in annoyance. "Then why wasn't I involved?" Luffy hated being left out because he was 3 years younger than his brothers. "I'll explain the joke to you later, Lou," Sabo said to his brother, causing Ace to panic, giving Sabo an incredulous look. "Like hell you will," he shouted. "Now Ace, don't be mean to your brothers," Makino scolded, causing Ace to shut his mouth, cross his arms and pout a little, turning his head to the side. Sabo was having the time of his life, who knew teasing Ace could be such fun. He couldn't wait to tell Thatch about this little development. Whatever, Ace said, annoyed with his brother, but decided to mention his plan. "I was thinking, guys, that tomorrow we could go see the bandits," Ace said to Sabo and Luffy. Luffy gave a confused look, but Sabo smiled softly at Ace. "It's been a while, hasn't it? I wonder how they are." Sabo and Dayton hadn't gotten along that well, but he couldn't say they didn't get along either. "Oh? Are you boys from this island?" Makino asked, curious about the brothers in front of her. "Sabo and I are from the Go area of this island," Ace said to her before looking away quickly. "I'm not from here at all. I'm from the Grand Line," Luffy said to her with a small smile, missing his home and his ma. "You've lived on the Grand Line your whole life?" she asked, hearing stories about how crazy that ocean was. "Yup, this is the first time I've ever left home." Makino was looking at the straw hat once again, a small smile forming on her face and a light pink to her cheeks. It's getting late, why don't we head back to the ship and call home? Sabo asked Luffy, noticing the sad look that he was trying to hide. Sure. Luffy chirped, excited now to call home. You guys stop by tomorrow morning before you leave and I'll make you a lunch to bring with you, she said, watching them stand up before placing her hand to her chin in thought. How long have you been wearing those clothes? She asked, looking at them carefully now. Long enough. Sabo said, ready to give in and change into the marine outfit if it meant he didn't have to keep wearing stinking clothing. Wait right here. She said, turning around and racing to her room in the large tavern to grab some new clothes for the teenagers. These might be a bit large on you all, but here. She said, throwing some pajamas at the boys who were startled. Tomorrow I will have proper clothing for you boys, but for now you can't just sleep in nothing. She sounded almost appalled that the brothers before her had nothing to wear. You really don't have to. Ace started but shut his mouth with her stern glare. Yes I do. Now go, I'll see you boys tomorrow morning. She said, ending the conversation right there and then. All three boys bent low, bowing their thanks to her for the clothing, before leaving with a large smile. You've sure fallen for one hell of a woman, Ace. Sabo snickered and Luffy blinked at those words. Fallen? He asked, and Sabo turned to his little brother while still walking. Ace has a crush on Makino. He said seriously, and Luffy's eyes widened before brightening. So Ace loves Makino? He asked, and Sabo found himself mildly surprised that Luffy picked up on that so quickly. Exactly. Sabo agreed, but Ace wasn't having any of that. I do not love her. I just think she's pretty, that's all. Though Ace's face told the real story. Oh. So you love her, Luffy said seriously, causing Sabo to laugh loudly. What does that even mean? Ace screamed at Luffy, who laughed. When they got back to their cabin on the marine ship, they pulled the transponder snail from a drawer, putting it on the bed where it had its eyes closed, waiting for them to call. Alright, you guys ready? Ace asked, a smile on his face. Amen. Luffy said as Ace lifted the speaker off the phone, making the snail's eyes open and begin its calling sound. On the Moby Dick. Marco hadn't heard from the trio in a long time, or even at all since they left. He worried that Garp had found the snails and destroyed them. Marco, lighten up. They're in the East Blue, for goodness sakes. They'll be fine, if not bored out of their skulls. Thatch said, rolling his eyes as Marco began his staring contest with the phone, waiting for it to wake up. I know I just missed them, Yoi. Thatch would be the only person Marco said that out loud to other than Pops. We all do, but they'll probably only call if there is an emergency. Thatch said to his friend as the snail's eyes opened up and the call happened. Or they'll call now. He laughed and Marco's heart jumped a beat in excitement. Hello, Yoi? Marco asked, picking up the receiver. Ma. Luffy cheered instantly and Marco felt himself calming down for the first time in days. Yo Marco. Ace said, and Luffy laughed over the phone. Is anyone with you? Sabo asked, only for Thatch to steal the phone for Marco. What's up, brats? Thatch asked, but even Marco could hear the emotion in his friend's voice. Thatch, guess what? Luffy instantly called out, but a lot of banging came along with that question. What? He asked, humoring the kid, only to hear Ace scream Luffy's name and Sabo to laugh. Brats. Thatch was getting worried and Marco was getting pale, not knowing what was happening. Ace, Luffy began as Thatch was waiting patiently, wanting to know just what Ace had. Luffy, shut up. Ace shouted, probably pulling the kid away from the phone. Just what does Ace have, Yoi? Marco asked now, since the line was a bit crazy sounding. Hearing a laugh they assumed belonged to Sabo, they waited again as he began to answer them. Ace has a crush. Sabo answered, causing Thatch to grin ever so widely and his eyes to dance with mischievousness. Oh? Thatch purred out and Luffy laughed. Man, he loves Makino. Ace scowled and it showed on the phone's face. This Makino person must be special. Pop said, since Marco and Thatch had moved to be near everyone so they could talk to the brats. Stupid Luffy. Ace scowled in embarrassment, causing his father to laugh. You boys are really growing up. Vista said, a smile under his own mustache. She's super nice and makes good food. She gave us pajamas since Grandpa took our clothes. Luffy said to them, causing Aizu to raise a finely groomed brow. He stole your clothing? He asked, but there was danger in his voice. Man wants us to wear the marine uniform. Sabo answered, making a face. Never. Aizu said to the boys, who nodded their heads. We will go naked before we wear them. Luffy said, copying Ace's earlier words. I'd rather you didn't, Yoi. Marco said, imagining the faces of people as three naked teenagers walked down the streets. He had a feeling that 2 out of the 3 boys didn't care if anyone saw them with or without clothing on. So you want us to wear those clothes? Luffy asked carefully. No, I just don't want you wearing nothing, Yoi. He said, and Luffy laughed after that. Okay, but Makino is giving us some clothing tomorrow morning. Luffy replied, and Marco raised a brow. She sounds like a nice lady, Yoi. He said, and Luffy smiled through the phone. She's super nice. She feeds us and even gave us clothing. And she even scolded Ace. Luffy said, remembering her telling Ace to be nice. So she's like a mother then? Harita asked, looking at Marco, who was frowning. I guess I don't know what that would be like, Luffy said, thinking about it. Definitely not. Ace shouted, but Sabo frowned. You say that only because you love her. Sabo said, and Ace's face reddened once again. I do not love her. He shouted, causing the family to laugh. Looks like the mother hen has some competition, Thatch said to Pops, who smiled at his son. We let you go, we need to get up early tomorrow morning since we're going on an adventure. Where to? Thatch asked, wanting to know where his brothers were heading just in case of anything. We're heading to where Ace and Sabo used to live. Luffy said. Be safe, my sons. Pops said, and Ace laughed. No guarantees, Pops. He said, causing Marco to make a face. And what does that mean, Yoi? He asked, but Luffy wished them a good night and hung up the phone. Rats. Thatch said fondly to the receiver before Marco turned to him and flicked his forehead. What the hell, Marco? Thatch asked, annoyed, grabbing his head. That's for saying I have competition, Yoi. He smirked before walking away, leaving a laughing Thatch and a grinning Pops behind him. Back with the boys. Luffy was smiling as he fell asleep. He had his brothers beside him, he got to talk to his precious family, and the pajamas he was wearing were warm and smelled like shanks, which smelled like a mixture of rum, the ocean and freedom. I was thinking, Sabo Ace started pulling a blanket over Luffy to keep him warm. I want to get a tattoo. He said, and Sabo nodded his head in understanding. Yeah, me too, it's kind of rebellious, don't ya think? Sabo said with a smile. What are you thinking of? Ace asked with a small smile. I want our initials ASL with a cross through mine. Do you think it's stupid? He asked Ace, who smiled wider. Nah, I think that's kinda cool. I'm getting my name down my arm. He said, and Sabo laughed. Why your name, dummy? Sabo asked, laughing quietly. So people remember that it was me who did whatever I will do to them. He said, and Sabo made a face at Ace. Where will we get them done? He was pretty sure you needed to be over 18 to get one or have parental permission, which neither of them had. Aiden will do it for us. Ace said to Sabo, who understood instantly. Dayton was a bandit, she didn't follow the law or anything in it. How will we get her to do something like that? It wasn't like she was that fond of them in the first place. I think I can manage it. Ace said with a grin that said he had a plan. I hope so, what if Luffy wants one as well? Sabo asked, knowing Luffy would follow the leader. We'll figure that out as we go. Ace said surly, and Sabo nodded. Tomorrow they would make the trip up to the bandits, and maybe he would consider showing Luffy where he once lived, never called home but once lived. After all, they knew so much about their baby brother, wasn't it time for them to show him about them? Sabo leaned back on the bed beside Luffy and smiled softly. Luffy had opened a new world for them, and they'd do anything to protect him no matter what. Good night, my brothers. He said, closing his eyes, a smile on his face, falling into a peaceful sleep. Ace was sitting on the bed that had been built for the boys the day before, completely wide awake. The Marines that shared the ship, much to the boys' annoyances, decided that giving them hammocks caused more of a problem than just building them a sturdy bed. Luffy sure wasn't complaining as he was stretched over Sabo, drooling on his pillow and snoring away the night. It was around 7 a.m, meaning they would be getting up officially soon, but Ace chose to let his brothers rest. The reason he was awake was because he was overthinking. Ace wasn't sure how the meeting with the bandits would go, whether they would be happy to see him again or not. They didn't get along well in the past as it was, so his hopes of a friendly reunion weren't that fantastic. He knew the forest he lived in as well wasn't the safest place in the world, what with a giant bear and a monster tiger guarding the forest and all. Ace knew especially that Luffy and bears were forbidden now. Marco had made it clear that the two were to remain separate at all times, unless they favored a bear coat. Ace didn't mind it that much, maybe they'd beat a bear here to prove to Marco that bears didn't stand a chance against their brother now. Maybe Marco would let up a bit if Luffy took down one super strong one, or on the off chance Luffy did beat the bear and Marco still decided to take his head for putting the boy in danger, was it worth the risk? Marco could be darned right out scary when Luffy was in any sort of danger, then again, so could he. Ace shook his head, trying to not once again overthink everything around him. Ace. Sabo slowly opened his eyes as the sun began to shine through their window onto the bed. Yeah? He asked, looking down at Sabo, who pushed the sleeping boy over some so he could sit up. What time is it? Sabo rubbed the sleep out of his eyes, though he felt unsure if he would go back to bed or not depending on the time. Around 7 or 8, it's still early. Ace replied, looking at the sleeping boy who had decided to remove his pajama shirt and cuddle it instead through the night. Why is he sleeping without his shirt? Ace asked Sabo, who shrugged and smiled. Said it smelt like shanks. Sabo said, and Ace raised a brow but pegged it off to being one of Luffy's weird moments. Should we get him up and head to see Makino? Sabo asked before a smile crept on his face. Is that why you're awake? Couldn't stand the thought of sleeping away from your beautiful Makino. Sabo asked Ace, but got a pillow thrown in his face a moment later by said man. Shut up and wake up Luffy. He scowled but blushed anyways, stupid feelings and girls being stupidly cute. Whatever you say Mr. Romeo. Sabo chuckled as Ace shot the blonde yet another glare. Once Luffy was awake and ready to go, the boys made their way to the tavern where Makino had just begun to start making breakfast. Ah. Good morning. She called out to them as they waved and sat down. Morning, they greeted back to her. Makino began to set plates of food in front of each boy and smiled when they gave looks of joy towards their meals. Thanks for the meal. They called before digging in. So did you boys sleep well? She asked leaning down on the table. Amen. That was the best sleep I've had since I left home. The clothes you gave us, they smelled like shanks. Luffy said before eating more toast. Makino smiled but her eyes widened before becoming soft. That's because they were once his clothes. She said and Ace stopped eating. They were? Sabo asked giving Ace a worried look. Man, Shanks came to visit this island around 5 years ago. She said, a gentle smile on her face and a small blush adorning her cheeks. Why did you have his clothes? Ace asked, his food left untouched now. Because he spent a lot of time here before he left. She said to Ace with a smile. He told me many stories about a young boy who lived with a group of pirates. She said, turning to Luffy, whose grin widened as he pulled on the edges of his straw hat. Shanks, someday I'm going to be stronger than him. Luffy said, closing his eyes and picturing his idol in his mind. I'm going to become the king of the pirates and return his hat. Luffy said, picking his hat off of his head and staring at it. I thought that hat might have been his. She said, and Luffy made a head tilt he was so famous for. He told me of his precious straw hat that he left with a child that carried a powerful dream. She said with a smile. So you and Shanks, did you guys, you know what, never mind. Sabo said, looking at Ace, who was a pale color at this moment. She said, not understanding anything that was happening. We want to head out soon, we have a long trek through the forest to get to where we used to live. Sabo said, standing up and pulling Ace off of the stool he seemed to be frozen to. Ah. I'll go prepare those lunches then. She said and headed back to the kitchen away from the boys. You alright Ace? Sabo asked and Ace just numbly nodded his head. We'll go have some fun then come back later, K. Luffy said to Ace, who was beginning to unfreeze. Yeah, sure. Ace said while Sabo and Luffy exchanged worried glances. Ace, you need to pull yourself together. The forest animals won't hesitate to kill you if you're zoned out. What would Luffy think if you just went and died on him? Sabo asked the man, making him fully come back to himself. Don't worry Sabo, I won't die. Ace said, closing his eyes, mentally bringing himself back. This island is weird for the East Blue. Luffy might like it since it feels like home, but don't forget he's still new here. Sabo stood up and accepted the backpack Makino had given them filled with lunches. Be safe boys, I'll be here when you get back. She said and they nodded before heading out. So this forest is where you both lived? Luffy asked them, unsure about the situation. Yeah, we lived here and fought here, but it's home. Ace said, staring at the trees, taking a step forward, getting hit with the smell of home. I come from the city just on the other side of the forest. Sabo said to Luffy, who nodded his head. Can we go there? He asked but didn't know if he wanted to by the looks he was given. It's a mean place. Sabo said to Luffy, who was confused. But you came from it. He liked Sabo, and if Sabo came from it then the place should be good. I was an outcast in the town in my family. Sabo said, a dark shadow covering his face, making Luffy step closer to him. Well, you're wanted here with our family. Sabo looked at the boy before smiling. I know and I'm grateful. He said and Luffy laughed. Hurry up guys, it's a long ways to Dayton's place. Ace called to the stragglers behind him. Along the way to Dayton's place, Ace pointed out spots he used to hunt at. Sabo would tell Luffy stories about things they did and areas they should avoid. Wow. This place is huge. Luffy said in awe, coming to a clearing, but Ace and Sabo were on high alert. This is the Tiger Lord's area, we should move along. Sabo said to Luffy, who looked at his brother like he was an idiot. Why? Is he strong? Luffy asked and Ace nodded his head. Sabo and I could never beat him as kids. Ace clarified onto why they respected the tiger. But you're not kids anymore, Luffy said with a feral look in his eyes, hoping to find this great tiger and test out his skills. He's not one you should underestimate, Lou. Sabo scolded lightly, but Luffy turned his gleaming eyes towards him. I was raised on the Grand Line. I've been watching Marco and Thatch take out sea kings 3 times their size since I could walk. I think I'd like to meet this Tiger Lord. He smiled, but Ace and Sabo didn't want to risk the chance. Well, we won't have to wait long, Ace said, knowing the familiar sounds of huge paw steps. He's almost here. Luffy's grin widened and his eyes narrowed. I've been itching for a fight for a while now, bring it beast. he growled to the forest. It was at times like this that truly reminded the brothers that Luffy was a born and raised pirate. The East Blue may be boring for the young teenager since he had grown and adapted to the dangers of the Grand Line and New World. The growl that came from the tiger wasn't as spectacular as Sabo and Ace remembered it to be. "Let's do this," Sabo said, pulling his large pipe off of his back and swinging it in front of him. Ace allowed his arm to form into flames and Luffy crouched down almost like a wild animal himself. The tiger was strong enough to hit Luffy across the clearing with one swipe of a paw. Luffy hit the ground in a cloud of dust, causing the ever-angry Ace to flare up even more. "Don't touch my little brother," he shouted, but Luffy was up in an instant and pushing Ace backwards. "Don't touch the tiger," Luffy shouted at his brother who hit a tree with a thud. "What the hell, Liu?" Sabo yelled at Luffy who glared at the tiger. "I like you," he said to the beast as it hissed at him, its ears folded back on its head and tail low to the ground. "So you like him? Last time I checked, Marco doesn't like cats," Ace shouted, jumping up for another attack, this time landing on the tiger's side, and Luffy freaked out just slightly. "I said don't touch her," Luffy shouted, punching Ace, causing the man to raise a brow in confusion. "You may be my brother, but I'm half tempted to kick your ass, Luffy," he said in a cold voice. "Bring it, Ace, but I'm not letting either of you touch this tiger," Luffy said in the same cold voice to his brothers, startling them. Just what the heck was wrong with him this time? "Luffy, this tiger had been causing Ace and I grieve forever as children," Sabo said, carefully, not liking the look in Luffy's eyes. "But that was years ago, things have changed since then," Luffy said and pointed to the trees surrounding the clearing. Sabo took the opportunity to look where Luffy was pointing and his eyes widened at the sight. "Nothing's changed, Luffy," Ace snarled, but Sabo grabbed his shoulder, making him look. Ace looked at his brother and followed his gaze to where Luffy had pointed to. In the clearing were two baby tigers watching carefully. "Babies?" Ace said and Luffy nodded his head. "The mother protecting her children, could you really take a parent away from those brothers?" Luffy asked Ace, who had stopped flaming. Luffy turned his gaze to the tiger who was growling at him. "We won't hurt your babies," he said in a flat tone, and the tiger lord watched him carefully before walking around the clearing towards her children. "Oh, we won't bother you again," Luffy said to her, and she turned her back, walking towards her children before stopping to look back at them. She turned her golden eyes upon Luffy and chuffed before walking away, the babies following behind her. "How did you know?" Ace asked his brother, who laughed his shishishi. "I saw them when she smacked me the first time and she doesn't have family jewels," Luffy said, and Sabo shook his head, laughing. "Only you, Luffy." But it was a time like this that made him proud to call Luffy his brother. "Let's keep going, we need to make it there soon," Ace said, turning away from his brothers. "Luffy, sorry for doubting you," he said, and Luffy laughed once again. "Don't worry about it, let's just go." And that they did. They crossed over logs where Ace pointed out the many crocodiles swimming below, while Sabo walked behind Luffy just in case he chose that moment to test his luck and jump in. Ace pointed out that at the bottom of that ravine was a pack of wolves that had mutated to become giant and feral. "This island is something like back home," Luffy said happily. "Yeah, that it sure is." Sabo, now having lived in both the Grand Line and New World, couldn't deny that this island was one special place for a sea so calm. "I can't wait to tell Marco about this when we get back." But the shivers that went up their spines made them look at their brother with worried eyes. "Why don't we not tell him?" Ace said seriously, and Sabo nodded his head, quickly agreeing. "What? Why?" Luffy wanted to tell Marco all about his adventures. "Because this island is a little too crazy a tale to tell to him," Sabo said, hoping to change the subject quickly. Luffy mad but would let it go for now. "See that cabin, Lou? That's where Ace lived," Sabo said, pointing in a direction, and Luffy squinted, looking around. "What cabin?" "All I see is a rundown hut," Luffy said, making the boys laugh. "Yup, that's the place," Ace said, laughing a little. "What, you're serious?" he yelled, and Sabo laughed harder. And we need to be polite if we want to get what we want from them," Sabo said, and Luffy looked confused. "What do we want from them?" he asked, feeling yet again out of the loop. "Patu's little brother." Luffy's eyes sparkled at the thought. "Like Maz?" he asked, excitement bubbling in his chest. "If that's what you want," Sabo said, and Luffy nodded his head frantically. "It might hurt a little," Ace said, and Luffy frowned before giving Ace a strong look. "If you're getting a tattoo, then I want one," he said, and the brothers knew that nothing could break that will. When they got to the hut, Ace knocked on the door loudly and waited for a large woman to bang it open with a scowl. "Who the heck is it? Do you want to get killed?" she screeched as she looked at the one who dared to bang on her door. "Hey, it's us," Ace said to the woman, who blinked a few times at the boy standing in front of her. "Who the heck are you?" she asked in confusion before Ace growled at her. "It's me, Ace," Ace screamed, and the look of shock that covered her face was almost comedic. "Ace, but Garp took you away from here," she said, and Sabo smiled. Yeah, we're back. The look of horror finally made Luffy laugh. You're stupid and funny, Pops. Luffy said, making Sabo and Ace smile. And who's this little shit? She said, pointing to Luffy once she had calmed down a bit. Ah, that's Luffy. Sabo said fondly, and Ace looked over at the kid. Garp's grandson. He completed for Sabo, causing the other two bandits to just stare open-mouthed at them. He's also a whitebeard pirate. Sabo laughed as they all paled drastically. What a terrifying combination. Dayton whispered, looking at the laughing boy in front of her. He's also our little brother. Ace said softly, but the bandits caught it and the older two smiled. Well, come in, I guess. Dayton said, letting the boys pass. Thanks, Pops. Luffy cheered and Dayton closed her eyes, scowling. I'm a woman, damn it. She said to the boy who wasn't listening. This place looks like crap. Her brow twitched even more with his statement. If I kill him, Garp and that old pirate will kill me, she whispered, and Sabo laughed at her. Nah, probably the 1st Division Commander Marco might though, he's very protective of the boy. And Dayton just stood there digesting all the information. Where have you boys been? Dagra asked them once they had sat down. We were taken to the Grand Line and dropped off on Whitebeard's ship. A said with a smile. We've been there ever since, Sabo said, accepting a cup of tea. Sounds like an adventure, Magra said happily. Every day is an adventure there. Ace laughed, causing the bandits' eyes to widen at the sound. What about him? Dayton asked, curious about Garp's grandson. I've been with Pops and the others my whole life. Luffy said happily. So you've always been at sea? Magra asked, and Luffy nodded. And remember a day not being out in the open. Luffy missed being on the sea already. He had spent way too long docked at an island for his liking. Why are you here, brats? You both aren't one for sentimentality, Dayton asked, and Ace nodded his head. You're the best tattoo artist around and we want some. Ace said, and she rolled her eyes. Like I'm giving a bunch of brats tattoos, wait until you're older. She said, until Ace reached into his pocket, pulling out a heavy bag. Do it and you get this. He said, and she opened it to find jewels and gold piled in it, much to her delight. Of course. She said, putting the bag in her pocket and ordering her bandits to get her stuff. Once ready, she looked at the brothers seriously. Who's first? She asked, and Luffy stepped forward. Me, I want the white beard mark on my lower back. He said. Dayton looked over at Ace, who had pulled some paper from one of the drawers in the room and drew the design that Marco had. Make it small. Ace said, not wanting it to be a huge thing on him. The lower back hurts a bit, kid. She said seriously to him, and he nodded. Do it, but don't let me see. Luffy hated needles, but as long as he didn't see them he might be okay. Once the needle hit his rubbery skin, Luffy flinched and Sabo grabbed his hand. It's alright, Lou, we're here for you. He said, and Luffy nodded and bit his lip until it was over with. Keep it clean but don't get it wet for a few days. She said, and wrapped it in a bandage. I got a tattoo, Luffy said slowly, but he felt so happy at that moment. You did, we're so proud of you, kid. Ace said to his brother, giving him a small hug. Ace and Sabo got the ones they had discussed and had them wrapped up like Luffy's. Gramps is gonna be mad, isn't he? Luffy asked, eating his lunch with the bandits, and Ace laughed. Probably, but who cares? We're pirates, remember? Ace said with a smirk. You've changed, Ace, Magra said, smiling. Yeah, maybe, he said, and looked at Luffy fondly. That kid changes people, Sabo said knowingly. He's a damn D, what did you expect? Dayton whispered to herself but smiled in the direction of the boy. When lunch was over, the boys waved goodbye to the bandits and began their walk towards the village. Luffy started to walk forward but turned back to face them. Boy. Dayton. I really don't like bandits much. He shouted and caused her to yell back at him, but he laughed. But I like you guys. I hope we can meet again. He said, and Ace smiled, pulling the boy forward. We gotta go, Lou, we really don't want to be here during the night. He said, and Luffy smiled, following his brothers. Sabo pointed to the tall wall that was in the distance and explained it to Luffy as they walked. Luffy nodded and frowned at the people that lived there. Ace explained the Great Terminal and how it had come to be because of that wall. Luffy liked the bandits and liked Makino, but decided he wasn't very fond of anything else on the island. Let's go see Makino and show her our new tattoos. Luffy said, finding the path they had walked on, and Sabo gave a look to Ace. I've decided when we get back I'm going to confess to Makino. Ace said, and Sabo nodded with a small smile. I wish you luck. He said, and Ace grinned back at his brother, knowing in his heart he stood no chance against someone like Shanks. They finally made it through the jungle forest back to town, where Garp was loading the supplies onto the ship. Where were you boys? He asked them and gave them a suspicious look. Visiting the bandits. Ace said, and Garp laughed. Really? How are they? And Sabo smiled at the gold man. Fantastic. He said, remembering the pile of gold and jewels Ace passed to them. That's good. Garp said softly. Pack up, boys, we're leaving soon. Garp waved and went back to helping his marines load what needed to be loaded. "How was your time?" Makino asked them and Luffy cheered before lifting up his shirt and showing the bandage tattoo. "I got Marco's mark on my back so no matter where I go I will always be family," he said and Makino's eyes widened. She didn't like the idea of a child getting a tattoo but didn't say anything, this was the boy's life to live. "We all got tattoos," Sabo said showing his arm to her and she smiled at him. "I'm going to miss you guys," she said to them and they smiled at her. "We will miss you too Makino," Luffy said and Sabo looked towards Ace who was fidgeting. "We're going to head back to the ship," Sabo said pulling Luffy forwards leaving Ace alone with Makino. "Is there something wrong Ace?" she asked as Ace's face started to brighten. I like you," he said quickly to her hoping to get it out right and quick. "I like you too Ace," Makino said to the teenager who flinched but pulled himself together. "No I mean I like you damn it I'm sounding like Luffy," he said and her eyes widened before a small blush came to her cheeks. "Ace I'm sorry. I'm with Shanks," she said to the man who nodded his head in understanding. "I know I just couldn't leave without saying something," he said and she smiled softly at him before giving him a kiss on the cheek. "Thank you for your feelings though Ace," she aided to the boy who pulled himself together. "If Shanks ever does anything to make you cry I'll beat him up," Ace said and Makino laughed. "I'll be counting on you," she said and Ace smiled turning away from her and following his brothers. Sure he didn't get the girl, but as the phrase goes, there are plenty of more fish in the sea. Meanwhile on an island in the East Blue a green-haired kid had no idea what the tides would bring him in the following days if he didn't get lost before then of course. "You brat, you're good with your pipe," Garp said to Sabo who pulled his pipe off his back to admire its craftsmanship. "Damn straight I am." Sabo was a modest man except when talking about his pipe. He knew he was good at it and preferred it to any other weapon in the world. "What about with a sword?" Garp asked him and Sabo had a bad feeling he knew where this was going. "I'm not comfortable with how light they are," he said stupidly, but he meant it, Sabo liked how his pipe was heavy and strong. Sure it was slow sometimes, but if he worked on it more and got stronger his power would outweigh the problem. "That's a problem," Garp said and turned away leaving a very stunned Sabo on the deck. "What's his problem?" Ace said leaning up against the railing proudly showing off his new tattoo. "What isn't his problem this is Garp remember?" Sabo said to Ace who nodded his head in agreement. Garp hadn't taken the tattoos very well and had shown the boys his anger through training. "Luffy still out?" Sabo asked worriedly. "Like a light," Ace replied frowning now. Luffy's tattoo had really bothered Garp so the man had made it his mission to teach his grandson a lesson. "It's not a bad tattoo," Ace said, happy with how Luffy's mark had turned out. Luffy had the signature Whitebeard pirate mark but the one that Marco and many other members wore instead. Luffy's was dark blue for the cross and a blue and gold feather finishing it off. Ace was sure he added that for Marco to represent his bond with both his father and the one who loved him. "It's a wonderful tattoo, but you do realize that we're so dead when we get back?" Sabo said to Ace who laughed loudly and waved his hand at his brother. "Probably for a moment really but no longer than that," he said with a smirk and Sabo raised a brow. "You do realize this is Marco we're talking about? Overprotective, let nothing happen to his precious Luffy or someone dies Marco," Sabo said clarifying up just how much danger they might actually be in. "Yup but we have something he doesn't," Ace said and Sabo once again looked at Ace curiously. "And that would be?" He was confused. "Luffy and his damn big eyes, you know Marco can't resist those eyes, especially since we've been away from them for so long," Ace said matter-of-factly. Sabo wasn't sure so much though and would prepare an emergency backup plan for when Ace's idea fell through. "What island are we heading to next?" To be honest Ace was getting bored with the East Blue. Ever since they had left on island nothing else seemed strong enough to catch their attention long. They knew that if none of this was interesting them any then Luffy was probably bored out of his mind. "No but I hope we'll be home soon," Sabo said to Ace patting him on his bare shoulder before heading into the galley for food. "The storm's coming," Ace said looking at the sky a sense of foreboding coming his way. Garp had decided that he had done a good job training his grandsons. Ace had a better control over his fire and Luffy's skills using haki were almost too good. If only Luffy could remember to use his haki then all would be perfect but it seems as if his youngest grandchild's brain hadn't developed the memory section yet. Luffy would use and then forget to use haki, causing the older man to get frustrated with the child who would only laugh at the old man. The boy Sabo had some skills with his pipe but his lack of official training held him back. Garp knew a man who owned a dojo that owed him a favor so being the wonderful man he was decided to stop and give the man a visit. Unfortunately they were pretty far away from said place and Garp had yet to contact the man. Luffy had woken up as soon as food hit the table, he wasn't sure how strong the kid's senses were but he might consider some sort of training for that. Gramps, if you don't start eating, Luffy will. Ace said, his mouth full and pointing his fork towards Garp's untouched food, reminding him that Luffy didn't care if you ate or not, if food was on your plate it might as well be on his. Damn Brad and his stretchy arms. Garp muttered, putting an arm around his plate and started to dig in. Where we heading next? Luffy asked through a mouthful of meat. To visit an old friend. Garp said while eating more. What kind of friend? Sabo asked suspiciously, knowing that nothing good comes from anything this man does. An old friend. Garp repeated, causing Sabo to groan, knowing he wasn't getting any more information. Whatever. Hey Ace, wanna spar? Luffy asked excitedly, his plates piled to a decent level beside him. Nah, let's hit the sack early. Ace said, standing up, but Garp glared in his direction. Without doing any chores. He scolded and Ace laughed. I'm a pirate. Ace smirked darkly at his grandfather. And I'm a marine. Get to work, brat, or do you plan to eat your dinner like a dog tomorrow, on the floor? Garp returned the dark smirk towards Ace. What do you mean, old man? Ace would never eat off the floor, not now, not ever. Do you really trust him to do dishes and spare any? Garp asked, having had Luffy touch the kitchen once and watch it almost go up in accidental flames. I see the point, he said, and Garp laughed, glad to still have some control over the brats. When Ace said a storm was coming, he was right. The rain that fell that night was almost Grand Line worthy, and while Ace and Sabo were able to sleep through it, Luffy was wide awake. Rain like this made him miss home more and more. He loved his home, he loved his sea, the same sea he would someday rule if his dreams come true. Luffy could think of the times he would dance with Thatch in the rain, then be scolded by Marco when the thunder boomed across the sky. He remembered the times he would crawl into Marco's bed when he was first learning that lightning couldn't hurt him, or maybe it could. He didn't know, after all. Marco wouldn't let him out long enough to test it. I'm going to dance in the rain. He said to himself, standing up carefully so he didn't wake his brothers, but knowing their observation hockey they'd be up soon enough to drag him back to bed. Luffy opened the door quietly and breathed in the familiar scent of rain and sea, and how his heart grew with the love he had for them both. Too bad this stupid boat doesn't have a good figurehead. Luffy grumbled to himself, hating this metal boat more and more. Whirling on his tiptoes, Luffy felt the rain hit his skin and drip off. He had never seen a storm like this in his time in the East Blue, so he would take advantage of it now while he could. Humming a tune to himself, he closed his eyes and continued to twirl around in the rain. Luffy had never danced before but did his best all the same. The waves crashed against the ship, warning him to get cover, but he ignored them, not afraid of their roars. The black of the night mixed with the gray of the sky which hid the moon and stars, but Luffy felt them even if he couldn't see them. He wondered what Marco was doing with now, what Pops and Thatch were doing. Were they having a party? Was it raining with them as well? Luffy was so caught up in his thoughts he didn't hear the door open. Boy brat, what are you doing out of bed? A marine grunt said to Luffy, startling him, causing him to lose his balance and slip. Oh, the man grunted, rushing forward to grab Luffy as he fell over the railing into the water. Doors slamming open and screams of his name were the last thing Luffy heard as the darkness filled his vision and his strength left him. When Luffy opened his eyes again, he was actually surprised he wasn't dead. He was pretty sure he had dropped off the marine vessel and his ability meant he couldn't swim. So since he fell and he can't swim, how the hell was he alive? So you're awake? A voice said. A girl stood before him, her hand on her hip and staring at him funny. What happened? Luffy said, numbly rubbing his eyes. Man, was he ever tired? That's what I want to know. Here I am working my butt off heading towards a ship's light in the dark, and you seem to wash up to this ship's edge, she said, watching him carefully. You were heading towards a ship? He asked her and she smirked. It's not every day a ship keeps their lights on all night. I figured I could rob them blind and be out of there before morning. She said, a dark smile on her face. You rob ships? He asked and she frowned at him. I only steal from pirates. She said, distaste clear on her face and in her voice. But that was a marine ship. Luffy said, knowing it was his grandpa's ship. You're a marine? She asked him in surprise, looking him over and hearing him laugh. Nope, but I'm stuck with them for now. He said and smiled a bit. Where are we? He asked her, hoping he was relatively safe. We're on a random ship, I sweet-talked the captain, but we're leaving now. She said, pulling him up, and that's when he realized he was missing something very important. My hat. Luffy screeched out, thinking his hat had drowned with him. Your what? She asked, impatience in her voice. My hat. He said, tears filling his eyes at the thought of losing it. You mean this? She asked, picking it up off of the desk and throwing it to him as he smiled brightly at her. Thank you so much. If I had lost this I would have never been able to be anything. He said to her and she smiled at him. It's just a hat, she said, but her smile was there. No, it's my treasure. He said and her eyes widened before becoming gentle. Let's go, I've robbed as much as I can from these nobodies. It's time to make our escape. She smirked at him before winking. Sure, I need to get back to my grandpa. Luffy said and she stopped him, putting her hand forward and one on her hip. So if I bring you home, will your grandpa give me a reward? She asked slyly, and Luffy wasn't too sure of the answer. Probably. He said, shrugging, but belly signs formed in her eyes and she smiled sweetly at him. Then let's get you home. She said and Luffy just chuckled. Where do you think you're going? A voice said behind her, causing her to freeze. We're leaving. Luffy said casually, causing the man to frown and glare. With what ship, kid? He laughed and Luffy smiled. Not a ship, dummy, a boat will do just fine. He said, missing the intended sarcasm. Not with that bag, you're not. He shouted and went to hit Luffy with his sword, only for the boy to bend backwards and forwards as the blade went past him each and every time. How the heck, the man said, and Luffy lifted his leg, kicking the man in the chest. You're boring. Luffy said coldly, ice in his voice while his hat overshadowed his eyes, giving him an almost demonic look. The girl stood there stunned as Luffy finally grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. You said we need to go, right? He said, impatience clear in his voice as she nodded her head stiffly and followed him to the deck. That boat will do fine. She said, pulling herself together, and he wasted no time helping her unlatch one from the ship, causing it to fall into the water. Luffy and the girl wasted no time jumping onto the boat, and the girl got the sails up, catching the wind as they took off. Where would your grandpa be? The girl asked him after they had calmed down from their adventure. He said he was heading to an island, but I don't know what one. Luffy said, remembering dinner and that he was actually very hungry. How long was I out? He said, dropping his head on the boat's railing and his hands dangled into the water. I don't know, maybe 12 hours. She said, remembering all the fast talk she had to do after rescuing him. My brothers are probably worried about me, he said softly, but the girl heard him. You have brothers? She asked and he nodded. Lots of brothers. Was all he said, but she smiled at him sweetly. We'll be at an island in an hour, why don't you rest for a bit, I'll let you know when we're there. She said, leaning back on the boat and resting her eyes. Sure, Gramps might be there. He said, closing his eyes and taking in the sun rays, drifting back to sleep. When Luffy opened his eyes again, the girl was staring at him. Morning. He said and she blushed slightly, turning her eyes away from him. It's afternoon, dummy. She scolded and he laughed. We're almost there. She pointed to an island in the direction they were headed. Maybe Gramps will be there. He said hopefully. If not, we can leave a message for him. She said and he nodded at her, giving her a grin. Heading to the island was easy, and thankfully no one seemed to care that two teenagers just docked a random boat at their shores. What a peaceful island. The girl said thankfully, but Luffy scowled. I'm tired of the peace. He said, really missing home. Hey, what were you doing that night that made you fall in the water? She was a little curious now, knowing he was an idiot. I was dancing in the rain. He said, blushing slightly. You dance? She asked, surprised, but he laughed. Nope, I suck real badly. He said, and she sweat dropped at that statement. That's why you fell over? She asked slowly, but he shook his head. I slipped when some idiot startled me. I honestly thought I was going to die, so maybe you're an angel sent down to rescue me. He said, seriously looking at her with wide eyes. I'm human, idiot, and call it a lucky coincidence. I'll probably never save your life again. She said and he laughed. You never know. He said and she shook her head. Who the hell are you? Someone said to them and Luffy looked around for who was talking. I said, who the hell are you? This time a man with green hair and 3 swords walked up to the little group, his arms crossed and a glare on his face. Who are you? Luffy asked, his face going blank. I asked first. The man snarled, but Luffy didn't flinch. But I asked second. He said as if his logic was correct. But I asked you first. He said louder just as Luffy was about to open his mouth to argue back. The girl punched him over the head. Idiot meat dummy. She said as Luffy grabbed a growing bump. He's here looking for his grandfather. She said, crossing her arms and looking at the green-haired man. And why should I care who he's looking for? The man yelled at her, receiving a punch on his own head. Don't spit in my face, you barbarian. She shouted at him, making him growl at her. Is there a problem here? A man wearing a yukata asked, stepping forward. Nope, nothing to worry about. The girl said, waving her hands at the man who smiled at her, his eyes closed. I see, Zoro, are you picking another fight with a stranger? He asked the man who stood up, his bump smaller now. He feels funny. Zoro said, glaring at the straw-hatted boy. I feel funny? Luffy asked, confused. You feel funny? He repeated, turning away, but never taking his eyes off of the boy, his hand on his sword. Where are you from, child? The man asked and Luffy smiled, ready to tell them. We're just looking for his grandpa. The girl cut in before Luffy could say anything. Well, what is his name? I'm sure we can contact him for you. He said and Luffy smiled wider. Really, Pops? Thanks. His name is Garp. Luffy said and the man's expression changed. I know your grandpa, he planned to make a stop here, but his grandson had gone missing. He said and Luffy laughed. Yeah, I had an accident. Zoro just watched him even more carefully, wondering how a man that looked so weak could feel so powerful. I'll contact him as soon as possible. The man said, turning away from the group, directing Luffy to follow him back to his dojo. Looks like my work is done, she said, stepping back, and Luffy frowned. Hey, what's your name? He asked her, and she smiled widely and winked before saying her name. I'm Nami and I love tangerines and treasure. She said, and Luffy smiled at her. I'm Monkey D. Luffy. He said simply, and she smiled very softly at him. I was hoping to get a nice payment for returning you to your family, but should we meet again I'll collect it. She said to him, and he nodded. Here, take this. Luffy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tiara. I picked it up on the ship, it was shiny and cool. He threw it at her, and she barely caught it, fumbling with it in her hands. What's this for? She asked him, and he laughed. My down payment for returning me, also I think a crown would look nice on you. He said and turned away, waving to her as a blush formed on her cheeks, and the man Zoro glared at them both. Are you done chit-chatting? Let's go already. He said in annoyance and followed his teacher towards the dojo, a laughing Luffy right behind him. Meanwhile on the marine ship. You call them? Sabo said, pushing the phone towards Ace, who shook his head and pushed it back to Sabo. Nope, you do it. He said, and Sabo began to sweat. I honestly don't feel like dying, he said to Ace, who nodded his head. Do we really need to tell them? Ace asked, and Sabo had thought about not telling them, but Garp had demanded it be done. Whitebeard's eyes are everywhere. If he can contact one of his East Blue allies, then Luffy will be found quicker. The only problem with this plan was that they needed to tell them in the first place. Let's do it together, that way we at least die together. Sabo said, but he knew there was no way to escape this. Both boys took a deep breath as they picked up the phone's dial and waited in dread for the phone to be answered. Hello, Yoi. Marco said over the line, and they could hear how happy he was to talk to them. Hey Marco, Ace started, but a lump formed in his throat. What's up, brats? Thatch said over the line, and Sabo took a deep breath before saying the words he didn't want to say. Luffy's missing. Thatch heard those words from the boys and watched as blue and gold flames began to lick over Marco's body, making Thatch instantly grab Marco's wrist to hold him still. What do you mean he's missing, Yoi? He all but snarled at the boys, but the snail flinched, showing the effects it had on the teenagers. He snuck out of his bed at night, Sabo started, but Marco glared at them still. It was a storming out, and you know what he's like. He likes rain for some odd reason. Ace said in his defense. That doesn't explain why he's missing. Thatch said to the boys, who frowned. He fell off the ship. Sabo said, and Marco paled. Luffy was a fruit user, and him falling off the ship in a storm had always been his worst nightmare. It also could mean instant death for the boy. I'm coming to you, Yoi. He said, trying to turn himself into a phoenix, but found he couldn't. We'll discuss it with Pops, for now keep us updated. Alright brats, Thatch said, but was giving Marco a hard stare. Thanks Thatch and Marco, we'll find him. Ace said seriously to the man as Thatch hung up the phone. How are you holding back my powers, Yoi? Thatch had never been able to do this before. See, stone ring handy, isn't it? He said coldly to his best friend. For me, who's not a fruit user, it is nothing but decoration, but it can stunt you guys even for a moment. He said, but continued to hold his friend. Let me go, Thatch, Yoi. He said to the man, but Thatch refused. If you show up in the East Blue, things will go bad. You're a commander of the Whitebeard pirates, Marco. If word gets out you're in the calmest sea looking for a child, the attention will be turned onto Luffy. Do we really want our little brat to have a bounty on his head this early in his life? What about Ace and Sabo? What will happen to them if the Marines turn their attention onto them? Thatch was never good at being the voice of reason. That was Marco's job, but there was no way in hell he was letting his brother go and mess up that royally. Then what should we do? You can't expect me to sit by while Luffy is missing, Yoi. He snapped at Thatch, who glared angrily at Marco. The highest bounty in the East Blue is around 15 million, and that's only because the man with that bounty was under Roger's command. Luffy is strong enough to take on pirates here in the New World, not beat them, but take them on. Have faith in our brother, remember, Thatch said to Marco, hoping to get the man calmed down. He fell into the ocean, Thatch. You know he can't swim, Yoi. Marco argued, and Thatch groaned in anger. Then what good would you be? Last time I checked, you and water aren't exactly friends either. Thatch was having just about enough of this. What is wrong, my sons? Pops asked as the two men finally stood before him. Luffy is missing, Yoi. Marco said, and Pops felt the same worry and protectiveness in his chest that any of them felt. Did Ace and Sabo call you? He needed to know where the information had come from, because those words had caused many of the siblings around them to become fidgety. Yes, they say he fell overboard in a storm. Thatch said, his hand still on Marco's wrist. Let me go to the East Blue, Pops. I can find him faster from the air, Yoi. Thatch's brow twitched in anger. Did you not hear a damn thing I just said to you? Thatch knew that whenever Luffy was involved, Marco lost his usage of common sense. However, he didn't think it was this bad. Yes, I heard you, but I'll be discreet. I'll stay high so no one will see me yoi. He argued and Pops listened quietly. You don't think people aren't going to notice a freaking blue phoenix flying in the sky? Thatch was getting pissed off now. Let me go, Pops. Thatch said, turning away from Marco and looking at his father. Because I'm not a fruit user, the Marines don't usually take me seriously until they're dead. I can keep a lower profile and find him faster that way. Thatch said and Pops nodded. Ace and Sabo will be looking for your brother as well, and Garp has many good connections in the east as well as I. We need to remain calm and wait for more information before I send anyone to the East Blue. Pop said in finality. But Pops. If we wait, who knows what will. Marco started but was cut off by his father. If he wishes to be a captain of his own, then there will be times when he will disappear from us. We as a crew cannot sail over every sea each and every time he has a problem or goes missing. Ace and Sabo are growing as well, Marco. Let this be a test for them to see how they can handle the situation. We will step in should we need to, but let us allow them to grow and learn. He too was worried for his youngest son, but he knew the dangers of the sea. He knew that when Luffy became his own pirate, the boy wouldn't want them to step in every time he had a problem or a battle. If they did, the child may grow to resent them for it, and that would hurt Marco more than him worrying from a distance. So I am to sit back and do nothing, yoi? Marco asked sadly, and Pops felt sorrow for his eldest. Have faith, my son, have faith. Back with Luffy. So why do you have 3 swords? Luffy asked Zoro, who frowned at him and touched his sword's hilt. Because that's how I fight. He said simply, and Luffy nodded his head, probably not understanding anything. But why 3? He asked again, proving that point, and Zoro felt his patience wearing thin. Because I'm better at using 3. He shouted at the boy, who laughed, putting his hands behind his head. Sure. Luffy said simply, looking around the dojo. Where's your family? Do they live here too? Luffy asked, and Zoro closed his eyes in annoyance. I don't have any family. Zoro said simply, and Luffy frowned. That's sad, it must be lonely. Luffy's eyes darkened at the idea of being alone, and Zoro noticed this greatly. It's not that lonely, I'm training to be the best. He said, hoping to bring back that smile even if it annoyed him. What's the point in being the best if you have no one to share it with? Luffy asked, looking into the distance, and for once Zoro was silent, as yet again this child had surprised him. I don't need anyone, I'm stronger than that. He said, looking off into the distance, but Luffy wasn't taking any of it. And that's why you're weak. He said, standing up and looking around with bored eyes. Isn't there anything we can do around here? He asked, and Zoro pulled his sword out of his sheath. Fight me? Luffy raised a brow in confusion. He didn't exactly like swords since they could hurt him, but Uncle Haki used his sword on him often during that week. Why should I? Luffy asked in interest. No one calls me weak and gets away with it. Zoro growled at him as he tied a bandana over his head, and Luffy chuckled. Then get stronger. Luffy said, smirking at the teenager and coating his arms in haki. What's that on your hands? Zoro asked him but didn't remove his eyes away from Luffy. Haki. Luffy said simply and jumped towards Zoro, ready to punch him hard. Zoro blocked the punch with his sword, but Luffy's strength made it shake in his hands. You're a lot stronger than you look. Zoro said through gritted teeth, trying to push Luffy backwards. You too. Luffy agreed, but he had a large feral grin on his face. Zoro finally pushed Luffy back and swung his sword over the boy's head, but Luffy ducked and aimed a kick at the swordsman's knee. You need to be faster if you want to catch me. Luffy laughed as Zoro realized where the kick was heading, causing him to bring his second sword into battle. Zoro, using his second blade, caught Luffy's foot, twisting him away from his knee, and sliced with his other blade, making Luffy jump back to avoid the blade. That's better. Luffy cheered but bent his body to hit Zoro in the chest. The man brought his swords up and blocked the punch. Both men glared at each other, but there was no malice in their eyes, just pure primal fun. What are you? Zoro asked the boy, who grinned widely. I'm a rubber man. He said. They continued to fight like that until the teenagers were flat on their backs, panting, but smiles on their faces for having so much fun. Luffy hadn't fought like that in a long time, so he enjoyed the challenge Zoro had given him. I like you. Luffy said, happily taking deep breaths, trying to cool himself down. I've never fought like that before, Zoro said, eyeing the boy once again. When we first met you said I felt funny, what did you mean by that? Luffy asked, turning his head towards Zoro, who looked at the sky. I've never met anyone like you before, you look so weak, but you radiate power, it's very contradicting. Even now I'm not sure whether or not I should like you or not. He said, and Luffy smiled softly. You said you want to be the best, he said, and Zoro gave a grin. I will be the greatest swordsman in this world. He said, believing in himself completely. The greatest, huh? You'll have to be super strong to get that title. Luffy smiled thinking of his Uncle Hawkie. There's a man I will surpass even if it kills me. Luffy looked at Zoro with a hard stare. There are many great swordsmen in this world and many of them are stronger than you. Luffy said thinking of Vista, Thatch and yet again his uncle. Then I'll surpass them one by one until I get to the top. Zoro said and Luffy smiled his eyes bright. I've decided. Luffy said looking at the clouds passing by making Zoro grunt in confusion. You're going to join my crew. Luffy said with confidence and Zoro gave the kid a weird look. You're like what 14 he said rolling onto his side to look at the kid better. So what? I'm going to be the king of the pirates and the king must have the best. The look Zoro gave the boy was almost too comical for Luffy to stand. I'll never be a pirate. Zoro said sitting up. Oh come on it'll be fun. Luffy whined and Zoro felt conflicted on the kid's strength once again. Where did you learn to become that strong? He decided to ask and Luffy smiled once more. Training with my brothers. He said and Zoro raised a brow. Are they strong? He asked thinking of the way the boy fought. Stronger than I am. Zoro smiled at the thought of fighting them. I'd love to meet your brothers. He said eagerly, but Luffy laughed. Once you join my crew you can. Zoro crossed his arms and looked at the boy. And if I join your crew what do I get? He asked the kid who looked up at him from under his hat and grinned. I know plenty of strong swordsmen in the world especially my uncle. Join me and I can guarantee someday you'll be able to beat them all. Luffy said and Zoro smirked at the thought. Your uncle what's his name? Zoro asked and Luffy laughed. Uncle Hawkie. He cheered, but Zoro frowned never hearing that name before. He better be as strong as you say Luffy laughed softly looking at his new friend. He's better. Are you planning on becoming a captain right now? He asked Luffy who shook his head. Right now I'm already a part of a crew, but when I turn 17 I'll meet you here and we'll set sail. Zoro looked down at the kid. What crew are you on? Isn't your grandpa a marine or something? He asked Luffy who smirked. Gramps is a marine, but I was a pirate long before I met him. I'm part of the Whitebeard crew. Luffy said proudly and Zoro's eyes widened. You're lying. He shouted as Luffy took his shirt off and pointed to his mark. Ops and the others are my family, but I can't stay with them and still become the king. Zoro stared wide-eyed at the mark, proving that this child was one of the ruling emperor's crewmates. That's why you're so strong. He whispered and Luffy shook his head in anger. No, I'm strong because I want to be, Pop's name is a family, but not of my power. He said seriously to Zoro who looked at the boy in front of him. Someday I'll become even stronger and I'll get that strength with my nakama. He said and Zoro felt a bit of respect for the boy. When I'm 17 we'll meet here and set sail. He repeated firmly to Zoro who looked at the hand reaching out to him. Hey captain he said grabbing the hand agreeing to the words spoken. Now where's the food I'm starving? Luffy practically screamed running back through the halls looking for anything edible. Zoro was left there to question just what he had gotten himself into, but he couldn't stop the smile from forming on his face, this child was very persuasive. With Garp. Garp had felt his heart grow lighter once he had heard Luffy had been found. You're sure it's him? Garp asked over the transponder snail and the snail nodded its head. Positive he came with a girl, she seemed to be the one who found him. He said and Garp laughed. I'll have to thank her someday. He said. I believe the boy already did. The man laughed softly and Garp raised a brow at that statement. How did he do that? The snail smiled. He gave her a crown and made her blush. Garp laughed even louder at the image. The future granddaughter-in-law, eh? He said with a wide smile. Don't get ahead of yourself Garp the boy seemed rather oblivious to her blushing. I have him here at my dojo he appears to be making friends with one of my students. The man was actually grateful that Zoro was making a friend ever since his daughter had died, Zoro had become more and more closed off from everyone around him. Luffy's good at that. Garp said thinking of Ace and Sabo. How long until you arrive Garp? He asked and Garp sighed. Probably not until tomorrow evening my other brats have vanished as well in search of their brother. Garp sighed annoyed that they had grabbed the closest ship they could and took off quickly muttering about not wanting to die by a mother hen. I see so you were able to lose all of your grandchildren in the East Blue. The man joked and Garp scowled. They never would have stayed on here for long anyways they're rebellious little brats. He said and laughed. Then I shall see you soon. He said and hung the phone up. Garp sighed and pulled out his other phone to call the brats back. What is it? Ace answered quickly. Their brother has been found. Garp said and the snail gave their startled reactions. Where is he? Sabo asked taking the phone from Ace. Come back to the ship we're heading his way. Garp said and the phone nodded its head. Got it, we're on our way. The line went silent and the snail fell asleep. You better still be there when we arrive Luffy Garp said into the dark, knowing how impatient the kid could be, especially if he's already gotten what he wanted from somewhere. All we need right now is your damned family in the East Blue brat, so don't move anywhere. Garp said sarcastically and grabbed a bottle of liquor since he felt it was going to be a long night. So why were you coming to this island, Luffy? Zoro asked the kid, who shrugged. Gramps decides where to go and I usually don't have any choice, Luffy replied simply. But you're not from the East, Blue? He asked him and Luffy shook his head. This is the first time I've ever been away from home. Luffy's eyes glazed over thinking of home. What's it like your home? Zoro asked him. They were both sitting on the grass drinking some juice, a towel around both their necks from another spar. I can't really describe it, he said, trying to think of how to describe the new world. Nothing really stays the same back home, you need to be strong to live. I was lucky and have really strong brothers and a super strong father, so I was always protected. Luffy finished, hoping that made any sense. That's why you're so much stronger even if you look like a brat. Zoro joked and Luffy laughed. Sure, why not? He agreed and a peaceful silence fell between them. Are you going to stick around here and wait for your grandfather? Zoro asked Luffy, who just laughed. Who knows, it's kind of fun being away from them. I've never really had any friends outside my family before, so this is fun. He said, giving Zoro a toothy grin that made the teenager smile. I would have thought you'd have lots of friends. Zoro said to Luffy, who dropped his smile even slightly. People don't like those who are strong. Even as a kid I've always been a bit stronger than normal kids, so no one wanted to play with me, Luffy said sadly before looking up at Zoro. We're friends, right? He asked, hesitation in his voice. You first asked me to join your crew and now you're asking if we're friends. Zoro scoffed, looking at Luffy. Of course we're friends, idiot. I wouldn't have agreed to join if I wasn't your friend. Also, I'm not afraid of you and your strength. He said, looking away, leaving Luffy to feel light-hearted and happy. Don't you have any friends here? He asked, realizing that Zoro had only spent time with him. Once, but not anymore. He said softly, thinking back on his rival and closest friend, while Luffy frowned. That's sad. He said, but smiled once again. You have me now though, so we're not alone. Zoro just shook his head but returned the smile. Right, sure. He said as both enjoyed the sun. With Garp. Where are you brats? He yelled over the transponder snail, annoyed that they should have been there by now but weren't. Ace got hungry. Sabo sighed, but he too was hungry, and when a D gets hungry, nothing gets in the way of them and their food, not even a missing brother. You were supposed to be here 5 hours ago, kid. Garp yelled again, and Sabo sighed once more. We're at the Barati, can't you just pick Luffy up and come here? Sabo asked, annoyed as Ace stuffed his face, wasting all the money they had on them. It would be faster for me to come straight to you. I had planned to stop off at the island where Luffy is to get you properly trained in using a sword, but that will have to wait. I'll call the man and have him get Luffy to come to us. Garp said, and Sabo frowned. You do realize Luffy has no sense of direction and I hate swords. I'm happy with my pipe, thank you very much. Sabo said to Garp, who just laughed. Well, we'll train you in the use of the sword another time, I guess. He said, and Sabo felt his brow twitch in annoyance. When Garp hung up on the brats, he called the dojo keeper to tell him his plan. With Ace and Sabo. Ace was stuffing his face, sure he felt bad about not rushing to get Luffy, but he figured that since Luffy has been found and safe, he can take a deep breath. All the stress since Luffy disappeared had really caused him to worry. When Ace gets worried, he forgets to eat, and now that he isn't as worried, he wants as much food as possible. This food is so good. He said happily between mouthfuls as Sabo just gave him a look. Yeah, and it cost us a lot too, bastard. He pouted and Ace smiled as he continued to eat. It's a nice place here. Ace complimented and Sabo sighed. We should be going after Luffy, not sitting here eating. He glared at Ace, who began to swear. I don't know about you, but Marco's anger was enough to build an appetite. I'm starving, Sabo. Sabo had every thought to flip the table and drag Ace back to the mini boat they had stolen from their grandfather. If he goes missing again trying to get to us, I'm not saving your ass for Marco. He threatened and Ace paled, causing Sabo to smile, glad he got at least that from his brother. You wouldn't really give me to Marco, would you? Ace asked hesitantly, putting his fork down, and Sabo smirked from under his top hat. Watch me. Back with Luffy. What do you mean I got to meet them somewhere else? Luffy was having fun here with his new friend and first Nakama. Your grandfather wants you to go to the Barati where apparently your brothers are waiting for you. The man said, and Zoro raised a brow. You have brothers here with you? Zoro asked and Luffy nodded. Yeah, my 2 older brothers came with me on this trip. Zoro nodded, accepting it. Looks like I have to go, Luffy said, not that happy about leaving. We'll meet again. Zoro said, giving his hand to the boy captain in the making. When I'm 17 I'll meet you here. Luffy said, grabbing his hand in agreement. Then we'll set sail. They grinned at one another before letting each other's hand go. The dojo master had a small smile on his face at the exchange. Luffy waved goodbye as he was taken towards the docks. Are you sure you'll find your way? The man said, and Luffy smiled. Nope, but I'll try. The man felt bad for Garp having a grandson with no directional skills, but then again he had a student much worse than this boy. The man headed back to his dojo as Luffy was looking to pick out a small boat he could borrow when he saw the one person he thought had already left. "Oi! Nami!" he shouted at said girl who turned quickly in surprise. "Luffy?" she said, not expecting to run into him again. "I thought you'd left by now," he said to her, and she smirked. "I was at the town close by making some exchanges," she said cautiously. Why would you do that?" he asked her, but she turned away. "Nah, can you give me another lift?" he asked her with his puppy eyes. "Depends, how much are you willing to pay me?" she asked him, a dark shadow over her eyes. "I thought I already did with the crown," he said confused, but she put her hands on her hips and shook her head. "That was for saving your life and bringing you here. I expect more for this other job," she said to him, and he frowned. "My grandpa is a vice admiral. I'm sure he has something to give you if you bring me to him," Luffy said, and belly signs filled her eyes. "The vice admiral, you said? Alright, fine, get in. If I don't get anything from this, I'll take your head. Sound fair?" she asked sweetly, and he laughed. "Yup." The pair set off into the sea. They were silent for a little while, but finally neither could take it anymore. "Why did you ask me to take you? Why not just go yourself?" she finally asked, and Luffy tried to think about it. "I'm not good at directions, and the way I learned how to sail the sea is very different here than it is back home." "Where are you from exactly?" She knew his grandfather was high in the marine ranks, so he could be from anywhere. "The Grand Line," he said simply, but her eyes widened. "That place is called the Pirates' Graveyard," she screeched at him, and he laughed. "It usually is. If you're not strong enough, you'll die," he said simply, laughing more as she paled. "And you were born there?" she asked him, and he shrugged. "I actually don't know where I was born, I just know I've been there my whole life." She frowned at him, realizing that he had probably been a traveler his whole life. "So where are we going, Captain?" she said sarcastically to lighten the mood, but his eyes lightened in a way she didn't think they could. "The Barady is where my gramps will be," he said, and she nodded. "You're lucky I know where that is. That restaurant is about an hour's trip from my home island," she said, looking out over the water, and he grinned. "Maybe you can show me around." He laughed, but she glared at him. "You stay away from there." He stopped laughing to finally look at her. "Nami," he said, and she looked away from him. "Stay away please," she said, and he said nothing. "Why do you like money so much?" he asked her after a while's time. "That's a secret. But with money you can buy anything and everything," she said, and he watched her closely. "Money won't buy you freedom," he said simply, and her eyes widened. "And what would you know about that?" she yelled at him, but he shook his head. "Freedom can't be bought but can easily be taken. I hate people who take freedom," he said. She just stared blankly at him, her hand resting on her shoulder that was covered by her t-shirt. "Spoken like a true Marine." She smiled, and he shook his head. "I'm not going to be a Marine. I'm going to be the king of the dot," he began to shout, but she stood up in the boat, a smile on her face. "It's the Barady." She pointed out in the distance a large fish-shaped ship, and Luffy forgot what he was even talking about as he smiled at the place. "My brothers are there," he said, and she looked at him. "How do you know?" she asked him seriously. "I can feel them." He closed his eyes and could sense the familiarity of his big brothers. "What, how?" She couldn't feel anything but the wind and the sea. "My brothers and I have been training in observation. I'm not that fantastic at it yet, but I am getting there," he said, happy to talk about his training. "You can sense your brothers a wide space away but can't navigate at all." She scoffed at him, making him cross his arms and pout. "Like I said, the East Blue has different tides and feeling to it than back home," he said, making her laugh. "I have a feeling you'd still get lost back there as well." She smiled at him, and he smiled back. "That's why you'll navigate for me when I'm older," he said, simply, shocking her, then making her angry. "Look, just because I'm helping you doesn't mean I'll be your navigator," she said, a hint of anger in her voice. "But you're good at navigating, right?" he asked her, and she folded her arms and smirked. "The best you'll ever meet," she said proudly, and he nodded. "Then that's proof you're the only one I want to navigate my ship," he said, and her brow twitched. "Stupid. You're just a kid. Come back later and ask," she said, not really meaning it, but it was a promise made in his mind. "Fine, I will." She didn't take him seriously though. "Boy. Is that Luffy?" a boy in a top hat said once they got close enough to the Barady. "Who's that idiot?" Nami asked, and Luffy smiled. "That's my big brother," he whispered, and she rolled her eyes. "Figures." But she was smiling as well. When they got to the Barady, Sabo helped pull Luffy out from the boat. Nami jumped out on her own and smiled at them. Ace had decided to join them since Sabo had already paid the bill. "Looks like this is goodbye again," she said to Luffy, who nodded. "Only for a while, I'll be back," he said, and Sabo looked between them, then at Ace, who wasn't smiling anymore. Garp was late as ever, so Luffy nudged Sabo to empty out the rest of his wallet for the lady, who grinned wickedly while the blonde brother growled at them both. "Nami. I'll be back when I'm 17. Wait for me until then." He shouted at her, who just rolled her eyes. "No guarantees, kid." And she waved before jumping back down into the boat and setting sail, a warm feeling in her chest. "So mind telling me who that was?" Ace asked, still shocked that Luffy was even talking to a girl. "That's Nami, and she's going to join my crew," Luffy said, walking into the restaurant. "Since when have you been thinking of a crew?" Sabo asked, worried about how the others would take the knowledge back home. "Since I met Zoro," he said, and both raised a brow. "Since you met who?" Ace asked, never hearing that name before. "Zoro, my best friend and first crewmate," he said with a wide grin that his brothers didn't share. "Sounds like you had an adventure." A loud booming voice said above him before a fist crashed into Luffy's skull. "Damn it, Grandpa," Luffy said, grabbing his head in agony before Garp brought his fist down onto Ace and Sabo's head as well. "What the hell, Gramps?" Ace yelled at the man who glared at them. "You boys think you can do whatever you please?" he asked them, looking rather scary at that moment. "We're sorry," Luffy said to the man who glared at him. "And you, if you ever pull a stunt like that again, I'll tie you to the bed at night," he said, and Luffy gulped, looking up at his grandpa. "We almost had your damn family here in the East, brat," Garp said in anger, and Luffy looked confused. "Hops? Why would they come here?" he asked, thinking of how boring the sea had been until he met his friends. "The look for you, we kinda told Marco and Thatch you were missing," they said, and Luffy paled. "I'm dead, aren't I?" Luffy asked in a quiet voice. "Sorry, little brother, but this one is on you," Sabo said, knowing that they would need to get in touch with the family once more. "If you guys are done shouting, are you going to actually order something, shitty customers?" A man in a polished suit and blonde hair and swirly eyebrows, though one of his eyes was covered by his hair, asked them, a tray in his hand filled with glasses of water. "Ace said I already ate," Sabo said, glaring at Ace, who smiled. "I want meat," Luffy shouted as the waiter wrote down the order. "And you?" he asked, pointing to the old man. "Same thing," he said, and the man began to leave. "Nah, you didn't give us your name," Luffy shouted back at him, and he turned, rolling his eyes, but smiled. "I'm Sanji and welcome to the Barady, your shitty brat." The 5-year-old Luffy was just waking up from a nap when his stomach demanded him to find his big brother instantly to get his afternoon snack. Wandering the ship's deck, he found his brother staring out over the ocean's waves, a small gentle smile on his face and a dreamy look in his eyes. "Thatchy food?" Luffy demanded, pulling on the man's white pressed coat, making the man turn his brown eyes down to the little boy. "Did you have a good rest, Lou?" Thatch asked the boy, picking him up and sitting him on the railing. Man, I dreamt that Ma was secretly a pineapple," Luffy said happily, making the man laugh loudly. "You never know, kid, he just might be," Thatch said, trying to hold back more laughter as Luffy's eyes widened. "We need to tell him then," Luffy said, seriously worried that Marco didn't know he was actually a living pineapple. "I think he's fine, kid." Thatch chuckled as Luffy began to pout. "Stingy?" Luffy looked up at Thatch, who was looking back at the sea. "What ya thinking about?" Luffy asked him, and Thatch smiled once again. "Lulu, have you ever heard of the All Blue?" "So how was your adventure?" Garp asked the kid, who was stuffing his face with meat, happy to have such good food around him. It was fun," he said, happily thinking of Zoro and Nami. Luffy had always had brothers but never friends. "You made a friend?" Sabo asked hesitantly, and Luffy stopped eating as a grin filled his face. "My best friends?" Sabo wasn't sure how he felt about that. Luffy had always been just his and Ace's, they had never had to share him before with anyone. Marco doesn't count. "What are they like?" Ace asked, feeling much the same way as Sabo. "Well, you met Nami, she's pretty and smart. She saved me from the ocean when I fell in," Luffy said, and Garp laughed. "It appears that I missed out on a pretty girl." Ace looked at Sabo funny before leaning over towards him. "If Marco ever finds out he's interested in a girl." Ace started, but Sabo elbowed him. "He never said he was interested." Sabo interrupted him, rolling his eyes. "Whatever, if Marco ever found out he's hanging out with a girl, he'd probably freak." Ace chuckled, knowing just how protective the man was. "She's a bit scary though." Luffy continued on, thinking of how angry she could get and greedy. "She loves money." Luffy finished thinking over Nami fully. "So that's why she demanded me to pay her." Sabo scowled, remembering how he gave her the rest of his cash. "Yeah, even though I gave her a crown already," Luffy exclaimed, and Ace's smile grew slyer. "Not interested, huh?" Sabo frowned slightly, knowing Marco wasn't going to like this at all. "What about your other friend?" Sabo asked, remembering Luffy said he had 2 new friends, and frankly he was tired of the girl talk already. His name is Zoro. He's really strong. Someday we're going to set sail," Luffy said happily, and Garp raised his brow. "Set sail? Where to?" Luffy he asked a boy who missed the danger in his voice. I'm going to meet Zoro on his island and we'll set sail to become pirates. Luffy said with a smirk, his eyes dancing dangerously before. Stop yapping, Brad, and eat up. I won't forgive any of you lot if anything's wasted. A man with a chef's suit and a high baker's hat said as he put his peg leg back down on the floor and pulled on his braided mustache. What the hell, old man? Luffy shouted, turning his neck like an owl towards the man that kicked him. Manners like that, I'd think you a pirate, kid. You're raising them wrong, Garp. The man said, turning his sharp eyes towards Garp, who crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. Ace, calm down. Garp said as Ace burned the tablecloth into ashes, his deep brown eyes sparking in anger. He hit Luffy. Ace snarled, his shoulder flaring up threateningly. People started to look and move away from the commotion. Technically he kicked him, but really it doesn't matter much either way. Sabo said, his hands black with Haki, ready to fight should he need to. Haki and a child that young? You may not be raising them right, but you're training them well. The chef master observed with a grin at the boy. He didn't train us like that. Luffy said in a dangerously flat voice. Pops and my brothers did. Luffy finished, turning his own hands black. We are the sons of Whitebeard. Ace proclaimed, making many whisper, putting their hands to their mouths in wonder and fear. Well, that's surprising, didn't know Newgate took kids in. The man said, curious as Garp had yet to say a word about this. He doesn't, we're the exception to the rules. Sabo said to the man who laughed. When you're a pirate, kid, there aren't any rules. He said to the three who smiled and nodded in agreement. Didn't expect you to become a decent man, Zeph. Garp said, turning his eyes towards the man who laughed. Found myself a nice eggplant to change my ways. Garp raised a brow in confusion before a plate was thrown at the chef's head. Zeph closed his eyes and dodged the plate and struck with awe. Ace didn't move, causing the plate to hit the fire user in the face before breaking on the floor. You burned down the tablecloth. Sanji said, returning to the table. It was an accident. Sabo said, putting his hands up in front of him in defense. This won't be. Ace snarled, lifting his gula kid. Zeph said, kicking Ace in the chest, knocking him back into his chair. That cloth cost a lot of cash. And I even hand-picked it out myself, you shitty customer. Sanji said, kicking the now sitting Ace across the head only for his foot to go through. But the Sanji said, losing his footing as Ace brought his hand up, grabbed the kid's leg and pulled him forward as he lost his footing, hitting the floor with a thud. Aloja, I expected as much with those flames. Zeph said, eyeing Ace now, who glared at the blonde that was glaring right back. Mind explaining what Aloja is, you shitty old man? Sanji asked as he stood up, glaring daggers at Ace, while Luffy laughed. Maybe another time, brat. Zeph said offhandedly, making Sanji growl in anger. Your brat's eaten all of the food, I hope you don't mind. He said as Ace and Sabo turned to look at the empty table in front of them. When the hell did he do that? Sabo groaned, knowing very well that it was because they took their eyes off their meals. Luffy, I was still eating all that. Ace yelled at the boy who laughed. Next time you better be faster then. He said, and Ace's brow twitched under his orange hat. You really ate all of that? Sanji asked, his visible eye wide in shock. My big brother told me never to waste food, so I don't. Luffy shrugged and Sanji felt a smile come to his face. Was it? Nope, it was my big brother Thatch. Luffy said softly, thinking back on his big brother, wondering how he was doing. Commander Thatch, so you really are Whitebeard sons? Zeph said. Luffy nodded, but Garp sighed. It's best we have this conversation elsewhere. We're scaring the customers away and I don't really want them to have a bounty on their heads yet. Garp said, standing up, signaling the boys to do so as well. Boy, old timer, you know a lot about pirates. Luffy asked once they were upstairs away from the restaurant. That's because this guy was once one. Garp said, sitting on a chair in the room watching the man carefully. Luffy sat down beside Sanji by the window and Ace and Sabo leaned up against a wall. Sanji turned and looked at Luffy carefully. The boy didn't look strong, but really neither did he, and he could still kick you through 3 walls. Are you really actually a pirate? Sanji asked him, and Luffy smiled, standing up and removed his shirt, showing his tattoo. That's Pop's mark. I'm his son, but I won't always be on his crew. Luffy said, and Zeph smirked, liking the kid's attitude. We're staying. I'm quite happy being on his ship. Sabo said, and Ace nodded his head, agreeing. You're all wrong. I'm going to make you 3 into fine marines. Garp shouted at them and they shouted their disagreements right back. Nah, what's your dream? Luffy asked Sanji as he kicked his feet back and forth on the chair he was sitting on. Sanji stood up, walking away from the crowd of people, frowning, his hair overshadowing his eyes. That's none of your business, shithead. He said and slammed the door behind him. Damn brat. Zeph sighed, guilt filling his heart. What's his problem? Ace scowled, not liking the teenager much. I like him. Luffy said, jumping up and following Sanji out the door. That doesn't mean he likes you. Ace scowled as the door slammed behind Luffy, his laughter the last they heard as it shut. He's not going to leave the kid be, is he? Zeph asked and Sabo sighed. Once Luffy decides something, his stubbornness rivals one of the emperor's. Sabo sighed. But the eggplant needs that. Zeph said softly, watching the door, and Garp's eyes softened at those words, knowing how children can change a man. Luffy chased Sanji to the restaurant's railing where the blonde was leaning over and smoking a cigarette. Should you really be smoking? Luffy asked Sanji, who nearly dropped his smoke in surprise. Shut up. You scared me, shitty bastard. He scowled, gaining control of himself, and began inhaling and smoke and letting it out. Sorry. But I heard smoking's bad for you. Luffy said, simply remembering what others have told him. Yeah, well, who cares? It relaxes me. Sanji said, ignoring the light filling Luffy's eyes. So smoking is good then? He asked curiously with excitement, and Sanji felt a sweat drop on his head. Well, probably not, he said, and Luffy tried to think about it. I'll ask Marco later if it would be okay or not. Luffy said, making a mental note, or at least trying to. There was a moment of silence between them as they looked over the sea. You never did tell me what your dream was. Luffy said to him, and Sanji sighed loudly. I said it wasn't any of your business. He said angrily to the boy, who shook his head. Of course it's my business. Luffy replied with a bit of heat. And why is that? Sanji said, turning towards him. I have my reasons. Luffy said, crossing his arms and smirking at Sanji, who frowned, taking another drag on his smoke. Shitty brat. Sanji smirked back at him before watching the waves crash against the ship in silence once again. I wish I knew how to fish properly. Luffy complained, watching a fish jump out of the water, causing Sanji to laugh. Maybe if you ask that shitty chef, he might teach you. Sanji snickered to Luffy, who pouted. My brother Thatch said that only special fish can be caught in places, so there's so much food I've missed out on. Luffy said dramatically to Sanji, who smiled. I wish I could try all the fish in one spot instead of having to wonder what they might taste like. He sighed, flopping his upper body over the railing, causing his straw hat to fall down his back. Do you only ever think about food? Sanji asked in wonder, but smiled at the kid, who pulled himself together. I think of other things like. Well, it doesn't matter. Luffy pouted, puffing his cheeks out, causing Sanji to smirk. Point proven. He said sarcastically. Sanji said, looking back over the water, catching Luffy's attention, before turning to look at the straw-hatted boy with a wide smile. Have you ever heard of the All Blue? Have you ever heard of the All Blue? Sanji asked Luffy, who pushed himself onto the railing and crossed his legs, looking toward Sanji and smiling. Not really, my brother said it was a rumor, but not an actual place. Luffy said, and Sanji shook his head. It's a real place. I can feel it in my soul. Sanji said, his smile soft now as he looked out over the sea. What is the All Blue then? Luffy asked him, and Sanji's eyes brightened and his smile grew. Sanji took a drag on his cigarette and let it go before began his tale to the straw-hatted kid. Luffy listened to every detail given, since it was more of a story than what Thatch had said. The All Blue is every chef's dream. A place where all fish meet. He said happily, almost dreamily, and Luffy smiled at him, looking Sanji over closely. Let's be friends. Luffy said seriously to Sanji, who gave a weird frown. You're not a lady. He said, and Luffy almost fell off of the railing. Of course I'm not. Luffy said, annoyed. Fine. Sanji agreed, but tried to keep his smile off his face. From the window above, Ace was annoyed. Luffy was making friends right, left and center. It's not like he didn't want Luffy to make friends, it was just it felt weird. Luffy, who would normally follow him and Sabo around, was starting to distance himself away, and it hurt a little for them. Ace also didn't like that blonde guy quite yet after the stunt he pulled with his kicks. Ace felt he would need to test him before he chose to trust the man. It's rare to see my eggplant that happy. Zeph said, watching Sanji and Luffy talk, but a smile was on his face. Luffy has that way with people, Sabo said, knowing from personal experience. He must get it from me. Garp laughed as Ace and Sabo side-eyed him, giving the old man a weird look. I highly doubt it, Garp. Zeph said, rubbing the back of his head, leaving the room and its occupants behind. Why are we still here, Gramps? Ace asked Garp, who sighed. It's been a long day, let us stay the night, then we'll leave in the morning. He said, not answering Ace's question, causing the teenager to scowl. Fine, but we're leaving the moment the sun rises. He said, storming out of the room, leaving a very confused Sabo there, wondering why Ace was so angry. Sanji liked having a person who didn't laugh at his dream around. This kid had accepted him and his dream without any laughter or name-calling. Sanji felt happy to be with this kid, even if he'd never admit it, but his duties to the restaurant came first. Sanji did try to get away from the boy, only to have him follow Sanji into the kitchen and watch him work. You're a really good chef, aren't ya? Luffy asked, and Sanji smirked as the meal he was preparing caught flames. Damn straight I am. Someday I'll be the best chef this world will ever see. He said cockily, and Luffy laughed. Did you make our meals before? Luffy was curious since the food he ate was absolutely delicious. I did, that's why I'm glad you ate it all. Sanji remembered how the kid ate every piece of food on the table, barely leaving the bones behind. I will never waste food. Thatch said that food is important on a ship since out on the open waters anything can happen. Luffy said, repeating after his older brother and the chefs that helped him back home. Your brother sounds smart, having no food and being away from anything and everything is the most painful thing to happen to someone. Sanji said, dazing off into the distance as he flipped the meal, added some sauce and put it onto plates for the customers. Thatch would like you. Luffy said with a wide smile on his face. Help me carry these out. Sanji said, but put out his hand to stop the boy quickly as drool began to form at the corners of his mouth. Without eating any of it, please, shithead. Sanji said, glaring at Luffy, who groaned. Taking a few plates, Luffy helped carry the food to the tables as carefully as possible since Sanji threatened their friendship should he drop a single plate. Luffy was never one for chores, in fact he hated them greatly, but if he was asked by a friend he would do anything, and surprisingly, he was having fun with Sanji. He was watching the guy flirt with girls and even threatening the men, but never once did he give a bad meal, even if he didn't like you. Luffy respected that about his new friend, even if he had his own ideas about you, he still gave you the proper food and the best service. Luffy had decided long before that Sanji would be his chef, now it was confirmed. They passed the day away like this until the evening where both boys were dead tired. Surprisingly, you were a great help today. Sanji said, sitting in a chair having a cigarette. It was a lot more fun than I thought it would be. Luffy agreed, but he knew it wasn't the chore that was fun, it was being with his friend. You boys did well today. Zeph said, placing some dishes in front of the boys. Here, eat. He said, and Luffy's eyes widened with excitement at the food in front of him. Thanks, Pops. He said before digging in. Sanji was watching the older man carefully. You're being nice, you shitty old geezer. He said, and Zeph laughed. You boys worked hard and the customers were satisfied, so I'm rewarding you, here. Zeph dropped a pair of tickets down in front of the boys. After you're done eating, go get dressed up. Sanji, I'm sure you can lend the boy some clothes. Zeph smiled and Sanji frowned, looking over at Luffy. What's this for? Luffy asked, looking at the tickets. The party will be happening this evening and you're both invited. Sanji will get you dressed up and you'll both be on your best behaviors. You're representing the Baratie. Zeph said, and Luffy felt excitement flow through him, he liked parties a whole lot. Awesome. But first I should call my brothers and let them know I'm alright. I probably scared them pretty badly, he said sadly, and Sanji frowned, not liking seeing the kid sad. Alright, fine, if I have to I'll let you wear one of my old suits. Meet me in my room in about an hour, it's just upstairs, and I'll fix you up, K. Sanji felt satisfied by the smile that returned to the kid's face as he stood up and bolted to find his brothers. It's almost as if you care about him, brat. Zeph said with a sly smile, making Sanji blush. Shut it, you shitty geezer. He's my friend. And Zeph smiled at those words. Luffy found Ace and Sabo playing cards out on the deck of the large ship and smiled when he raced up to them. Guys, let's call Ma and the others. Luffy said excitedly, and the boys paled at the thought. Did we ever tell Marco that Luffy was found? Sabo asked Ace quietly, who paled even more. No, I don't believe we did. He said softly, but Luffy was impatient. Come on guys, hurry up. He said, grabbing Sabo's bag and pulling the transponder snail from inside it. Wait, Luffy. We should talk more about this. Sabo yelled, but it was too late. Hello, this is Luffy and I'm going to be the king of the pirates. He shouted as the line picked up. The other side instantly laughed and cheered while others were growling. Luffy felt amazing to hear familiar voices. Hello Luffy, care to explain where you've been? Yoy, Marco said in a cold voice that brought shivers up many spines. I've been on a huge adventure, Ma. He shouted to Marco, missing the danger in the man's voice. One that somehow caused you to disappear for a few days. Thatch said, and Luffy laughed. Aren't those the best kind of adventures? A cry of no was shouted at him, causing him to laugh. How was your adventure, my son? Pop said, and Luffy smiled softly. I've made some friends. Luffy said, thinking of Zoro, Nami and now Sanji. You made some friends? Thatch asked in excitement, happy for the boy. Yeah, a swordsman, a navigator and now a chef. Luffy counted off happily but made a weird face. I still need to find a musician though. He said with determination, and Thatch laughed, then agreed with him. No crew is ever complete without one. He said, and all three boys nodded. Tell me about them. Thatch said, happy Luffy was making friends, remembering how Luffy had struggled as a child to do such a thing. Zoro is my best friend. I've never met anyone like him before. Nami is smart and saved my life, she saved me from the water when I fell in. And Sanji is an amazing chef. He might almost be as good as you, Thatch. He said, thinking about his friends and how much he missed being with them. Luffy, I'm not finished. Do you know how worried I was, Yoy? He interrupted, pulling Luffy from his thoughts, and Luffy did feel bad, but he didn't regret his time away meeting his friend. "But I'm safe, there's nothing for you to worry about," he said simply, and Marco growled. "Luffy, I'm far away from you, I was afraid that something had happened. You need to take care of yourself more, Yoi," he shouted, and Luffy flinched and frowned. "I'm a pirate, ma, I can't always be safe, things are going to happen and nothing can or will change that," Luffy said with a bit of heat. "And I found my best friends that way. My new family," he shouted in a bit of anger, and saw Marco flinch back on the snail's face. "I gotta go, Sanji and I are going to a party, I'll talk to you later," Luffy said, frowning and walking away, throwing the line to Ace, who was silent in shock. "He didn't mean anything by it," Sabo said quickly as Ace was still in shock. "I know he didn't, he's growing up so quickly. Sometimes it feels as if he doesn't need us anymore, Yoi," Marco said sadly, and Ace pulled himself back together, not liking that tone of voice Marco was using. "He'll always need you, Marco, and it's not just you he's pushing away, we'll be home soon and we can all talk about this better," Ace said, and Sabo nodded. "Sanji's a good guy. Luffy is making some good friends, so try not to worry that much," Sabo said, and a small smile came to Ace's face, knowing what he could do to lighten the mood. "Also, you know one of his new friends is a girl," Ace said, and heard a lot of sounds of snickering and pushing. "The girl? Do carry on," Aizu said, but sounded distant, so probably not holding the line. "Yeah, a pretty copper-haired girl. Apparently he even gave her a crown. No idea where he got one of those, but still," Sabo said, joining in. "Apparently we have much to talk about when you get back," Pop said, and knowing Marco, he was probably frozen with shock. "That we do for now, we'll try and keep our eyes on our little brother. Marco will call back as soon as possible, try not to get so worried, K," Sabo said, and hung up. They knew they needed to have with Luffy, but for now they'd watch him and protect him from afar. Luffy was angry that they didn't seem to trust him to make it on his own. Sure, he was clumsy and a bit distant-minded, but he was strong and he had people around him always that he could depend on should he need to. Sometimes Luffy felt as though when he turned 17, Marco was going to tie him to the mast of the Moby Dick and not let him go. "Stupid ma, I'll show him just how grown up I am," he said, heading toward Sanji's door to get ready to go to this party. Man, he hoped it'd be good. "I said an hour," Sanji said, leaning against his doorframe, a cigarette in his mouth, and Luffy scowled. "My brother's pissed me off," he said, pushing past Sanji, who sighed. "Well, come on in, I guess," he said, rolling his eyes as Luffy entered his room. Luffy sat down on the bed and crossed his legs, looking around the room. "You've got a neat bedroom," he said, never really seeing a house's room before. "Not really, it's pretty normal actually," he said, and Luffy shook his head. "I have my own cabin on the ship, but it's all wooden everywhere." He thought back to his home and felt a bit guilty for shouting at Marco. "Want to talk about why you're angry?" Sanji asked him while pulling clothes from his closet. "Nope," Luffy replied, and Sanji sighed before breathing in his cigarette. "Nah, can I have one of those?" Luffy asked Sanji, who tilted his head in confusion. "I want to try one of your cigarettes," he clarified, and Sanji's visible eye widened. "I think your brothers don't like me as it is," Sanji said, but didn't stop himself from giving the kid one of them and pulling his lighter from his pant pocket and passing it to Luffy. "How do I do this?" he asked, and Sanji sighed, showing Luffy what to do, and once he did showed him how to breath in the smoke and then to breath it out. Luffy, very inexperienced in this, held it in for too long and choked on it. Passing Sanji the burning cigarette, Luffy tried to catch his breath as his throat burned and his eyes watered. That was horrible. He got out, but his mouth felt dry and gross. Luffy never wanted to have another of those ever again. "You're not supposed to breathe in that much, shitty bastard," Sanji said, holding back a laugh. "Ugh, never again," he said as Sanji put out the cigarette. "Here, put these on." Sanji threw some clothes to Luffy, who looked at them carefully and frowned. "I don't know how to wear a suit," he said, and Sanji gave a small smile. "I'll help, I guess," he said as Luffy stripped his clothes and put the new ones on. Sanji helped put the tie around Luffy's neck and Luffy buttoned up the suit's jacket. "It's so tight, can't I just wear my t-shirt?" he whined, and Sanji growled at him. "No, you cannot. You heard that, old man, we're representing the restaurant," he snarled, and Luffy sighed. "Alright." Sanji looked the kid over and found his suit did look good on him, but he needed more. "Sit," he commanded, and Luffy did as he was told. Sanji brought down some styling gels and a brush, hoping to fight the kid's messy hair. "This might be cold, so be patient," he said, putting some of the gel onto Luffy's hair and mixing it through the black strands of hair. "What are you doing?" he asked Sanji, who was messing up the already messy hair to form a style of some sorts. "I'm making you look good so we can charm the ladies properly tonight," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on a cloth, smiling at his work. "Shall we go, Luffy?" Sanji asked, passing a mirror to the boy to look at himself. "Yeah, let's go have a party," he said, grinning, grabbing his hat off the table and following Sanji out into the night ready to have some fun. When Luffy and Sanji left their room, Ace and Sabo were leaning against a wall waiting for them. Luffy, in his dark black suit with a blue striped tie, looked a bit older than he was supposed to in the brothers' eyes, especially since he smelled of cigarette smoke and styling gel. "You look nice," Sabo said awkwardly and tried to smile as Luffy just smirked. Sanji helped. Ace growled quietly before scrunching up his nose. "Is that why you smell like smoke?" Ace asked, but his eyes were on the blonde who was just watching carefully. "No. It's not like I had a cigarette or anything, really. I didn't ask to try one," he said, turning his head to the side and whistling. Sanji lifted one of his curled brows up in surprise. Ace marched over and pulled on Luffy's face. "For all the trouble you've been giving me, I'm going to tell Marco about this," he said, his black eyes darkening as Luffy grew pale. "You wouldn't?" he whispered, and a small dark smile crossed Ace's face. "No, I won't. You will," he said and laughed as Luffy blanked out, not quite understanding Ace. "Boy Luffy, we need to go," Sanji said, putting his hands in his pockets and walking past the circus he called his new friend. "Yup, right," he said, following behind Sanji as Ace and Sabo crossed their arms. "Are we going to follow them?" Sabo asked, and Ace nodded as they both began to follow behind the boys. Luffy and Sanji had no problem getting into the party as they had tickets, but Ace and Sabo were stopped at the gate. "We're with those two," Ace said, pointing to Luffy and Sanji, who stopped and looked back at them. Sanji looked to Luffy, who gave a cocky grin. "Are they with us, Luffy?" Sanji asked him, a small smile on his face and a light in his eye. "Nope, not at all," he said before laughing and following Sanji into the party, officially leaving a shocked pair of brothers. "When we get our hands on him, he's dead," Ace said, smoke coming from his face. "Agreed," Sabo said, a blush of embarrassment on his face. "But we need to get into this party just in case." "We'll have to get creative then," Ace said, looking around, and Sabo grinned. "Well, if you don't mind, I think I have an idea." Luffy was laughing so hard with Sanji that was the first time he had ever done something like that. The look on their shitty faces. Sanji laughed and Luffy nodded. "I wish I had a camera that was amazing." He laughed out. Both boys smiled at one another before looking around, realizing they were being looked at. "Did we do something wrong?" Luffy asked quietly, his eyes narrowing, and even Sanji felt on edge. "It's one of these types of parties." He sighed and rubbed the back of his head. "What kind of parties? Aren't all parties the same?" Luffy asked, only ever experiencing the ones from back home. "There are many types of parties and it looks like we're a part of the shittiest kind right now." Sanji frowned, not liking the dullness of the party, but his heart leapt when he saw a beautiful lady in a slim black dress. "I'll be right back," he said, hearts filling his eyes as he rushed over to said lady's side and offered her a drink from one of the tables. "So if this is a bad party, then I'll just have to make it better, right?" Luffy smirked, remembering how much fun everyone could have if they sang and danced, but first he needed to fill up on some food. Luffy didn't have to look around for the food, his nose took him straight to it, and did it ever smell good. He filled up his plate with as much of everything as he possibly could and began to devour it all in minutes. A girl was watching him from the corner of the room and decided to approach him at this point in time. Luffy was too busy eating to care much of anything, so he didn't give her any of his attention. "Hey there, cutie, want to dance with me?" she asked and batted her long lashes towards him, pushing her golden hair out of her face slyly. Luffy was too interested in his meal to take much notice as he continued to eat. "Wow, you sure do have an appetite. I love a man who can eat," she said to him, but once more he completely ignored her as he started on his second plate. "Hey, stop eating and listen to me," she finally shouted at him, causing him to look up at her for the first time. "What's your problem, lady? Can't you see I'm eating?" Luffy scowled at her, and her mouth dropped slightly at his tone. "Don't you know who I am?" she snarled, and Luffy tilted his head with an annoyed expression on his face. "I don't care who you are. Leave me alone, won't ya?" he said, and she stomped on his foot before taking off. "What's her problem?" "Crazy lady," he said before picking up his fork again, only to get a black polished shoe to his face. "What the hell, Sanji?" Luffy shouted as he picked himself up off the ground to see a very angry chef. "Don't you ever insult a lady in front of me," he said to Luffy, who was just straight out confused. "It's not my fault. She wouldn't leave me alone," he said, only to get another face full of shoe. "Ladies always come first, shitty bastard." He pushed his foot further into Luffy's face until he was satisfied that the kid had got the message. "Damn, I need a smoke," Sanji said, annoyed all over again. "Is that why you're so cranky?" Luffy asked innocently, only to get a dark look from Sanji. "Bastard," he said as Luffy was now on the floor once again covered in shoe prints. "I'm sorry," he said, pulling himself back together. "Really, why did that old geezer send us to this shitty party? I'm not having any fun," Sanji said, taking a drink off the table. "Then why don't we liven it up? Luffy asked, looking up at Sanji from where he was kneeling down now. What do you have in mind? He asked, and Luffy grinned before loosening his tie. Just leave it all to me. He said, and Sanji raised a brow in confusion. Captain. He said sarcastically, but the smile that grew on Luffy's face was hard to miss. Meanwhile, previously with Ace and Sabo. You want me to dress up as a waiter? Ace asked Sabo incredulously, and Sabo nodded his head, happy to think of the idea. These suits should fit us, and if we act properly we can do it. Ace was still staring at the clothing, a frown on his face. I hate shirts, and this has a freaking tie and jacket. Ace scowled and Sabo's brow twitched. Of course that would be Ace's reason for not wanting to do this, it is shirts involved. Sabo was ready to beat Ace into submission, but didn't when Ace sighed, finally giving in on his own. If I wear this I can ensure that Luffy is okay, right? Ace said, and Sabo nodded. You know, we're almost as bad as Marco, he said, and Sabo laughed. We may be as bad as him, but I can guarantee we can't ever be worse. Sabo laughed, and Ace smiled, missing his brother, wondering what he would say if he saw Luffy acting like this. Let's get changed, we're wasting time, who knows what trouble he's gotten into by now. Ace said, and Sabo nodded as they both went to a room to change their clothes. Once this is all over you owe me a drink. Ace said after they had finished dressing. The waiter uniform was a simple black and white uniform with a black tie and a black apron around their waist. Oh come on, you don't look that bad. Sabo said, rolling his eyes, stepping out for Ace to see. Sabo looked much the same, but this time he had brushed his longer blonde hair back, so it waved more in the back and slicker in the front. Ace didn't care for change, so he left his hair into the messy style it always was. Why, you look fancy. Ace said, smirking at Sabo, who grinned. Shut up. He said, but it was filled with laughter. Geez, what are you guys doing? We're needed out on the floor, one of the guests is acting out of control. A waiter said, coming back to find Ace and Sabo talking. The guest is out of control. Sabo said, and Ace nearly face-palmed. We leave him for what, an hour, and he's already acting up. Ace was ready to drag the kid back to the Moby Dick and let Marco do all the lecturing he's probably been bottling up. The brothers didn't waste any time as they ran with the waiter to the party room to find Luffy on the dinner table with chopsticks in his nose and mouth doing a weird dance. Sanji was laughing on the floor as many of the other guests were leaning against someone laughing as well, or on a wall. Luffy was making a scene they would give him that, but really was it that unexpected? Who the hell taught him that? Sabo asked in disgust. For all the sibling we have, it could have been anyone. Ace said to his brother, but was trying not to laugh at the scene. Come and sing it with me. Making a delivery, bring it across the sea, bink sake in the hold as we sail through the breeze. Luffy sang happily out, and Ace couldn't stop the instant reflex as he continued. Far across the eye can see the sun is shining merrily as the birdie fly in the sky as they sing out with glee. Ace sang and Sabo smiled, finishing it. Bid adieu to everyone as we sail under the sun, sailing on from dusk till dawn and singing out as one. Cross the gold and silver waves, changing into water sprays, sailing out on our journey to the ends of the sea. Sabo sang and Luffy's eyes brightened, but he didn't recognize them as his brothers since they were wearing different clothes and Sabo's hair was different. Yeah, like that. And before anyone knew it, people were singing and Sanji was laughing before he tried to sing along as well. Zeph was leaning at the door and smiling, not having heard this song in a long time. That brat coming in and making the party his own. Zeph said, and Garp walked beside him and smiled. You knew something like this might happen. Garp crossed his arms but still smiled at the scene. I figured that the kid could cause some sort of commotion, yes. This is a rowdy restaurant and fancy people tend to bring that reputation down. I needed something to keep me in business and you came along with that brat. Zeph said but smiled wider. Glad we could help. Garp said sarcastically, rolling his eyes. I'll give you a complimentary breakfast for it. Zeph laughed and Garp left a small smile on his face. You'll probably poison it, pirate. Luffy's charm and brightness had completely taken over the party, and even though a few had left in anger, many had stayed to enjoy the change. Luffy was able to take a boring atmosphere and make one of fun and laughter. Sanji was amazed by this, that one boy put himself out there, not caring about the looks, giggles and even rude comments made to him. Luffy was all show and tell, he didn't hide himself from anyone, he was who he was and didn't care what other thought of him. By the end of the night, Sanji admired the boy, though he would never say it out loud, no matter how many beautiful ladies asked him. There was nothing to worry about, was there? Sabo asked Ace, who had a soft smile on his face. No, there really wasn't. He sighed and Sabo gave him a sympathetic look. Maybe we've all be a little hard on him, it's easy to forget that he's growing up. Sabo said and Ace nodded. We need to trust him and his friends. Ace said, looking at the blonde who was passing a drink over to Luffy. Ace knew the drink was filled with alcohol, but figured he'd deal with the mess later. I don't care what you say, I'm not letting him drink. Sabo said, standing up and walking over to the little group. That belongs to me. Sabo said, snatching the drink out of Luffy's hand before he could touch the glass to his lips. Wait, don't do it. Luffy shouted, reaching his hand out to stop the waiter from taking a drink from the glass, only to be too late. When the liquid hit Sabo's lips he felt the burn. What the hell is this? He shouted and Sanji laughed. I call it the flames of the heart. It's a spicy drink with no alcohol. I just invented it right now. Sanji said, watching the waiter, his eyes narrowing. Hey, aren't you Luffy's brother? Luffy looked closer at the man, his head tilted. Really? Luffy asked, squinting his eyes before widening them. Sabo. What are you doing here? Luffy asked and Sabo rolled his eyes. Ace and I've been here a while. He said and could swear his lips were going numb. Just what kind of spice were you using in this? Sabo asked the teenager seriously and Sanji told him the list of pepper oils he put in it, causing Sabo to pale. And you were going to give that to Luffy? He shrieked and Luffy laughed. I asked him to. Luffy laughed more and Sabo closed his eyes, regaining his calm. I'll let Ace deal with you, I'm done. He said, standing up from the table and leaving. Seriously, what's people's problem today? Luffy asked, annoyed. Who knows? Sanji laughed as Ace come over. What's wrong with Sabo? Ace asked them and Luffy smiled up at Ace. He drank the spicy drink. Ace just looked at him confused. He did the what? Ace asked and Luffy laughed some more. Shishishi, he drank the drink Sanji made. It was supposed to be for me, but Sabo drank it all. It was super spicy. Ace rolled his eyes. The party's ending, Lou, let's go find Sabo. He said, but Luffy didn't move. I'm having a sleepover with Sanji, I'll be back in the morning before we leave. Luffy said and Ace had to hold himself together so he didn't just grab the boy and drag him back to their room. It's fine, my room is big enough for us. He's going to sleep on a mattress on the floor, I get the bed. It's not a big deal or anything. Sanji said, shrugging his shoulders. See? I'm fine, I'll see you tomorrow. Luffy said and Ace accepted it, following behind Sabo, knowing everything would be okay. Thanks, Sanji. Luffy said and Sanji shrugged. No big deal, everyone needs space from their family every once in a while. He said as him and Luffy stood up, saying goodbye to the people they had actually taken the time to talk to. Both boys got back to Sanji's room, changed and washed their hair of the gels before throwing on their pajamas. Luffy flopped down on his bed and Sanji on his. Do you have any family, Sanji? Luffy asked softly and Sanji turned his head towards Luffy. No, just the shitty geezer. He said and Luffy smiled. That's family. He said and Sanji smiled. I guess so, even if it is shitty. Luffy smiled softly, he had had a good night. Sanji, thanks. He said, closing his eyes and slowly falling asleep. No problem. He said, knowing he was talking about the night because he himself had a good time with his friend. Once the morning came, Luffy would be off again on a new adventure and Sanji didn't know if they'd meet again, so he was going to cherish this time while he could. Marco was anxious and it was clear to see. Since the moment the brothers had left, Marco had felt the winds of change blowing through and frankly, they were rather cold. Something had been nagging him in the back of his mind that things were about to change. Lighten up, buddy. Thatch said, throwing an arm around Marco's shoulders, but Marco couldn't, something was weird. They'll be fine, have faith in them and in Garp. Vista said to Marco as well, but once again Marco couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. That was when they first left a month and a half ago. Now Marco knew his suspicions on change were correct. He said he has a new family now, Yoi. Marco said to Thatch when no one was near. Sometimes he felt more secure just talking with the chef. He's 14, Marco, don't you remember what you were like at 14? Thatch asked him and he shook his head. No, not really, that was a very long time ago, Yoi. Thatch didn't miss the sadness on Marco's face or in his voice at all. Well, I do. And let me tell you, I was the worst little shit you'd ever meet. Thatch said and Marco smiled. I don't doubt it, Yoi. Marco laughed quietly and Thatch tried to hide his smile with feigned anger. And what's that supposed to mean? He asked, showing shock, but Marco saw the grin and couldn't stop himself from grinning back. He's also making friends, Marco, and that's a good thing, last time I checked. Thatch reminded him. I knew he could, Luffy can make friends of anyone if he wanted to. He was just too young to know how, Yoi. Marco remembered the sadness Luffy had over not having friends and it still broke his heart. One of them is a girl. Thatch smiled and Marco rolled his eyes. Luffy's never been interested in girls, Yoi. Marco said as if pointing out the obvious and Thatch just laughed. He's 14, Marco, he may not have been interested before, but he might be now. He said and Marco paled at the thought. I'm not ready for this conversation, Thatch, Yoi. Marco said, putting his face in his hands, trying to keep calm. Maybe that can be a conversation for Pops. Thatch said, not really wanting to have that conversation with Luffy either or really any of the brothers. If we ever need to have it, Yoi. Marco said and Thatch laughed. He may be young, but he is still a man. Marco, he'll need it, and Ace is apparently interested in girls now as well from what we've learned. Marco tried to drown Thatch out at this point in time. We'll deal with that when the time comes, Yoi. He said, and Thatch laughed loudly. Sounds like a plan, brother. Thatch missed the brats like crazy, even if he wasn't as down as Marco. The ship was loud as ever, but it felt almost empty. Luffy's presence had been a major part of the ship for many years, and to feel it gone now was saddening. He missed Ace's quirks and protectiveness as well as Sabo's intelligence and quick thinking. It's quite here, Yoi. Marco said, listening to the waves as stars started to appear in the sky. I'm almost bored half the time without my pranking masters. Thatch agreed in his own way. I just want them home, Yoi. Marco whispered. We all do, only 2 more weeks and we'll have them back home safe. Thatch knew Marco would become even more protective of the boys, but he wouldn't stop it. After all, their time with Luffy was running out if the kid planned to leave at 17. Am I selfish to want them home now, Yoi? Marco asked, and Thatch leaned back from where he was sitting beside Marco and looked up at the sky as more stars had appeared. We're pirates, we're allowed to be selfish, Marco. Then I want them home now, Yoi. Was all that needed to be said. Night was upon them and somewhere in the east blue they knew their brothers were hopefully sleeping safe. Sanji had to get up early to help the chefs get breakfast ready and the restaurant opened for regular customers, so Luffy got up with him. Luffy was used to getting up rather early since he liked to be there when Thatch started breakfast, so this was nothing new to him. You know you can always sleep in a bit more. Sanji said since the alarm clock did say it was just past 5:30 am, though Luffy just shook his head in defiance. And miss out on the freshest breakfast possible? Never. He said, and Sanji couldn't help the small smile as he lit up a cigarette and inhaled a deep breath before letting the smoke out. Whatever works for you, I guess. He said, and Luffy cheered at the thought of Sanji's amazing food. Luffy followed Sanji down to the kitchens and watched them all get ready for work. Luffy liked watching them, they all had this way of knowing where they all were while working. Whether that is from observation hockey or just being with one another for so long, Luffy didn't know. Sanji had told him that many of the chefs in this restaurant had once been pirates, so he wondered if they knew his pops at all. You sure you don't want to go back to bed? Sanji called over to Luffy, who was daydreaming at one of the baking tables. Nope, this feels like home. He said, and Sanji raised one of his finely curled brows up in confusion. I used to watch my brother cook breakfast in the mornings. He said, simply shrugging his shoulders, and Sanji smiled as well as a few of the other chefs. Are you good in the kitchen at all, kid? One of them called over to Luffy, who laughed loudly. My brother said I'm good at eating, does that count? He asked and got a round of laughter. But he still lets you watch? Sanji asked, flipping finished pancakes onto a warm plate. He figured if he fed me first others might get to eat. Luffy said, remembering how Thatch would make extra plates for him in the kitchen while making breakfast for the family. You've got a patient family, kid. One said, and Luffy smiled. I've got the greatest family. Sanji didn't say anything on that due to the fact that he wasn't sure Luffy wanted everyone to know what family he was from. Ace and Sabo had woken up around 9 and made their way to breakfast, yawning and stretching. While Sabo had dressed himself back into normal clothing, Ace had decided to just throw on some random shorts and boots, leaving his upper half bare for the world to see. Sanji saw them come in and his brow twitched in annoyance before he flipped another pancake off the pan and whipped it straight into the fire user's face. I normally like my pancakes on a plate served with syrup. Ace said, eating the pancake, but a tick on his forehead from the fact he had one thrown at him. Didn't you see the sign, you shitty bastard? No shirt, no shoes, no service. Sanji said, pointing to said sign and glaring fiercely at the man. After all, only he was allowed to get the ladies' attention like that. One day I'm going to kill that cook, Ace said as he turned around going to grab one of the dreaded shirts. You better go pack your things, Lou, we're leaving shortly. Sabo said and watched the light drain from Luffy's face. We're leaving? He asked softly, and Sanji gave a small sad smile. What? You don't want to go on another adventure? He asked Luffy, who turned towards his new friend in shock. Of course I do. He shouted, and Sanji smiled. Then go get ready, I'll have breakfast packed up for you for when you go. He said, and Luffy smiled brightly before bolting from the room after Ace to pack what was lying around. Thanks. Sabo said to the cook, who waved it off. Food is the only way to get him to do anything. Sanji said with a knowing smile before turning back to his plate of food, passing it up for bring out. Sabo smiled at the man, surprised that in the short amount of time Luffy has spent with him a strong bond had been formed. Luffy packed quickly with Ace's welcomed help and the boys were standing by the marine ship ready to go. Here. Sanji said, throwing packed breakfast at the three brothers. Make sure you eat it all. If I find out even a crumb is wasted, I'll kick all of your shitty asses. Sanji said, and Luffy and Sabo thanked him. Ace looked at the pack before taking a step towards the cook and sticking out his hand. You're a real bastard, you know that, right? Ace smirked and Sanji took the hand. You're worse, shithead. They smiled at one another, accepting each other for the first time. Sanji. When I turn 17 I'll be back, so don't go anywhere. Luffy called while boarding the ship, waving goodbye. It's not like I planned to leave here. He said, but happy to know he'd see the boy again. When they got inside the ship, the first thing they noticed was that Garp was gone and a new guy stood before them. Where's Gramps? Luffy asked, looking around the guy who blew out a lot of smoke. Your grandfather has been called back to the Grand Line for a short while. I will be staying with you until he returns. The man said, looking down at the boys carefully while he walked around them. My name is Smoker. He said, and Luffy tilted his head. But that's what you are? He asked, thinking of how Sanji was called a smoker for smoking. Smoker felt a headache coming on from this group of kids, especially the youngest one. That's not the point, brat. Your grandfather will be back shortly. We are to finish gathering supplies at the nearest island and meet him at the entrance to the Grand Line. Smoker said, and the boys looked at one another. Nah, Smokey, why aren't we just going to go through the Comthingy with all the yummy sea kings? Luffy asked, and Smoker felt a tick appear on his head. Because it's your grandfather's decision, kid. I'm just babysitting you until he gets back. Smoker said, smoking his 2 cigars. That's not fun. Luffy said, pouting and putting his hands behind his head, walking off away from the marine. So we're going up Reverse Mountain? Sabo asked the marine, who didn't expect the brat to know the mountain's name. I'm not going with you, I'm stationed here in the East Blue. Your grandfather will be meeting you just after we gather supplies. It's not like he went far back into the Grand Line. For all Smoker knew though was that Garp had been called about scaring some of the weaker new pirates away from an island. So you're saying we get 3 days away from the old geezer? Ace asked, a smile forming on his face at the very thought of being away from the old man. That's Vice Admiral Garp, brat. Smoker said, crossing his arms and glaring down at the kid. Yeah, I know, and we're getting about 2 days free without training. Ace said in excitement, and Sabo couldn't help but smile as well. Garp had been training him to use his pipe properly, and he could even coat it with hockey now, which was a lot handier than sea stone. Ace had better control of his movements, where he would stumble before Garp had balanced him. Garp had shown Ace all of his blind spots and made sure to hit them each and every time so he would protect them better. Garp had also reminded Ace as often as possible that even though he was a Loja, they could still get hurt and even die. Ace had scoffed at his grandfather, claiming that he was strong, until Garp had knocked the kid to the ground and held him there. Ace understood now, since that time, a Loja that thinks himself invincible is the first to get themselves killed. Ace would never underestimate the old man ever again. After all, he had earned his title, even if he was a geezer. Luffy was looking out over the water, silently saying goodbye to his new friend as the restaurant grew further and further away from them. Sighing, Luffy would miss his time here, which was something he didn't think would happen. When he originally came here, he only thought of getting stronger with his brothers and bonding with his grandpa, but now he wanted to be with his friends. When he closed his eyes, he could see Zoro training with that shark grin he wore. He could see Sanji cooking in the kitchen, damn, he could even smell the delicious food. He could hear Nami's bossy calls as she kept her eyes on the horizon, just in case they needed to change direction. Luffy could feel the warmth that came from those people, and he craved it, all of it. He wanted nothing more than to be with his nakama, but he knew it wasn't yet time. He still needed to grow more, train more, become stronger, so that no one disappeared from him ever. He knew the trials of the new world, and he knew that the kids he had met weren't quite ready for them. He could only hope that in 3 years' time they'd be even a little bit ready for paradise. If they were going to survive in paradise and even the new world, he'd need around 10 crewmates to help him. Luffy had always had hundreds of siblings, but this time he only wanted a small family to call his own. Right, now I just need to find my musician. Luffy said to the wind as it blew against his hat, making it bend ever so slightly in the breeze, causing him to grab hold of it. Within hours, Luffy had complained enough about wanting a new adventure that Smoker had commanded the ship stop at the closest island to allow the boy to let off some of his energy. That'll never happen, you know. Sabo said, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. What won't, Blondie? Smoker asked, blowing smoke out from his cigars. Letting Luffy to lose some of his energy, the kid's filled to the brim with it. You let out even a little and it fills up so fast it's like he never lost any at all. Sabo smirked and Smoker didn't smile. Instead, he got up and went to hunt down the hyperball called Luffy. Boy, kid. Smoker said to the boy who was hanging upside down and raiding the freezer. You see nothing? Luffy said simply while munching on some sort of frozen food. Come with me. Smoker said, but Luffy made no attempt to move. Instead, he continued to eat his food, just watching Smoker. I said come with me, brat. He sent his arm up and grabbed Luffy by the scruff of his shirt, dragging him to his side. That was so cool. Luffy shouted at Smoker, who smirked finally. I ate a devil fruit. he said, and Luffy's eyes began to sparkle. Me too, he said, and pulled on his face after Smoker had let him go. I didn't know any of Garp's grandchildren had devil fruit abilities. Smoker mumbled, wanting to keep this information for later. Man, Ace and I have fruit powers. Gramps doesn't want anyone to know though, so keep it a secret, K. Luffy said, giving Smoker one of his brilliant smiles, and the man found himself liking the boy even slightly. When you boys become Marines, it won't matter who knows or not. Smoker said, waving his hand as Luffy scrunched his nose up in disgust. I'll never be a Marine, he said, and Smoker raised a brow. And why is that, boy? He was curious. After all, these were the grandsons of the hero Garp. Because they make Marco into a cranky bastard, so I don't like them. Luffy knew that whenever a Marine was nearby, Marco would become ever so protective and stop him from fighting in any of the battles, giving the excuse that Luffy didn't need a bounty quite yet. Marco? Smoker asked, narrowing his eyes. Yeah, my ma, he said happily, and Smoker relaxed slightly. I see, what a weird name for a mother. He mumbled quietly, heading towards the main deck, signaling for Luffy to follow him. I ate the smoke fruit, he said simply, and Luffy nodded his head. So that's why you smoke so much, he said, happy to figure something out on his own, while Smoker just closed his eyes to regain his composure. I'm going to train you, kid. I'll work you so hard you won't have the energy to move for days. He smirked, pulling out his jude, and Luffy got into a stance ready to fight. Good luck, he said, his hat overshadowing his eyes, making him look feral. I won't need it. He smirked right on back to the boy as they aimed a punch towards each other. By the end of the training session, Luffy was flat on his back, panting, but his eyes were bright. Luffy had removed his shirt at some point during the fight, and sweat covered his face and chest as he took deep breaths in and out to cool down. You're stronger than you look, Smoker said, leaning up against a wall, breathing deeply and lighting 2 cigars, but there was a smile on his face. I'd say the same about you, Luffy panted out, not able to move from where he was. Where did you learn to fight like that, kid? Smoker asked him, watching the boy carefully. Here, there, everywhere, Luffy said simply but truthfully. No doubt with a grandfather like yours you travel far, Smoker said, closing his eyes, but Luffy sighed before propping himself up on his elbows. I didn't meet Grandpa until I was around 7, then we didn't talk until about 2 months ago, Luffy said, and Smoker's eyes snapped open. I was never alone, so don't pity me. I'm stronger because I've got people watching my back everywhere, Luffy said, and smiled at Smoker, who stood up, finally cooled down. I've got your back here, kid, he said, walking away, and Luffy chuckled happily. Thanks, he chirped finally before flopping back down, letting the night air cool him completely. The next day, Luffy was super excited to see an island in the close distance. Apparently this island doesn't have much on it, so we plan to skip over it, Smoker said, but Luffy gave him a look. The beach? I want to play on the beach for a bit, it's been a while, he said to Smoker after he marched right up to him, glaring up at the tall older man who sighed. Smoker turned to a marine grunt who gave Smoker the list of supplies they had, and he just shook his head. We'll be fine for a little bit longer, so I guess we can make a short stop, he said, and Luffy cheered. We won't be going to town, you will let your energy out and we will go, Smoker commanded to the boy, who nodded his head. Thanks, Smokey, he cheered before running off happy. What was that? Ace asked, pointing his thumb at the exchange, and Sabo laughed. That was Luffy's special power at work again, Sabo said, and Ace looked at him funny. Special power? He asked, and Sabo nodded. His ability to make friends with almost anyone. Sabo smiled, knowing that their little brother was like a blooming flower. It had taken him a long time to grow, but once he had sprouted and fully bloomed, he would be able to charm almost anyone into doing anything he wanted. Ace shook his head with a smile, but Sabo gave him a small look as well. Where Luffy is blinded by his growth in a silly way, Ace may not be able to see his own growth in that same way either. Ace, the boy who scowled and growled at any and all who came near him, had learned to smile and laugh. He had learned that there was more to life than hate, there was love. Sabo only hoped that Ace continued on this path and grew into the strong man he knew he could be. We're here, Luffy shouted as they got closer and closer to the approaching island, and Sabo smiled softly. That we are, he agreed before dragging both of his brothers below deck to their cabin to change into swim shorts and get floaties out for the anchors he called his brothers. I'm not wearing those, Ace said to the pink ducky blow-up floater toy. Then you're not swimming, Sabo challenged, and Ace frowned. I don't need it, he argued, and Sabo closed his eyes, annoyed. You'll drown and I'm not going to save you. I don't need you to save me, he said, and Sabo rolled his eyes. Are you guys done having your lovers' quarrel? Luffy asked in his shorts and floaties with goggles on his head. His words had both boys turning their heads at Luffy, who grinned and ducked as Ace kicked his foot over Luffy's head. Where the hell did you learn those words? Ace shouted, and Luffy laughed louder. Sanji taught me, Luffy said, blocking a punch before bolting through the door away from his brother. Get back here, brat. Ace said as he chased after a laughing Luffy and a sighing Sabo. I feel like I sigh more than I should. He muttered to himself before following behind his brothers, the pink duck in his arms, since Ace would be wearing it whether he liked it or not. Luffy and Sabo built sand castles, while Ace sat with his feet in the water, watching the waves and his brothers work. The Marines for the most part enjoyed the sunshine but remained on the ship, leaving the boys to their own. Smoker kept his eyes on them for a while but retired inside when he figured the boys weren't going to wander off. Sabo and Luffy had just put the finishing touches on the castle when a slingshot bullet hit the artwork, if it could be called that, destroying it into a pile of wet sand. Sabo and Luffy's eyes darkened as they turned their eyes upon the one who had dared to destroy their masterpiece. "Greetings, sailors. You are trespassing on private land," he shouted, and Luffy looked at him fully, now his eyes widening slightly, but Sabo's were still dark. "Oh? And whose land would that be?" he questioned sarcastically as Luffy's grin began to split his face. "That would be Captain Usopp's land and his 80 million followers. Everyone from far and wide addresses me with the title Captain Usopp," he shouted, and Luffy stepped away from his wrecked castle. "I know," he said simply as both Usopp, Sabo and even Ace blanked and looked at the boy. "My name is Monkey D. Luffy and I've heard all about you." That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.